Our MC Hans has to find the dragon's lair before two big noble families start a war over it. So he pushes his weak body through the Compton Mountains day after day, acting like he's only checking the land. But he's really hunting the lair in secret, because if his servants learn the truth, the rumor could spread fast. After hours of searching, Hans is tired and ready to turn back. Then, while he's lost in thought, his foot slips. He falls off a cliff. Pain explodes through his chest. Bones crack. He's stuck halfway down, bleeding and alone, sure he's about to die. That's when he sees it. An opening in the rock hidden in the cliff wall. He crawls inside and finds a wide hall with a shining gold circle on the floor. The moment he steps in, his wounds close and his broken ribs heal. Deep inside the lair, Hans finds a golden dragon, and when he touches it, bright light pours into him, leaving him with a dragon heart and a new power. Well, before he finds this, in a military camp which is located in the Compton Mountain Range, reports come in that scouting operations have been obstructed due to the intensity of the rain. However, there have been reports of lights from the northeast. Without a clear sight, the soldiers assume that the lights are coming from McCarthy's men. Heading the camp is Adrian von Callista, who is the Count of Callista. After receiving this report, the Count stands up to verify the info by himself. Meanwhile, the soldiers are already complaining about the hardship they are enduring. They are doing all these in another man's land just because of the rarity of a dragon. In addition, the men are being put through this hardship because the Count needs to gain favor from the Townsend Dukes. It is also rumored that the Count is a waste, but the soldiers are relieved that he still has what it takes to lead them in battle. Unknown to them, they are wrong. The person under the battle helmet is not actually Callista himself. The person under the helmet is our MC, Hans, and he has been serving Callista since he was a kid. At first, he helped with homework, but not long after this, he was forced to learn swordplay and the like. After Adrian's father died, Hans was forced to take on management and other tasks in the county. Eventually, Hans ended up being a double for Adrian while he wasted away drinking and having fun with women. And now, he is on the battlefield instead of the real Adrian. Hans has accepted everything that comes with the job, but he never imagined that he would have to go to the battlefield. Hans and the soldiers finally reach where the scouts saw the lights. Because the visibility is poor, one of the soldiers suggests that they go back to camp. However, Hans is lost in thought about the commoner's life and if there is even an afterlife once they die. Just as they prepare to return to camp, one of the soldiers gets struck down. This is when it dawns on them that they have run into an ambush. In the commotion, Hans gets impaled by a spear from behind. He crashes to the ground as he wonders if this is the end for him. He couldn't believe that he was going to be a stand-in or body double for someone else. As he slowly loses consciousness, he wonders if there is a second life where he would be able to live as his own self, not someone else. In this thought, Hans finally closes his eyes and fades away. Suddenly, Hans opens his eyes to see one of the maids, Madeline, kneeling and crying in front of him. He wonders why the maid is there at the moment and the fact that the maid is young. Hans is shocked to hear the maid begging him and addressing him as her lord. Just then, he notices that he is holding a whip in his hand, and when he looks around, he realizes that he is in a royal and beautiful room. He stares in the mirror and sees the reflection of Count Callista in the mirror. He immediately drops the cane he is holding, and he grabs his face to see if he is seeing correctly. He rushes toward Madeline with pity in his eyes, but Madeline quickly raises her hands, expecting to be hit. Hans then pulls back, and he asks the maid what year it is. Madeline replies that they are in the year 853. This shocks Hans as he figures out something important. It turns out that he has somehow entered the body of Count Callista, his former master, and in addition to this, everything has gone back 15 years. In disbelief, Hans lies down on the bed, wondering if this is reality or not. He is in a luxurious room with so many shining things, and the body of the Count seems very soft. He is delicate since he has never done anything related to labor in the past. To get a handle on things, Hans tells Madeline to leave the room. As the girl walks away, there are clear indications of cane marks on the back of her legs. This shows that she has suffered repeated abuse at the hands of Adrian. Hans falls back on the bed and admits that Adrian is the worst and most wasteful lord in the history of lords. Adrian is known to stop his servants for petty reasons, and he even treats them like toys. After he got older, Adrian descended into a total life of wastefulness. During all those times, Hans was the one cleaning up the messes made by Adrian. Suddenly, Hans remembers something and he rushes out of the room. He opens one of the rooms in the house, but he sees something else entirely. This was supposed to be his room, but it is being used as the storage room. He can't believe his eyes, but he is very sure that he is not in the wrong room since this is where he lived for over 20 years of his life. He is wondering what is happening when he hears one of the servants call him. The servant Claude wonders what the castle lord is doing in the servants' quarters. Claude is not a stranger to Hans since he grew up with him and Madeline. They were his companions, and they are just like he remembered. Hans then turns to Claude, asking him where the servant Hans is. However, this question leaves Claude baffled, since he has never heard of anyone named Hans. Hans tried to describe who he was, but Claude had no idea what the guy was talking about. This is when the bitter realization hits Hans that his reincarnation into Adrian's body means he doesn't exist in this current world. The news soon started spreading among the servants about the irregularities in the Lord's behavior. Some have seen him wake up early in the morning, which is very unusual because he usually wakes up in the afternoon. Two of the maids are busy talking about Hans when he pops up behind them, scaring them. He apologizes for startling them and asks them to call the nanny for him. It is now a week since Hans entered Adrian's body. Hans realizes that he needs to accept that he is Adrian, and he needs to live the life too. Not long after this, the nanny comes over to attend to Hans. The nanny is worried that Hans doesn't sleep well. Hans replies that he hardly sleeps. Even when he opens his eyes, he opens them again. The woman then asks if she should prepare breakfast, but Hans says no. He tells the woman that he needs to visit his mother first. The nanny is shocked when she hears this, but she immediately agrees that Hans's suggestion is nice. Hans makes his way to his mother's chambers, and when he arrives at the door, his sister, Regina, and mother, Owen, are both shocked to see him. Regina is forced to ask the boy what he has come to do in such early hours. Owen berates her daughter for saying something like, but she is not to be blamed because Adrian has never cared about the welfare of his family. Owen quickly tells her son to enter, assuring him that she is happy to see him. Apparently, 3 years ago, after the death of the former count, Owen had been bedridden because she couldn't handle the shock. Adrian, Owen, and Regina are what is left of House Callista. Despite being in a remote location in the Rosenbaum Empire, the Callista family was well-to-do. However, the family lost all of its former glory after the death of the former count. The family became so poor that they had to lease out troops just so they could put food on their table. In the future, where Hans came from, Owen later died, and Regina was left to inherit a house sunk in debt. Hans then holds his mother's hand, assuring her that he will come visit more often. However, his mother tells him not to bother himself too much about visits because she is aware that managing the estate is stressful already. After he finally leaves Owen's chambers, Hans plans to do everything in his power to properly manage the estate. Just then, Hans is informed by the butler, Alman, that Mr. Flynn has come to see him. Hans then remembers that around this time there was a butler who served Adrian, and his name was Alman. He was a very loyal butler who protected the interests of the servants. He even used his own body to protect the servants whenever they were being hurt by Adrian. He was loyal even though Adrian didn't make life easy for him. However, it was around this time that he resigned, and a new butler, Side, was hired. Side was the worst of butlers because he was so incompetent, and he even helped destroy the family's finances. Since it is time for Alman to leave, Hans is already thinking of a way to stop this. Meanwhile, Hans sets up a meeting with Flynn. Flynn is the administrator of the Callista territory. Flynn is also a bad person who treated the servants very poorly. He beat them up like they were his own slaves. Hans wants to hear what Flynn has to say, and as expected, Flynn tells him that he has found a suitable replacement for Alman. He wants them to get rid of Alman without wasting time. Hans is shocked as he hears Flynn talk about his plan. Just like how Hans remembered it, Flynn recommends a fellow named Side. Flynn claims that Side is a competent fellow, and he is also like a brother to him. Before Flynn can say anything further, Hans tells him to stop talking. Hans holds his head in anger and frustration. He then asks Flynn to confirm if he really heard him clearly. He wants to know if Flynn really has the plans to fire Alman. When Flynn realizes that Hans is getting all confused about things, he blames himself for the mix-up. He then reaches into his inner pocket and brings out something. He takes Hans's hand and places 10 gold coins in the boy's hand. Hans was left with utter shock and disgust when this happened. Flynn mentions that he doesn't want the boy to dirty his hands with what is about to happen. He already has plans to settle everything with a simple charge of embezzlement. As usual, Flynn tells Hans that he has prepared the records for him. Hans remains mute as he stares at the 10 gold coins in his palm. Usually, a poor family lives on 10 silver per month. Basically, 10 gold coins are 20 months' worth of living expenses for a commoner. 1 gold equals 20 silver coins. Since Flynn is the administrator of the Callista territory, and apart from the small income he is getting, he has no other source of income. Hans easily figures out that the money given to him is stolen money from the people. Hans is utterly disappointed with the fact that Adrian had collected embezzled money as bribes. In return for this, the estate is being manipulated by others like Flynn. It finally dawns on Hans that Flynn didn't resign but was driven out. Everyone knew the man was falsely accused, but they all stayed quiet, and Hans was also too young at the time to know the truth. Hans is utterly disappointed with everything coming to light. With a low tone, Hans calls upon Oswald, the night bodyguard. In a twist of things, Hans tells Oswald to immediately arrest Flynn. Hans tells Oswald that Flynn made corrupt requests of him, and he also falsely accused his servant. Because of his offenses, Hans demands that Oswald lock Flynn in the dungeon. Oswald tends to the order without wasting time, but Flynn is left in total disbelief and his mouth is left wide open. Flynn calls on Hans to try and convince him, but he just ignores him as he is dragged away by Oswald. Hans drops the 10 gold coins on the table while wondering why he entered Adrian's body. He might not know anything, but he knows that the previous owner of the body, Adrian, has caused loads of people pain. Hans is not Adrian, and he is not ready to sit back and let history repeat itself. In the mansion's hall, Oswald is busy dragging Flynn to the dungeon. He tells Flynn to walk very well while calling him a scum. Oswald doesn't know Flynn's offense, but he doesn't care. Even Flynn is surprised by the turn of events. He cannot believe that he is being sent to the dungeon. In a crumbling house headed by a wasteful leader, Oswald is the only knight left. Flynn has always considered Adrian the biggest fool since he is easy to manipulate. Now that Flynn has been arrested, he wonders if Adrian is finally trying to show some pride, but little does he know that the person inhabiting Adrian's body is no longer the foolish Adrian. However, Flynn expects Hans to suffer because the world is not a bed of roses. Oswald drags Flynn to the dungeon and angrily throws him into the cell without regard to his former position. Even Flynn is forced to ask if Oswald is not handling him a little too roughly, but Oswald urges him to shut up until his fate is decided by the Lord. To know more about the characters, Oswald is the son of a knight who served the previous count, and when all the knights left, only he stayed because he is loyal. Inside his cell, Flynn believes that he still has what it takes to sweet-talk the Lord into doing what he wants. He plans to manipulate the Lord and get him to fire Oswald. Flynn cannot believe that a mere knight like Oswald is acting almighty and great around him. With what he knows, Flynn says Adrian is nothing but a 15-year-old boy who is lazy and also has poor judgment. He has always manipulated him into raising taxes, and Adrian has always followed his suggestions. Flynn believes that Adrian is just in a bad mood for the day and just a bit of flattery will get him back in his pocket in no time. Flynn starts practicing how he is going to talk to the Lord when he comes to see him. He plans to laugh with him and even kneel down to him if that is what it takes. He is in the middle of his dumb practice section when Hans arrives. Judging from how Hans is standing, Flynn is left wondering if this is the same boy he used to manipulate. Flynn quickly goes down on his knees, asking Hans for mercy. In a cold manner, Hans tells Flynn that there is no need for him to beg for mercy because from that moment forward, all crimes in the territory will be judged through trials. Upon hearing the word trial, Flynn loses himself in fear. Hans turns around to leave, and Flynn starts begging. He tries manipulating Hans as he usually does. He reminds the boy that he has been loyal to him, but Hans ignores all of his pleas and walks away like he can't hear. Flynn was originally a commoner but managed to climb the ranks and finally became an administrator in the Callista territory. He was regarded as very important, but now the same Flynn has found himself in a courtroom in front of a judge. Flynn is charged with bribery, embezzlement, and breach of trust. Because of these offenses, Flynn faces asset confiscation and possible imprisonment. Flynn's trial is a significant shock to the residents of the territory, and it also serves as a warning to the negligent administrators within the territory. The servants in the house are even shocked about the trial, since it's been a long time since they had a trial in the land. Hans calls his servants together, and some of them are already scared that they are about to be punished. Alman tells Hans that all of the servants are gathered, and with pity in his voice, Hans asks the servants how he has performed so far as a lord. Since the servants are the closest to him, he believes that they should know better. This question shocks the servants as they do not understand what the Lord is trying to do. The only thing they can hope for is that they don't get hit or beaten up. After waiting but with no reply, Hans then opens his mouth to talk. What comes next shocks his servants and everyone in the room. Hans bows his head and he begs the servants for forgiveness. Hans admits that he has lashed out and caused them pain for stupid reasons. The servants start to whisper amongst themselves as they try to figure out what is happening. Hans continues by saying one apology doesn't erase all of his past wrongs, but he just wants to make amends with the servants. He adds that he has shown unreliable behavior while leading the house. However, he assures them that from that moment forward, he is going to make Callista a better place for them to live. And to start doing this, Hans says he needs to start taking care of the people in his castle. Hans lets them know that he plans to fix everything that is wrong, but admits that it might be chaotic at first. But he urges the servants to trust and follow him. After saying all of these, the servants are left in shock and total disbelief. After the meeting, Claude and Madeline talk about the sudden change. Madeline says the Lord still beat her some days ago, but now he is acting totally different. She wonders if someone can truly change in such a short space of time. Inside Hans' chambers, he thanks Alman for his good work and tells him that he is free to leave. However, Alman stays back and he bows his head to Hans to thank him. Hans is shocked by what Alman is doing, and Alman reveals that he is aware that the Lord supported him when Flynn was trying to falsely accuse him. Hans then urges Alman to raise his head, reminding him that they have been together for so long and he only did what was right. Hans then holds Alman's hand, telling him to report to him if anyone ever tries to wrongfully accuse him next time. Hearing this from Hans, Alman is forced to admit that the Lord has truly changed. Alman has been serving the Lord for over 10 years, and even though the Lord's appearance remains unchanged, Alman believes that he seems like a totally different person. Because of his new resolve, Alman pledges his allegiance to Hans, assuring him that he is going to follow him. Later that day, Hans stands by the window in his room. He thinks about everything so far. He realizes that he was not just given a second chance, but he was also gifted with the noble title of Count Callista. Hans basically controls the entire Callista territory. To add to this, Hans has the knowledge of 15 years into the future. Thankfully, he has knowledge about how to run things, since he was basically doing that in his past life. Since he has this knowledge, he plans to use it to his advantage. In the first step of doing what is right, Hans plans to protect those who are dear to him. These include his remaining family members and the servants. He also wishes that everyone in the land could live the life they want without getting bound by the restrictions of a status. However, Hans is aware that he can't do all of these without making the territory better. Hans starts to think deeply if there is anything that he knows from the future that can help him with this endeavor. Just then, he remembers the rumors about the dragon lair. Hans's face lights up in excitement when he realizes that he has hit the jackpot, which is the dragon lair that he needs to find. After the revelation of the dragon lair, Hans swoops into action. He organizes his servants in search of the dragon's lair. After searching for days without any result, Oswald urges Hans to take a rest since he looks exhausted. However, Hans is not ready to take a break. He only collects a pouch of water from Oswald and gulps it down. He apologizes for making everyone work so hard. It's been days since Hans joined his servants to inspect the territory, and he has no plan of stopping anytime soon. To his servants, he is inspecting the territory, but unknown to them, he is actually searching for the dragon's lair. Dragons are considered to be the mightiest of creatures, and also the most intelligent divine beings. Each dragon is considered to be almost godlike. However, they went extinct long ago. But whenever their hideouts are found or discovered, it catches the attention of everyone. This is because a large amount of treasures are usually found in the dragon lairs. And to Hans's knowledge, he knows a dragon lair will be found in the mountain range. It turns out that the current emperor of the Rosenbaum Empire is just a young puppet. The two families upholding the empire are the Townsend family and the McCarthy family. These two families uphold the delicate balance in the empire. The Compton Mountain is located between the borders of the two great houses, and this was where the dragon lair was found. A conflict broke out between the two families due to the ownership of the lair. The Callista land happens to be on the border, and the Callista family ends up sending troops to align with the Townsend house. Now that Hans has found himself in the past, he has 15 years ahead to discover the lair. Hans leaves his servants and runs deeper into the woods in search of the lair. It is said that dragons hoard mountains of gold and jewels, and these jewels are enough to buy a small kingdom, according to rumors. With this in mind, Hans knows that finding the lair will provide balance to the territory. However, the exact location of the lair is unknown, but its discovery spread far and wide. It was said to have been discovered by an herbalist who was lost in an oak forest. The herbalist only ran into the lair by sheer luck. Since it is easy to recognize, Hans knows that he will recognize the lair once he sees it. Hans continues searching, but after a few hours he is already tired. He fails to find the lair, and not even anything that leads to it. He starts to wonder if the rumor about the herbalist is true or false. Since the sun is already setting, he plans to return. He feels very tired, which indicates that Andrian's body is weak. Hans plans to exercise and work on his body once he returns home. Meanwhile, the servants are already calling out to him. Hans is not happy with the fact that he is stressing out the servants. Hans starts thinking of asking for help so he can find the lair, but he doesn't want to do this since he aims to keep the lair a secret. He knows fully well that the existence of the dragon's lair can as well spark a civil war, which is why he needs to be careful. Just then, Hans loses himself in thought and he slips down a cliff. He lands hard on the ground, sustaining injuries, but he manages to survive. Hans is stuck halfway between the cliff and his eyes just flashed before his eyes. Hans's ribs are broken, but he is worried about how he can get back to the top of the mountain. He manages to get back up, and this is when he notices an opening in the mountain. With the formation he is looking at, Hans easily figures out that he has stumbled upon the dragon's lair. The lair is located in the middle of a cliff, which is such an absurd location. Hans assumes that the entrance was used by a guardian, and talking of guardians, they are creatures that protect a dragon. The rugged terrain of the mountain range was what kept the lair well hidden. Even though he found the supposed lair, Hans is worried about how he is going to return to the mountaintop. He knows there is no way in hell that Oswald will be able to find him where he is. Hans is already thinking about how he is going to die when he enters the lair's majestic hall. In the middle of the hall is a golden magic circle. Hans steps into the magic circle, and suddenly he is healed of all his injuries. Hans is completely blown away by this discovery, as the lair was supposed to be empty. He wonders if the space itself is enchanted with healing magic. Hans is impressed by this because he knows that just with the discovery of the healing magic, the lair is already worth a lot. Hans almost loses himself in the thoughts of what can be, but he slaps himself back to reality. Hans plans to thoroughly explore the lair and know what it entails. With the discovery of the lair, Hans figures that it would be the greatest asset for him, a person who returned to the past in someone else's body. Hans soon finds 4 doors that are supposedly connected to the center. Hans is impressed with the spaces in the lair, as it is built like an ant colony. Hans continues to explore, and he soon finds what seems to be a library. Since dragons are known to take human form sometimes, Hans assumes that the dragon was reading so it could enjoy human pleasures. With what he has seen so far, Hans figures that the lair is built like where humans live since it contains a bedroom, a study, and a dressing room. Everything so far doesn't contain great treasures like rumored, but Hans believes that the lair will soon hold great value. The most useful part that he has come across so far is the central area with healing magic. Hans decides that he is going to call the central area the Healing Hall. Hans is even more impressed by this discovery because healing magic is almost a thing of the past. Hans then proceeds into the last room that he hasn't checked. Hans enters the room and freezes in fear and shock when he sees a golden dragon lying down in front of him. Hans doesn't want to believe that what he is staring at is real. With what he knows, dragons are said to have gone extinct at least 100 years ago. With this, Hans believes that the dragon he is looking at is nothing but a corpse. But at the same time, he wonders if a corpse will still be shining and clean. Just then, Hans touches the dragon, and suddenly, the room is filled with a bright light emanating from the dragon. The light is so bright that Hans is forced to back away from the dragon. The light then starts to enter his body, and at the same time, he hears a voice in his head. Still trying to figure out what is happening, Hans finds himself in the presence of a man in a royal robe. With fear in his body, Hans asks the weird man who he is. Hans can clearly feel the strange aura from the man, and with this, he knows that the person standing in front of him is not human. The man finally voices out and reveals that his name is Seyfried. He continues by saying he is the last head of the Gold Clan, and in addition to this, he is the final dragon of the continent. Hans is shocked when he realizes that he is standing in the presence of a dragon. Hans then asks the dragon if he is the master of the lyre, but he decides to explain things to Hans. He tells Hans that the dragon he saw earlier is nothing more than a lifeless shell. The voice Hans is now hearing in his head is the final magic that he left behind. Hans still doesn't understand this, and Seyfried continues further. He explains that dragons are superior beings on the land, but over the ages, they were consumed and conflicted by rivalry. In the end of it all, Seyfried becomes the last dragon of the continent. Dragons are usually solitary by nature, which is why being alone means nothing to Seyfried, but he can't bear the faintest idea that the dragon's magic will disappear forever after he is gone. This is why he made a crucial decision to pass down his knowledge and legacy to the intelligent being who would find his lair by fate and preserve the magic of dragons. Seyfried reveals that he died in the year 354, and the spell he designed was to last for 500 years after his death. If no one had found him in the space of those 500 years, his corpse would have crumbled, and dragon magic would have been lost to history. Seyfried doesn't want this, but he would have accepted it as fate too. However, he is thankful that Hans, who is now his successor, has found him. Seyfried then wishes that magic continues to exist in the world even for future generations. Hans then protests that he has no knowledge of magic. He adds that there are few mages left in the world, which means it would be hard for him to learn magic. Seyfried laughs when Hans says this, leaving Hans to wonder what is so amusing to the dragon. The dragon reminds Hans that he has been chosen as his successor, and he points to Hans's right chest. Just as he touches Hans, he finds himself back in the lair. Hans is left wondering if what he just witnessed is an illusion or a dream. He looks around the room to see that the dragon's body has totally perished. This is when it dawns on Hans that he has been left a dragon heart, and this is located on the right side of his chest. Aside from the human heart in his body, Hans can feel another presence like a blurry smoke but yet a powerful source of magic. With this, Seyfried's knowledge starts to pour into Hans via the new heart. Hans is blessed with so much information all at once, and he still doesn't understand most of it. However, Hans is certain about something, and this is the fact that he can now use dragon tongue magic. Unlike humans who must craft a spell with long incantations before using an activation word, the dragon tongue magic activates with just a single trigger word. Since the dragon tongue magic requires the power generated from a dragon heart, Hans is confident that the dragon heart left behind for him by Seyfried will do the job. With the help of the dragon tongue magic, Hans is able to get to the mountaintop using the magic activation word known as fly. However, Hans used up all his mana just to get to the top of the mountain. The dragon heart isn't stable yet, which is why his mana is still limited. But Hans isn't worried about this because he knows the heart will grow to match his body. And eventually, Hans will have what it takes to use magic, which is close to divine power. Hans finally reunites with his servants, who have been worried since he disappeared. They all rush toward him to check if he is fine. Not long after this, Hans and the group prepare to return to the estate. Hans is glad that he gained more than what he actually went for. He only went in search of a dragon's lair, but he came back as the successor of a dragon. Hans then remembers what the dragon said about the spell he used, which is supposed to last 500 years. Subtracting the year the dragon died from the present year, Hans realizes that the dragon's legacy would have been lost forever if he had been 1 year late. Hans remembers that in his previous life, the dragon wasn't discovered until 15 years from now. which means magic was not what it was. It is known that most mages can't even break past the first or second circle in their lifetimes, and those who manage to reach the fifth circle are considered to be archmages. However, dragons are born at the highest height of intellect, which is the ninth circle. The ninth circle is considered to be a level far beyond human reach. Hans knows that the ninth level might no longer be a dream to him again, since he has obtained the power of a dragon. When he finally returns to the estate, he is welcomed by his sister, who is already worried about him. His sister scolds him for disappearing and leaving everyone to worry. His sister also notices that his clothes are torn, and this forces the girl to ask if he ran into bandits. However, Hans assures his sister that he is fine since he is not hurt. He confesses that he was hurt before, but now he is fine. Oswald then goes down on his knees, begging for forgiveness because he blames himself for not looking after the Lord. Even Hans's sister blames the old man, but Hans manages to defuse the entire situation by assuring everyone that he is fine. Hans manages to return to his room and he heaves a sigh of relief. He knows that Oswald stayed behind because of loyalty, and the same thing can be said for the butler Alman. Hans is glad to have someone like Alman and Oswald by his side, because he knows that these are people who will always be by his side to help him. Hans then summons Alman to his chambers, and in no time, Alman shows up. Hans apologizes for calling on the man very late at night. He asks Alman about the servant list and salary ledger he told him to prepare before he went on the tour. Alman assures Hans that everything is ready, but he wonders if the Lord has plans to review them at that moment. He reminds Hans that it is already late, and coupled with that, Alman was told about Hans's accident while on tour. However, Hans assures the guy that he is pretty fine. He tells Alman to bring the documents to him, and even when Alman still tries to convince him, Hans remains adamant. He considers the well-being of his servants a priority, which is why he needs to handle everything with a matter of urgency. Knowing that there is no way to convince Hans, Alman agrees to bring the documents to him. Moments later, Hans dips his hand into his pocket and brings out some gold coins. He then asks Alman if he knows about Grace. Claude visits one of the market women named Lowen to place orders from her. Claude hands her the list of what he wants, leaving the woman baffled. Claude asks her if it would be difficult for her to supply the order, but Lowen replies that she has no problem coming through. She was just happy, which is why she was baffled. Hans's policy has completely changed everything in the territory. Taxes have been slashed and orders from the estate have also increased. Everyone in the area now believes that life is worth living, and this is something none of them ever thought they could say before. Lowen gives Claude the receipt for the order and assures him that she will deliver the goods by evening. Surprisingly, the woman gives Claude 2 apples before he leaves. Lowen claims that the apples are her own way of appreciating Claude for how well he is serving the Lord. She is convinced that the servant's actions are part of what turned the Lord into such a loving person. Claude then rushes back to the estate. He finds Madeline, who was out gathering herbs. Claude wears a big smile on his face while hugging the 2 apples that Lowen gave him. He gives Madeline one of the apples, and she asks him where he got it. He replies that Lowen gave it to him, leaving Madeline totally shocked. Lowen has always been known as a stingy old lady, but to everyone's surprise, she has changed. Claude then adds that a lot has also changed. It was shocking that Flynn was punished, but in addition to this, all the other corrupt officials were also punished. Hans had to go through the estate ledgers all by himself so he could pick out the bad eggs. Even the illegally collected taxes were all returned to the citizens, and this includes those of the servants. The servants have gotten a better life with improved pay, break times, and new outfits. The castle is also easily accessible to those on the outside now. Because of these changes, the servants now have time to chill outside the castle just like Madeline and Claude are doing. Claude notices that Madeline is already talking nicely about the Lord. He reminds her that the Lord was the one who treated them badly in the first place. Claude doesn't want to believe that people change so easily. Madeline agrees to this, but she reveals that anytime she sees Hans these days, something just tells her that she made hasty decisions. Now, with everything that is going on, Madeline feels like giving the Lord another chance. Claude then asks Madeline if she is forgiving Hans because he is handsome, and she says no. Moments later, the two start returning to the castle. They talk about how Hans has not been staying around so well. It is now hard for any of them to even see Hans. Apparently, Hans lies to them that he has been going on inspections, but unknown to them, he was visiting the dragon's lair. Inside the lair, Hans has been practicing his magic. He is now able to use spells like fireballs, and in addition to this, the shield spell is also available to him. It is now almost a month since he inherited the dragon's power, and Hans has been consistent with training since then. He can clearly see that his magic has improved, and with time, he knows that he will become better. However, he is not comfortable with the fact that he has to travel by horse down to the lair anytime he wants to practice magic. Since the lair is reinforced with magic, no matter how hard he trains, the lair cannot be destroyed. Hans considers the lair the perfect training grounds for him. However, it would have been better if he could come and go more easily. Hans knows there is a way he can achieve this, and this is by teleportation magic, which is called the warp gate. This allows him to teleport to a designated coordinate within a safe zone. However, the Warp Gate is a pretty high spell, which is why it is ranked among the 7th circle. At the moment, Hans cannot perform this spell since he is not higher than level 2 or 3. Nonetheless, Hans's current level is still impressive since the Empire's Grand Mage hasn't made it past level 5. To master better teleportation spells, Hans knows he needs to master the 3-circle short-range teleportation spell, which is known as Blink. He has been trying this for days, but he keeps falling. Hans then decides to try it again, and to his surprise, the spell works for the first time. Hans is able to move a bit forward from where he was standing. Hans is still in the middle of celebrating his small wins when everywhere suddenly turns white. He feels some sort of discomfort coming from the dragon's heart, and when he looks up, he sees Seyfried staring at him. The dragon commends Hans' work rate so far. Seyfried tells Hans that he has now managed to get past the beginner level, and as his reward, Seyfried unlocks a new area of the lyre to help Hans continue to advance. He adds that the more Hans goes, the more useful things he gets. Hans then asks Seyfried why he kept the treasures hidden. The dragon reveals that it was his way of making sure that a greedy person does not have access to the laire's treasures. Seyfried then urges Hans to continue growing so that his magic can continue to live. After his discussion with Seyfried, Hans realizes that the dragon wasn't lying. Hans stumbles upon a room that was hidden with magic, and inside the room are treasures. This also confirms the rumor that a dragon's lair is filled with treasures. In addition to the treasures he has found, Hans remembers Seyfried telling him that he will unlock more treasures as he progresses. Hans finds a book in the room that is all about artifacts. Artifacts are objects that have been infused with magic, and the magic remains in them permanently. Artifacts are now rare to come by since magic is almost extinct, and with Hans's present level, he doesn't even have what it takes to make artifacts. After realizing that the books on the shelf are talking about artifacts, he looks around to finally figure out that all the objects in the room are nothing but artifacts. There are a total of 10 artifacts that are on display in the room, and each of them comes with a book that explains them in detail. Thanks to these books, Hans is able to choose the artifacts that are most useful to him at that moment. The first artifact he chose is the Spring Afternoon. The artifact is said to have been made by a 7th Circle Archmage for his sick wife. The artifact contains healing magic. Though healing magic is not that efficient, the effect of the artifact boosts vitality, and Hans knows that it would be great for his sick mother. The second artifact he chose is the Dance of Shadows. This artifact was created by the Red Dragon, Berestein. Even though the artifact looks simple when looking at it, it is very effective. Hans puts it on, generating a red aura around him. The artifact is filled with a highly advanced concealment spell, which makes the wearer basically invincible. Hans stands in front of a mirror, but nothing shows, and even his footsteps are completely silent. Hans feels like his body has no weight whatsoever with the use of the artifact. Hans is very excited about the discovery of the artifacts, as they prove to be really useful. And the third artifact that Hans picks is called the Breath of Earth. This artifact is built in the form of a snake, and it is the only thing created by Seyfried himself. The artifact provides the one thing Hans has been lacking, which is the ability to teleport. With the artifact, Hans can use the warp ability. The warp effect has its coordinates set to the lair. With this, Hans knows he can leave the castle pretty easily without facing scrutiny from his sister and Alman. With the distance issue out of the window, Hans is confident that training will be much easier than before. Hans admits that he is enjoying every bit of training so far. After the day's training, Hans gets on his horse and starts riding back to the castle. He fully knows that this will be his last journey to Mountain Compton, since he now has the artifact to easily teleport him. Hans is relieved that the mountain is deserted, and he hasn't finished this thought when he runs into troops. Hans is shocked to see soldiers on the mountain. Hans then introduces himself as the Lord of the Territory, and he asks the troop leader why he has led soldiers into another person's territory without notification. The knight leading the soldiers comes off very rude when he addresses Hans as a child. He claims that the reports he has heard of Callista's leader being a child are nothing but the truth. He then introduces himself as Count Pete Ross, the commander of the 1st Imperial Knights. Hans is not delighted with Pete's words about him being a child. Hans reminds Pete that he might be from the capital, but since they are both counts, they have the same authority and status. It is customary that they address each other formally, no matter the age gap. Pete is shocked to see that Hans has no issue challenging him. Hans then proceeded to ask Pete what he had come to do in Callista. Pete claims that time is not on his side, so he decides to go straight to the point. Pete reveals that the Count of Rodriguez has started a rebellion. He and the soldiers are currently in pursuit of the Count, so he can be executed. Pete then brings out a stamped letter from the Emperor to show that he is telling the truth. By royal decree, Hans is also expected to cooperate with them, using Callista's resources to find the man. The moment Hans heard the name, it struck him that he actually remembers who Lakia de Rodriguez is. Lakia was a young man who, at the age of 16, became the greatest sword prodigy and quickly reached the rank of a swordmaster. However, he was caught up in his family's treason, and he ended up meeting a tragic end. It was said that Lakia and the Emperor were close friends from childhood. Everything changed when the young prince became emperor. The two great families, McCarthy and Townsend, started playing the young and naive emperor. They were able to get rid of those who would support and help the emperor. That was around the same time when Rodriguez was falsely accused. He died in the process, but 5 years later, it was revealed that he was actually innocent. His name was cleared of all charges, but the damage has been done because his family is already wiped out. The only thing left then was the Empire mourning such an innocent soul and a young genius who died as a victim of the power struggle. Having this knowledge with him, Hans knows he has to save Lakia this time. Pete notices that Hans is lost in thought, and he calls his attention. He informs Hans that Lakia is injured and he ran into the mountains the last time they saw him. Hans then replies that he is going to cooperate, but he urges them to end the search for the day since it is getting late already. He promises that they will begin the search again the following day. Pete arrogantly tells Hans that his men are more than enough to find the wounded man. However, Hans opens his eyes to the fact that the Compton Mountains are not what he and his men are used to. They can't conduct a search while riding a horse, and in addition to this, Pete and his men are all wearing heavy armor. He then calls Pete's attention to the fact that his men are already tired. Hans assures Pete that the only way out is to begin the search first thing very early the next day. Hans knows that something similar to this happened during his previous life when House Callista sent troops to help the Townsend family. The Compton Mountains have one of the roughest terrains in the kingdom, and Hans admits that he was only able to find the lair using his past knowledge and the right amount of sheer luck. He knows that to find a wounded man in under a day will be very difficult, especially in the mountains. After he has successfully convinced Pete to postpone the search, Hans goes in search of Lakia. He uses his magic to conduct a wide scan of the area. After a really good effort, he is able to locate Lakia. He rides to where Lakia is to find him wounded and unconscious. His wounds are very severe, and since Hans has no healing abilities yet, the only thing he can do to help is use the Spring Afternoon artifact. Even if the ring's effect is weak, Hans knows that it is better than doing nothing. He places the ring on Lakia's finger, and it immediately gets to work. Hans then uses the feathering spell on Lakia to make him lighter so he can carry him to the horse. Hans had already made up his mind that he would be the one to save Lakia from impending doom. Hans gets Lakia on horseback and starts riding at full speed to the castle. Just as he gets close to the castle, he realizes that Pete and his men have already gotten there. There is an imperial flag hanging down in front of the castle. Hans manages to stay calm and get ahead of the situation. He uses the invisibility artifact to make himself and Lakia vanish from the naked eye. The entire town is already filled with Lakia's wanted posters. Even the townspeople are shocked at this new development. The wanted poster has everything that they need to recognize Lakia. It features his navy blue eyes and his gray hair. Inside the castle, Pete continues with his rude behavior. He is not impressed by the way the castle looks, and because of this, he trashes the land. He further adds that the castle would have been better if it had been used as an inn. He and his knights laugh at these ridiculous jokes, while Claude and the other servants serve them drinks. Pete even extends his rude nature to the servants. He calls Claude a rude servant, claiming that the water he gave him is bad. Claude has no choice but to bow his head and ask for forgiveness from the arrogant knight. Regina enters the hall, urging Pete to refrain from violence. Regina reminds him that the castle is accommodating him and a large number of guests that they didn't prepare for. Because of this, she urges him to excuse whatever shortcomings he is facing. As expected, Pete turns around to look at Regina like trash before asking her who she is. Regina then introduces herself, but this disappoints Pete. He is not impressed that the house is being run by kids. He says the kids are supposed to be sleeping while adults handle the real thing. Pete continues by calling Regina a disgrace to the throne, but this gets her mad. Regina reminds Pete that she is standing as the representative of the land, and by this, she should be respected. Pete didn't expect to be challenged by Regina just like Hans did. He turns back while concluding that arrogance runs in the Callista family. At this point, Regina is already frustrated and a part of her wishes that her brother would show up. Meanwhile, Hans has been able to reach his room without anyone noticing, all thanks to the power of the artifact. He had actually walked past Regina when she was in a heated moment with Pete. Hans promises to handle things once he finds a way to handle Lakia. With the way things are going, Hans knows that the situation has gotten difficult. Lakia's wanted posters are all over the place, and there is nowhere for him to go. Hans also didn't take into consideration that the castle would be filled with knights. Due to Lakia's severe wounds, he is in dire need of medical attention. Hans is already scared that Lakia might die with the way things are going. Just then, Madeline enters the room with the aim of doing the cleaning. She didn't think anyone was in the room, so she didn't bother to knock, but she was shocked when she found Hans inside. She quickly apologizes to the Lord, explaining that she had no idea he was inside. Hans doesn't take offense at this, but gently tells her to keep quiet. Since Madeline has entered the room at the right time, Hans plans to use it to his advantage. He tells Madeline to quietly bring Alman to the room without anyone else noticing. In no time, Alman arrives in the room. Alman is also surprised to find Hans at the castle since they all assumed he was away on tour. Alman urges Hans to head to the lobby since his attention is needed. Hans postpones this and tells the two that he has something he needs to show them. He takes them to his bed, where the wounded Lakia is lying. The two servants are shocked to see the wanted man in Hans's bedroom. Alman asks Hans if he captured the traitor all by himself, but Hans replies that the guy is not a traitor. Hans tells the two that Lakia was falsely accused, but he can't explain all the details yet. However, Hans reveals his decision to protect the guy. Hans asks for their help in protecting Lakia since he can't do it all by himself. The two are stunned to speak after Hans made this request of them. Hans knows that the two are probably wondering why Callista, a rural lord with no ties to the imperial house, is involving himself with a powerful family like the Rodriguezes. In addition to this, Alman and Madeline are servants. They are people who are designed to obey commands from nobles. To put it into context, they are also in a position to report the situation to Pete, who is another noble. Even with all of these risks attached, Hans tells Madeline that he would assign her to his room so he can take care of Lakia. Madeline then reminds Hans that she has no knowledge about the treatment of wounds. Hans is aware of this, and he lets Madeline know that all she needs to do is clean Lakia's wounds and give him meals. He promises to reward Madeline very generously if she does this. Hans then turns to Alman, and he asks him for a very big favor. He tells Alman that he wants him to find a corpse that looks like Lakia. He wants a young man with a similar build and gray hair. The eye color will be a nice addition, but it's not mandatory if he can't find it. Even Alman is stunned by this request, and Hans understands his situation. He knows that he is asking for something very difficult, but he lets the two know that he has to save Lakia. Hans is aware that the servants would still have doubts about him because no one believes he can change so suddenly. To the servants, he is nothing but a spoiled brat who scares his servants. He is worried that what he just asked them to do might even spark a betrayal from them. However, Hans has no choice but to hope that the two believe that he is truly a changed man. Hans tells Alman that they only need to trust him at the moment. Alman then finally breaks the silence. He acknowledges the fact that there are ranks among nobility. The imperial decree is far superior to others, but even with this, Alman admits that he is serving one person only, and that is Count Callista. Hans is totally blown away when he realizes the level of commitment that Alman has toward his family. Alman then asks Hans if there is any external pressure or coercion. He wants to know if Hans made the decision to protect Lakia himself. Hans understands where Alman is coming from, because Flynn already said that a boy of his age could easily be shaken by others. Alman proceeds further that he would need to confirm if there is no external interference before he agrees to what Hans is asking him. Looking at how loyal Alman is, Hans starts to hate the fact that Adrian once pushed away such a great person. Hans then finally answers Alman's question, assuring him that the decision came from him. He adds that the decision will benefit the land and also the subjects living in it. Once Alman has gotten his confirmation, he bows his head to the Count, letting him know that he will secure the corpse as requested. Following Alman's footsteps, Madeline also pledges to do her best. Hans is glad that he is able to convince the two to help him. Not long after this, the knights try to search Owen's room, but Regina stands at the door to prevent them. She tells them that the room belongs to her mother and she urges them to leave. Thankfully, Hans shows up just in time to intervene too. He demands to know why the soldiers are carrying a sword into the Countess's bedroom, especially when she is ill. The soldier says he heard that the Callista family is willing to cooperate. Hans admits this, but reminds the soldier that they never agreed to a search. Providing lodgings and men to find the traitor is considered cooperation for Hans. He asks the soldier if there is any place in the decree that indicates that they need to search the castle. Realizing that he has lost the battle, the soldier has no choice but to back off. Regina is glad to see her brother, and she asks him if he is fine because of the traitor running around. Hans assures Regina that he is fine while apologizing for coming late. He also commends her for handling Pete's situation very well. Regina is shocked to hear this because Hans was supposedly away when she spoke to Pete. Hans realizes that he has slipped up, but he manages to change the conversation before Regina digs deeper. He tells his sister that they should enter the room and check on their mother. Inside their mother's room, the woman urges the kids to be careful because of the traitor wandering their territory. She also adds that the kids cooperate with the Imperial Knights so they don't get into any trouble. Unknown to her, Hans has already crossed that line. Hans then assures his mother that he has provided troops to help on the search, and since the traitor is wounded, it won't take long before he is discovered. Hans then lies to his mother that he met an elderly foreign woman when he was out on tour. He claims to have helped the old lady, and in return, she gave him a ring imbued with special energy. Hans assures her mother that wearing the ring would gradually restore her health. Owen is surprised to hear this because she never took her son as the type who believes in myths. Hans tells her mother that he might not believe, but he still wants to give his mother the beautiful ring. He wears the ring on his mother's finger, and the artifact immediately gets to work. Owen immediately wears a bright smile while admitting that she feels much better. Even Regina is shocked to hear this. Owen looks closely at the gem on the ring and figures out that it is a yellow sapphire. With how the ring looks, Even Owen can easily deduce that the artifact must be worth a lot. Hans is the only one who knows the true worth of the ring, and he knows that chaos would ensue if people ever find out that the ring alone is worth more than a castle. A day later, Lakia is still recovering. Hans and Madeline have been taking shifts to guard the room. Madeline watches over Lakia during the day while Hans takes over at night. Hans served as a servant in his past life, so staying up at night is nothing new to him. However, he feels less fatigued, which is all thanks to the dragon heart inside of him. Nonetheless, Hans isn't concerned about himself, but about Lakia. Hans doesn't know if Lakia's wound will be fine if he just leaves it alone. He has wiped the blood and pus, but the wound remains too deep. Just then, he hears someone knocking on the door 5 times. Hans reveals that he and Madeline came up with a trick. Either of them will knock on the door 5 times to confirm that it is them, since they can't risk other servants finding out about what they are hiding. Madeline enters the room carrying herbs with her. Hans is shocked to see this, and Madeline explains that since Lakia's external wound is severe, she brought medicinal herbs which are good for disinfection and recovery. Hans is further surprised by this, and he asks Madeline how she knows about herbs. Madeline reveals that her father was an herbalist, and while her father was working, she usually watched. Hans then remembers that Madeline had once told him and the other servants that she had learned how to make herbal teas. Hans assumed that Madeline could only make tea, but didn't know that she could handle herbs too. Madeline grinds the herbs, applies them to Lakia's wounds, and then dresses them up. Hans is glad that he has Madeline, who is basically a healer. With everything that Madeline is doing, Hans hopes that Lakia recovers. This continued for days, but Lakia doesn't show any sign of waking up. It has now been 5 days since they have been trying their best, but Lakia remains unconscious. Later that day, Madeline makes her way to the room, and she is shocked when she enters the room and there is no sign of Lakia anywhere. She immediately runs over to find Hans, and unknown to her, Lakia has regained consciousness and he is hiding behind a chair. While hiding behind cover, Lakia hears the troops outside announcing something quite important. Apparently, they have found Lakia's body in the mountain range. Lakia is shocked to hear this, but unknown to him, Hans is already in the room with him. He is able to get close to Lakia without him knowing, thanks to his invincibility artifact. Hans announces his presence by calling Lakia's name and expressing his surprise that he is already awake. In truth, Hans was already aware that Lakia was awake. Thanks to his dragon heart, Hans now has heightened senses, and he could tell that Lakia's breathing had changed. The only reason he kept pretending to still be asleep was that he was suspicious of the situation. Hans is not surprised that Lakia did this because it is the logical thing to do since he is a man on the run. Lakia must have been startled when he woke up in a stranger's room to see that he was being cared for by a boy and a girl he clearly didn't know. Knowing all of these, Hans is aware that Lakia is obviously wary of his presence. Lakia shows this by aiming a charcoal picker at Hans. Lakia demands to know Hans's name, and if he is part of the troops that are outside. Hans tries the friendly approach, but Lakia suggests that he doesn't come any closer. Hans tells the man to calm down because he is still injured. He suggests that they sit down to talk so he can explain things to him. Lakia finally agrees to sit down, but he still makes sure to keep the weapon beside him just in case Hans does anything funny. Hans knows that his approach and the way he talks will be the only things that can convince Lakia that he is not a threat. Hans finally tenders his explanation to Lakia, and after hearing what he has to say, the first thing Lakia asks is about the corpse. He is surprised that the corpse that the soldiers found was a fake that was arranged by Hans. Hans confirms that he dressed the corpse up like Lakia. He wore Lakia's clothes on the corpse and also put Lakia's signet ring on the corpse. Hans then apologizes for using Lakia's things without asking for permission first. Lakia then reminds Hans that Pete knows his face, which means that he won't be deceived by a fake. Hans acknowledges this fact, which is why he made sure everything was perfect. Since it is August and it is raining, Hans left the body in the swamp so it would decompose naturally. The knights were already tired from searching the forest, and knowing Pete, he also wanted to wrap things up quickly. With this, Hans is able to deceive Pete and the soldiers. Hans then tells Lakia to stay in hiding for 5 years, assuring him that his name will be cleared. He suggests that Lakia stay in the territory for 5 years. Just then, Lakia gets defensive, asking Hans how he knew he was falsely accused. He suspects that Hans is involved in everything, but Hans lets the man know that he can't divulge what he knows just yet. Lakia also asks to know what will happen in 5 years, but Hans insists that he can't say anything. He only begs Lakia to trust him, but Lakia is not ready to have this. Lakia tells Hans that he appreciates his help, but lets him know that he is not ready to entrust his life to someone who would not tell what he needs to know. Hans understands where Lakia is coming from. He was betrayed by everyone and was branded a traitor. Hans knows everyone will definitely look like an enemy to Lakia, which is why he needs to handle the situation much better. Hans then uses an illusion spell to change Lakia's hair and eye color. Lakia is shocked to see this, and he considers it impossible. Hans just used an illusion spell right in front of him, and this is an advanced spell. In addition to this, Hans didn't say any chance. This is something even the Imperial Court mages cannot manage to do, and Hans just did it like it was nothing. Hans notices that Lakia is too stunned to talk, and he calls back his attention. He tells Lakia that there are a whole lot of things he can't tell him, and he also understands why Lakia needs to be careful. However, Hans assures the guy that he has no intentions of causing him or the Emperor harm. Hans begs Lakia to believe him, and after some moments of silence, Lakia finally agrees to believe Hans until he can't. Hans is glad to hear this, and the fact that Lakia's hostility toward him has reduced. What he heard about Lakia was that he is a soft person, but Hans figured that everything that has happened so far has changed the guy. Hans pictures himself in a hostile situation where a scary cat is trying to get him. Soon afterward, Pete takes the news of Lakia's death to the Emperor. He expects the Emperor to be happy, but he is completely reserved instead. Pete reminds the Emperor that Lakia planned to unalive him and his family by poisoning them. To give Pete some sort of satisfaction, the king pretends to be happy with Pete's achievement. After receiving the commendation he sought, Pete leaves. After his departure, the Emperor breaks down. He holds his head in anguish while wishing things were different. In that moment of grief, the Emperor promises to restore Lakia's honor. Back in Callista, Lakia is slowly settling into his new environment. Hans introduced him to everyone as his new guard. When Hans calls a meeting in the study, Lakia is present. Regina is also present, but Regina is wary of Lakia. She asks Alman if Lakia is normal, and Alman assures the young lady that all is perfectly well with Lakia. Alman lied that Hans found Lakia during one of his tours. Alman then asks Regina if there is something that actually bothers her. The girl replies that there is nothing but looking at how Lakia carries himself. Regina suspects that he is a noble. This is her call for concern. She doesn't know why someone who looks like a noble will end up being a guard in a remote land like Callista. The two then forget about Lakia for a second and talk about why Hans called them to the study, but neither of them knows the reason behind the meeting. On the other hand, Lakia is impressed that Hans is trying his best to make sure that his identity stays hidden. Only Hans, Madeline, and Alman know his true identity out of all the people living in the castle. Lakia is worried about everyone in the castle, but the person he is most worried about is the guy who just entered the study room, Hans. He is surprised by the way Hans is running things in the castle. Since Hans took over the reins when he was 12, he most likely did not have any experience beforehand. However, Lakia is impressed with the whole fake corpse thing. In addition to this, Hans is handling everyone pretty well. Lakia even gets the feeling that Hans is more mature than him because of the way he does his thing. Lakia also commends the management of the castle. All the servants are carrying out their duties with a smile on their faces, which is something that is not even common in the capital. Lakia fails to believe the fact that the castle is being run by a 15-year-old boy. The only question Lakia can ask is, who is this guy? 10 minutes after entering the room, Hans has already prepared something crazy on the board. Everyone in the room is shocked when Hans reveals his intentions to open a bank. Lakia screams at the guy, telling him that it takes a hole to open a bank. He also warns that a lot of people have gone bankrupt while attempting the risky business of opening a bank. However, Hans calmly replies that he knows why most of them failed. Hans starts by explaining that a bank isn't just about acquiring land or capital. Hans identifies that the real challenge is assembling a competent team. Hans adds that to build a bank, they need people who can manage assets and evaluate investments. They also need accountants and people who can guard valuables. Hans admits that Callista has no way of recruiting such valuable people without connections. Because of this, Hans reveals his plan to start an academy where they can train their own people in the territory. Hans plans to split everything into an accounting track and a security track. While explaining all of these, Lakia realizes that Hans has thought about every possible outcome through and through. However, Lakia is still not impressed as he believes that Hans's plan is still far from being a realistic plan. Regina then raises a viable and important question. She reminds her brother that the commoners will not be able to afford tuition for the academy since nobles are generally the only ones who go to school. Hans acknowledges Regina's concern, but he already has a solution for this too. He reveals that he has no intentions of charging those who plan to attend the academy. Even Alman is shocked to hear that Hans plans to teach the commoners for free. However, Hans tells Alman that he is wrong. Hans will not treat those who are at the academy as students. He sees them as workers in training, and because of this, he also plans to pay them. Hans says it with a smile on his face that they are going to be paying the commoners while they study. This revelation leaves Alman, Regina, and Lakia absolutely shocked. Lakia realizes that Hans is not joking, because he is saying this with a straight face. Not long after this, Alman calls the servants together. He explains the new plan to them. He lets them know about the operational plan for the academy to support the founding of the Callista Bank. Per Hans's instructions, the first set of students is to be drafted from among the staff. Alman tells the staff to indicate if they are interested in joining. Claude is the first to raise his hand and ask questions. He wants to know if they will actually be getting paid while learning, and Alman assures him that this is the case. However, their daily wages as staff members will be reduced during their learning term. Oman assures them that the reduction will not affect their cost of living. After hearing this, the servants start whispering among themselves. Most of them are already excited to join, and even those who are not smart when it comes to books are planning to join the security division. Claude is surprised by everything Hans has done so far. He knows academies are for nobles, and this makes him wonder how commoners like himself and others are supposed to learn accounting or security. Madeline then reminds Claude that he is good at math. In addition to this, Claude handles errands pretty well. Madeline suggests that Claude give it a shot since he is capable. However, Claude is doubtful of his skills. Claude doesn't think the servants' learning in the academy will change anything. Madeline gives this a thought, and when she opens her mouth to talk, she tells Claude that she is planning to leave the estate. This comes as a shock to Claude, and Madeline explains that she recently helped Hans out with something, and as a reward, he is sponsoring her to study medicine. Madeline thought it was too much for someone like her to handle, but with what is going on, Madeline has finally decided to take the offer. Madeline remembers how Lakia thanked her after saving his life, and this meant a lot to her. That single moment filled Madeline with pride, and it made her realize that she could do much better. Even if it sounds too much, Madeline still wants to give it a try. Since she is going to take the chance, she urges Claude to do the same. Madeline's words eat deep into Claude, and he realizes that Madeline has a point. Claude finally enrolls in the accounting class. However, he still has doubts about his existence in the class. He wonders if he is going to be a failure. Since the servant's salary just got increased not long ago, he wonders if he could have just stayed back and enjoyed the salary instead. When Claude submits his test paper to the instructor, Poitiers, the instructor commends him for a job well done. Claude tries to normalize what he did, but the instructor lets him know that what he did was special. The instructor tells Claude that everyone might be able to do basic arithmetic, but not everyone is good with bookkeeping. The instructor adds that even the smartest nobles have issues with this, but Claude perfected it. Poitiers admits that he was skeptical when he was appointed as an instructor, but Claude's performance has given him some encouragement. The instructor then says it with all confidence that Claude will become a great accountant. Claude is initially doubtful about this, but then he remembers the sacrifices Hans is making so that they can be better. Because of this, Claude decides that he will do everything in his power to become good. At the security training session, Hans is shocked to find the students serving punishments per Lakia's instructions. Lakia scolds the bunch, calling them useless. Apparently, 30 minutes earlier, the students arrived looking all arrogant. They spoke to Lakia the way they wanted until he taught them a lesson by beating the crap out of them. Now that he has shown them that he is more than capable of being an instructor, the students have no choice but to do what Lakia wants. Lakia is not impressed, and he tells Hans that the accounting division might be good, but the security division is filled with thugs and the like. Lakia believes that he is going to be wasting his time and energy if he tries to teach the lowlifes. Realizing that Lakia is not motivated to help, Hans drags him away to a private place where they can talk. Hans tells Lakia that he is aware of his qualifications and how he was able to teach the emperor how to use the sword. Lakia replies that he was able to pull this off because the emperor himself was ready to learn. Lakia then asks Hans if he is trying to compare the king to commoners, but Hans says no. Hans lets Lakia know that he is making the reference to tell him that he is such a great teacher. Hans adds that Callista has no knight order, and Oswald is the only knight left, but he is too old to be an instructor. Hans then makes a bold statement. He tells Lakia that the king is not different from the commoners. Hans says people are people, maybe they are noble or not. In the end, they are still people, and the only difference is that someone recognizes their potential and helps them grow. And with the situation at hand, Hans believes that Lakia is the best candidate for the job. This statement hits Lakia really deep. He realizes that Hans has more conviction than he even gave him credit for. Lakia then tells Hans that he is going to need more time and resources, but Hans assures him that he is willing to cooperate with whatever he needs. Lakia then notices that Hans is already getting comfortable with the way he speaks to him. Hans was not like this when they first met, but it seems he has dropped his nervousness. Hans lets Lakia know that he considers him a reliable person, which is why he is comfortable with him. Lakia is done receiving compliments from Hans, and he quickly walks back to the training ground. Lakia gets there, and he is surprised but at the same time impressed by what he sees. Most of the students are still in the same stance that he left them in when he went to discuss with Hans. Lakia then remembers what Hans told him about people being people until someone recognizes their potential. Lakia smiles as he remembers this, and he finally decides to give his all to training the lowlifes. He tells the students to get back on their feet. He then mentions that what the students need is not just muscles or bravado, but grit and persistence. He lets them know that their willingness to stay, even after being punished, is a good quality, and he urges them not to forget what they have learned. With this, Lakia swings his class into motion. Lakia had previously thought he would spend his next 5 years hiding in a boring situation, but he is glad he now has something to spend his time on. In that year, which is the year 853, The Callista Academy was established to support the founding of the Callista Bank. It was divided into two sections, accounting and security, and the students were exclusively commoners from the region. And then in the blink of an eye, 3 years passed since the academy started. 3 years later, Hans's mother is now much better, all thanks to the artifact. She steps outside of her room, which she hasn't done in a long time. Regina is worried about her, but she assures her worried daughter that she is fine. She has missed the scent of nature, which is why she stepped outside to take everything in. Feeling very happy, Owen tells Regina to walk with her. Over the past 3 years, things like Owen regaining her strength and all others have happened in the region. Elsewhere, tax collectors visit a woman's house demanding a huge amount of money for taxes. The woman is ultimately baffled as she has no way to pay such a huge amount of money. The conversation between the helpless woman and the tax collectors continues until her son steps out of the house. Surprisingly, her son is Claude, and he knows all about accounting and taxes. Claude has been studying for the past 3 years, and he now dresses formally, not like a servant. He boldly reminds corrupt tax collectors of the revised tax rate. The two try to argue their case, but they soon realize that Claude knows what he is talking about. All low-earning citizens have a special low tax rate, and since his mother falls into this category, Claude is able to use this to fight the tax collectors. The officials have no choice but to back off, and Claude warns them that he is going to file a formal complaint if he ever hears any bad report about them again. The two run off like chickens while acknowledging what Claude says. After their departure, Claude reveals his disappointment about the bad eggs they still have in the region. His mother is worried about him, but Claude assures the woman that he is fine. The old lady doesn't want Claude arguing with the officials, fearing that they might retaliate, but Claude assures his mother that Hans is there to take care of any problem they might face. Meanwhile, inside the castle, a new maid knocks on Hans's door with no reply. She continues this until one of the older maids shows up. The older maid then shows her junior the X sign on the door. She informs her that no one is allowed to disturb Hans once the X sign is up. The young maid is surprised to hear this, and she asks if Hans is doing something inside the room, but the older maid also has no idea what might be going on inside the room. The older maid adds that even Lakia is not allowed to enter the room once the sign is up. Unknown to them, whenever Hans puts the sign up, he has vanished to the lair to train. He levels up and he gets to talk to Seifert, whom he has not spoken to in 3 years. The dragon is impressed with Hans's progress so far. It turns out that Hans is now on the 6th circle, which is very impressive because even the Imperial Court mage only manages to reach the 5th circle. Siegfried notices that Hans has been able to properly merge with the dragon heart living inside of him, which means he is now capable of performing large-scale magic. The dragon pats Hans on the head for growing this much in the space of 3 years. Siegfried then asks Hans if he is training any disciples, but Hans doesn't understand what the dragon meant. Siegfried explains that all great mages always have disciples, and since it is his legacy to leave magic in the world, Siegfried would like it if Hans had disciples under him. However, he assures Hans that he is not forced to do so since the power has been passed down to him and he is free to do with it whatever he wants. Over the past 3 years, Hans has unlocked new areas in the lair, and these are areas filled with treasures and the like. Even though there are many treasures and Hans could have gotten rich selling them, he has no interest in this because this is not Siegfried's legacy. Hans then tells Siegfried about his plan to build a bank. Siegfried mistakes this for a loan shark, but Hans explains to him that it is totally different. Hans then assures Siegfried that once he is able to make the bank a success and he secures plenty of funds, he plans to establish a magic academy to carry on Siegfried's legacy. Hans comments on the fact that the current magic academies are just there for fashion and nothing significant. No one really tries to become a mage anymore since it is nearly impossible to get past the 1st or 2nd circle in someone's lifetime. Magic is no longer being taught as it is now considered a thing of the past. However, with Siegfried's power running through his body, Hans plans to revive magic. With this, he will be able to have dozens of disciples to pass down the magic to generations to come. Siegfried's pleased with Hans's plan, and he tells him to give it a shot. Hans then leaves the lair, flying in the air with magic. He is able to look down on the territory from above. He is happy that everything has been going on so well for the past 3 years. The preparations to open the bank are also progressing well. Just then, he remembers that Lakia told him about providing the knights with plate armor and longswords. Since the knights will be fighting people, they need protection too. Hans agrees with what Lakia said, but because Callista was an underdeveloped region with no threat, they haven't put too much importance on weapons and plate armor. However, things are much different now, and Hans knows that they need to prepare for war in advance. Hans then decides to scan the mountains, hoping to find iron ore that will be useful for the next stage in their plan. He is scanning the area when he suddenly spots a golden aura in the distance.
Hans has not seen anything like this before, and it catches his attention.
Hans moves in that direction to check out what it might be. He finds a wounded cat-like creature lying there helpless on the ground. Using his magic, Hans heals the creature. He carries the creature and admires it, and then decides to take it home. This turned out to be something really huge because the cat-like creature ended up changing into a person inside of Hans's room. After Hans carries the cat the night before, he notices that the cat is getting weaker, and he decides to take the creature to the lair where he can use the magic healing circle. He didn't bother to use the magic circle during Lakia's time, because he wanted to keep the location and existence of the lair a secret. However, he can do this for the feline creature and just set it on its way. He places the feline in the magic circle, and the feline gets healed. Hans expects the feline to stand up in 10 minutes, but to his surprise, the feline remains unconscious for the next 3 hours. Hans has no choice but to take the feline home with the intention of letting it out once it wakes up. He knows he has to do this very early in the morning because he and Lakia, who is now his guard knight, always have breakfast together. Hans places the kitten on the bed so it can sleep comfortably. The next morning, Hans wakes up screaming, and this catches Lakia's attention. He rushes down to Hans's room, demanding that he open the door. However, Hans blocks the door with his body while trying to digest what he is looking at. The feline he brought home the night before had turned into a full-grown man by the time he woke up, which is why he screamed like hell. Hans tries getting rid of Lakia by telling him that he saw a bug, which is why he screamed. He also tells Lakia that he will have breakfast with him later in the day. Hans then turns to the cat guy, asking him who he is. Hans still doesn't know that the cat was the one who transformed until the guy changes back into a cat. Hans had his suspicions, but now that he is looking at the cat guy transform, he realizes that the guy is a feline folk. Feline folks are a mysterious race living in a society that is cut off from the human world. The feline folks have existed as long as the elves and dwarves as well. However, people rarely see them because they are very cautious about exposing themselves. Since they rarely interact with humans, little is known about them. The cat guy starts walking around the room, and he suddenly decides that he is going to continue staying there. Hans is shocked to hear this because he doesn't remember giving the cat guy permission to stay in his room. Hans tries to debate this, but the cat guy reminds Hans that he was the one who took him in the first place. The guy claims that Hans kidnapped him and even treated his wounds without his permission. With all of this said, the cat guy informs Hans that he is now responsible for him. Hans realizes that the cat guy is very pushy and cunning. Hans then mentions the fact that the guy would have died if he had left his wounds unattended. Since feline folks have better abilities and physical strength superior to humans, Hans figures that there is no way the guy was hurt by a human. He then asks the cat guy if he was wounded by a fellow feline folk like himself. The question hits the cat guy really hard, and he stays mute, suggesting that Hans might actually be right. Hans is still trying to get closer to the cat guy when Lakia bursts through the door. This scares the two, but Lakia wastes no time drawing his sword the moment he spots the cat guy. He demands that the cat guy step away from Hans. Lakia quickly rushes over to where Hans is. He stands between Hans and the cat guy while pointing his sword at the feline folk. This is when Hans remembers that Lakia is a swordmaster, which means he can also sense the abnormal aura coming from the feline folk. The cat guy is pissed, and he raises his hand, ready to strike Lakia. Realizing that the two will hurt each other, Hans uses the blink spell and gets in between them. The two manage to hold back at the last minute so as not to hurt Hans. After successfully defusing the situation, Hans turns to Lakia, telling him to calm down. He tells Lakia that the cat guy is having some issues, which is why he has decided to take him in the meantime. He begs Lakia not to be hostile, and this act of selflessness shocks the cat guy. With a stern face, Lakia asks why a feline folk like himself is walking around in the human world. Hans then replies that it is a personal matter. Lakia angrily points at Hans, reminding him that he is his guard knight. Lakia scolds him for bringing a stranger into his bedroom without thinking twice. In addition to this, Hans jumped in front of his sword without the fear of getting hurt. Hans then replies that he was sure that neither of them would hurt him, which is why he did what he did. Hearing such words from Hans shocks the cat guy yet again. Lakia continues ranting about how dangerous feline folks are, and this is when the cat guy cuts in. He interrupts the conversation and reveals that his name is Asa. Hans is glad to hear the guy's name. He then suggests that Asa and Lakia put their differences aside and shake hands. He too did as told, and with this, Hans successfully found two companions in the Compton Mountains. Hans is not ready to ask Asa for details about his past, but he is sure that the guy will open up to him one day. Hans is not ready to push someone who just survived too hard, but he is worried about Asa and Lakia getting along. With this, the trio continues living their lives, but Asa is always on Lakia's neck. He might suddenly demand that the guy bring him snacks. Lakia doesn't like the fact that all the cat guy does is eat and sleep with no useful purpose. However, Hans still finds a way to spoil the guy, leaving Lakia really pissed. Not long after this, Hans tells the two that everything is now ready for him to open the Bank of Callista. With excitement, he reveals that the first Callista Bank will be opened in the capital. Looking into finances, if they are to mention the richest person in the kingdom, it won't be the emperor or even a duke. It turns out that the richest person in the land is Baronet Dominic Sullivan. Dominic was the one who started the empire's first banking business, and since then has dominated the financial world. After him, Many nobles tried entering the banking sector, but they all failed. No one could fight off Dominic's monopoly on the banking system. In his home, Dominic receives his assistant, who is there to give him the report on things. While smoking a huge cigar, Dominic tells the guy to make his report in order of importance. Dominic is informed that he has been summoned by Duke McCarthy, and the summons is related to the Imperial Protocol. Knowing fully well that it is a royal summons, Dominic says that he has to go. He then tells his assistant to schedule the meeting for the afternoon. After this, he is informed that a particular noble, Count Chenoweth, has asked for another month to consider the proposed deal. Finally, Dominic is informed about the new opening of a bank in the capital. He is informed that the bank is being run by House Callista, but they only have one branch in the capital for now. When Dominic learns that the bank is being run by the Callistas, he doesn't put too much interest in it. He considers them a rural family with no notable investments to their name. Dominic assumes that the bank will go bankrupt soon enough so he doesn't need to disturb himself. He tells his assistant to ignore the new bank, but in reality Dominic plans to double-check if the Callistas have a backing that he is not aware of. Now in the capital, the new bank that just opened is attracting loads of attention. This doesn't usually happen, but the bank is gaining attention because of its business plan and strategy. It turns out that Han's new bank is only charging 1 copper to open accounts for new customers. In addition to this, they are giving out loans without collateral. At the regular banks, a minimum of 1 gold coin is required to open a bank account. And when it comes to giving out loans, they usually take collateral of equal value. This is the reason commoners have never had any reason to use banks, since only nobles can live up to the set criteria. But this is not the case with Callista Bank. New customers are given advice on how to go about their savings. The bank tellers ask for their monthly income and use this to set a savings plan for them. For the collection of loans, the bank only gives out loans after looking at the customer's income and credit rating. They plan to give out loans that the customers will have no issue paying back due to the level of their income. Even old people who can't read are not left behind. The bank attendants are willing to help every customer according to what they need. Callista Bank gives room for commoners who are poor and have no financial backing to get access to banking benefits too. The bank takes into consideration why their customers are opening the account and what they plan to do in the future, and with this, they are able to give solid advice. A woman enters the bank with doubts about getting a bank account, but she is ultimately shocked when the bank opens an account for her. Something surprising then happens after she is done opening the account. The woman is given a raffle ticket. These tickets will be handed out to everyone who opens an account with the bank in their first month. The woman is asked to put the raffle ticket in the designated box, and in a month's time, lots will be drawn to announce 3 winners. The woman is further surprised when she hears that the bank will be giving out prizes. Apparently, the first place person will receive 25 gold coins. The second place person will receive 10 gold coins, while the third place person will receive 5 gold coins. Everyone present in the bank is shocked to hear this, and they all start rushing to open an account just so they can get a raffle ticket. Standing in the lobby are Alman and Claude. Alman applauds Claude for his ingenuity. Apparently, the raffle thing was his idea. In addition to this, he brought the credit rating idea after brainstorming with other students like him. Moments later, the two receive a report that they have hit their goal of opening 100 accounts on the first day, and they still have 4 hours of work time left. Claude is absolutely blown away to hear this, and in addition to that, they have received 30 load applications. Alman is confident that Hans will be excited when he hears the news. Alman wishes that Hans could come over to see things for himself. The bankers and guards who were locally trained in Callista are all doing just fine. Alman says they have succeeded in creating a bank which everyone can use, and this is Hans's goal from the start. Not long after this, reports reach Hans in Callista. He is glad to find out that Alman and Claude are doing well in the capital. While having drinks with his sister and mother, he tells them that the bank has reached its target and everything is going well. Hans is impressed, and he plans to give all of his workers a hefty bonus. Regina is glad to hear this impressive news, but she still cannot believe that her brother has become a bank manager. Just then, Hans asks his sister if she is willing to try out a business too. Hans remembers that Regina once learned management. He asks her sister if she has ever thought of where to apply the things she has learned. Hans assures his sister that he is going to help her in whatever business she chooses to run. Regina then mentions that there is nothing coming to her head. She doesn't see herself as a talented person like Hans. In addition to this, she doesn't see herself doing anything in Callista. Hans then makes a suggestion. He wants them to go to the capital. Hans also tells Lakia and the cat girl this. Lakia is shocked when he hears this, but he is open to going to the capital. For the past 3 years, Lakia has been serving as Hans's guard knight, and he has done his job diligently. Since there are 2 years left for his name to be cleared, Hans is worried about Lakia stepping into the capital, but he is hoping that all goes well. Just then, he turns to the cat guy, and before he can call his name to ask him if he is interested in coming, the guy jumps at Hans in excitement. Lakia scolds the cat guy for always jumping at Hans. He tells him that Hans's body is frail and weak, and he could easily get hurt. However, the cat guy is so stubborn that he doesn't even have any regard for whatever Hans is saying. As they are planning to go to the capital, Hans sincerely hopes that things will turn out fine. When it is time to go to the capital, Regina is surprised that her brother will be taking another carriage. Hans explains that he can't leave Asa and Lakia alone with each other since they have not gotten along yet. He assures his sister that he will be following closely behind. It is going to take them at least a month to get to the capital, and Hans cannot afford to leave the two stubborn heads together. This then reminds Regina that her brother supposedly found the two while on tour. She wonders how her brother ends up finding strays while he is on his tour. She starts to doubt if Hans truly got the healing ring from an old lady. There is a moment of silence between the two since Hans doesn't know how to reply. Hans runs off, telling his sister to call him in case anything happens. Regina complains to their mother that Hans is hiding a lot from them, but Owen urges Regina not to think too much about things. She tells Regina that all they can do for the moment is watch and wait for him to open up to them when he is ready. With this, the family begins their journey to the capital. A month later, they arrive at the capital, and Asa is the most excited as he starts jumping in the carriage. Lakia urges him to sit still because the carriage is shaking, but Asa just cannot hide his excitement. Hans understands why Lakia might be uncomfortable. Everything might be new to Hans and Asa, but to Lakia, it is a return home and a reminder that he was betrayed. Asa continues acting childishly, and he even opens the carriage door while at it. This gets Lakia mad, and he knocks him on the head for being too stubborn. An argument ensues between the two, and Hans can only wonder when the two will finally get along with each other. He sees more reason why he cannot leave the two all alone, because it is inevitable that they are going to cause trouble. Not long after this, they arrive at the Callista townhouse and they are welcomed by Alman. The townhouse is an apartment that nobles usually keep in major cities outside of their territory in case they come visiting. House Callista never had a townhouse, which means this is their first. The house is not that luxurious, but it will serve them for now. In addition to this, Madeline is back from medical school, and she will now serve as Owen's personal doctor. After taking a look around, Hans figures that he will be spending more time in the capital than Callista. However, he had already arranged a route just in case. Just moments after arriving, Hans prepares to go to the bank. Alman is surprised to see this, and he reminds Hans that he just arrived after a month on the road. Alman suggests that Hans rest, but he refuses. Hans says Regina and Owen are free to rest, but since the bank belongs to him, he needs to see things for himself. Asa immediately begs to follow when he notices that Hans will be going with Lakia. Hans tries to dissuade Asa from following them, but he is just too adamant. Hans arrives at the bank, and he is shocked when he sees a large crowd inside the bank. Alman informs him that this is so because they are conducting the lottery draw as promised. The third place winner of the draw turns out to be number 318, and she jumps in excitement when her name is called. Those who are watching are extremely shocked when they realize that the bank is actually keeping to its promise. Even the guards are having a hard time controlling the crowd since they are not used to having such a large number of people in the bank. Alman apologizes for the inconvenience, but Hans urges him to make sure that there are no safety incidents. However, Hans is impressed with what he is seeing. He never thought everything would go so smoothly. Since there are too many people, Lakia suggests that they leave, and Hans concurs. Hans has seen what he came to see, and he is satisfied. Hans then brings up a suggestion. He wants them to go shopping. They arrive at one of the shopping stores, and Asa excitedly reveals that it is different from the ones they have in Callista. Hans then tells Lakia and Asa to pick clothes of their choice. He assures them that he will be paying for whatever they buy as a celebration for arriving in the capital. Asa spots a nice fabric and quickly picks it out. He tells Hans that he wants the fabric because of its elaborate patterns. Hans asks him if he wants to cut it into a dress, but Asa says no. He wants the fabric like that. Asa reveals that they usually wrap fabrics around their body from their hometown. Asa tries it out, and it looks beautiful on him. Once Hans has settled Asa, he asks Lakia if there is anything he would like to buy, but Lakia says no. He claims that the knights have no need to dress up. Since Lakia has no interest in buying a dress, Hans suggests that he change his sword instead. However, Lakia still says he is not interested. Hans notices that Lakia is acting strangely, and he asks the guy if there is anything wrong with him. Lakia claims that he is fine, but deep down, Hans knows that he must be feeling the pressure of coming back to the capital. The trio talks past a knight commander, and it seems their conversation catches his attention. The commander turns back after hearing Lakia's voice. He suspects that the voice resembles that of Lakia de Rodriguez, but he has no way of proving it yet. Meanwhile, at the bank, something interesting is happening. The commoners who are present are shocked when they see a noble enter the bank. Inside the manager's office, the branch manager, Poitier, is seen talking to a noble. Apparently, what the noble is asking for is way past Poitier's pay grade. The noble wastes no time asking the branch manager to arrange a meeting with the bank owner himself. The noble finally introduces himself. He is the eldest son of the Count of Chenovis, and his name is Duran von Chenovis. He is at the bank because he needs a loan of 7,000 gold. Hearing this sends Hans and Poitier into shock. 7,000 gold is a really huge amount of money. When converting it to modern money, it is 14 billion won, or 10 million US dollars. Poitier wonders how Hans plans to handle such a huge amount of money. A few minutes earlier, Hans was just about to return to the townhouse when he was informed that he had an important client at the bank. He had to rush down, and now he is hearing that Duran needs 7,000 gold. Hans then asks Duran what he plans to use the money for. Duran is stunned by the question, and Hans lets him know that he is aware of his status as a noble, but the money he is requesting is huge, which is why he needs to have an idea of what the money will be used for before giving an answer. This is when it dawns on Duran that Callista Bank is capable of giving him the required funds. Realizing this, Duran comes clean. He explains that the Chenovis were once ranked among the 10 wealthiest families in the empire. This is all thanks to their possession of the empire's largest grain supply in the Chernik region. Chernik is a land blessed by the goddess of earth herself, making it a fertile region where even scattering seeds brings overflowing harvests. It produced the majority of the empire's grain supply, and because of this, the Chenovi remained wealthy for generations. This continued until the new count came in. The count is an addicted gambler, and before long, he exhausted Chernik's liquid assets. In a bid to recover his losses, he kept raising the stakes using the family treasures. However, things went really bad, and he ended up putting the estate itself up for collateral, and currently, the debt has grown to a huge sum of 7,000 gold in total. Talking about this large amount of money, the only financial institution capable of helping is the Sullivan Bank. However, the bank is demanding Chernik itself as collateral. Because Chernik is precious to the Chenovis, it is hard for them to put it up as collateral. Hans then thinks to himself that Chernik can actually pay Sullivan in a couple of years if they are able to manage their revenue. Hans gives it a thought after hearing everything Duran has to say. Hans tells Duran to stay put as he has to discuss with his staff. Hans then steps outside with Poitier. Inside, Duran already concludes that there is no way Callista Bank is giving him the loan. While discussing with Hans, Poitier reveals that Chernik is essentially lost if the Chenovis put it up for collateral. Hans doesn't get the logic behind this, and Poitier explains to him. He lets him know that Sullivan Bank will do everything in its power to make sure that the Chenovis fail to repay the loan, and with this, he will be able to collect Chernik. This is why the Chenovis keep stalling the deal with Sullivan, hoping for a miracle. Their issue with Sullivan is already a public issue in the capital. However, Poitier still believes that giving out a loan without collateral is wrong. Hans then starts racking his brain to try and find a way out. Hans has the capacity to give out the loan, all thanks to the treasures in the lair, but he wants to be careful with his spending. He doesn't want to throw money around out of pity or pride. He then tries to recall what happened with the Chernovis in his past life, but it is hard for him to pick something out. Since the Callista territory is in a remote area, they rarely receive information from the capital. However, Hans continues thinking, hoping that he will remember something that he can connect to his past life. Suddenly, something clicks inside his head, and his eyes light up in shock. Without even telling Poitier, Hans runs into the room to talk to Duran. With the knowledge that Hans has from his past life, he knows something quite important, and he knows that giving out the loan is the best course of action. Hans tells Duran that Callista Bank will provide the requested loan, and this shocks both Duran and Poitier. Poitier tries to argue with Hans, but Hans tells him that it will be fine. He then asks Poitier to step outside so he can personally handle the contract with Duran. Even though Poitier is skeptical about the whole thing, he has no choice but to do as told. Duran sits there with total disbelief. He never thought he would get a lifeline because, since they ran into debt, the family has been mocked and trashed. They have been subjected to predators who want to get their hands on Chernik. But now, Callista Bank is coming to his aid with a loan with no collateral. With deep gratitude, Duran thanks Hans for the help. Hans then tells Duran that the money he is giving to him is not a donation or charity. Hans mentions that he is offering Duran a legitimate contract. Duran reminds Hans that the Chenovis no longer have any property to use as collateral, but Hans is not concerned about this. He places a paper sheet on the table and tells Duran that 2 written promises are all he needs from him. With this, Hans approves the loan to help Duran and his family. When Dominic Sullivan hears about this, he gets absolutely mad. He couldn't believe that a boy of 18 years was able to manage a bank to give out such a huge amount of money. With the information he has, the Callista territory has nothing of great importance, which means there should be no good revenue from there. However, Callista still managed to give out the loan. He then asks his assistant if there is anything or something that they are missing when it comes to the Callistas, but the assistant says no. With everything they have gathered, the territory is so underdeveloped that it has no artifacts or anything of value. All of these just keep driving Dominic crazy since he doesn't know how Callista is able to raise 7,000 gold. He tells his assistant that they need to carry out more investigation into the Callista family. Dominic cannot believe that all of his efforts to get Count Chernovis bankrupt are about to go underwater. Apparently, he is the mastermind behind the Count's gambling addiction, just so he can get his hands on Chernik. Not long after this, Hans receives a letter. He hasn't stayed long in the capital, but he is already receiving letters. This is all thanks to his sudden popularity because of the loan he gave to Duran and his family. It turns out that the Callista family has been invited to a banquet. The invitation was sent by Count Al von Heisbert, whom they have not even interacted with in the past. Lakia tells Hans that it is not a surprise because Hans is the most popular guy in the capital at the moment. Hans's bank was known to be a bank for commoners, but its ability to give Duran the loan of 7,000 gold made everyone curious. This is why Callista has become the focal point of countless rumors and speculation. To avoid suspicions, Hans had to lie to Regina and Owen that their late father managed finances well, which is how he was able to get the funds he needed for business. However, Hans knows that he needs to be cautious so he doesn't expose himself. Hans then asks Lakia and Asa if they are interested in coming to the party with him, but the two reject the offer. Lakia's rejection is not surprising, but Hans is shocked that Asa is not interested in going to a party. Asa is the fun type, and avoiding a party speaks volumes. Asa then reveals that he has no interest in social gatherings. Asa is considered a fun person because he likes to play with Hans. He lets Hans know that he only wants to play with him and no one else. Because of this, Asa has made the decision to stay at home, and even Lakia is shocked to see that Asa still has some level of restraint in him. At the banquet, lots of nobles are present. While some are drinking and having fun, some are talking about the next business idea. Just then, Hans, Regina, and Owen enter the room, immediately catching everyone's attention. Without introduction, most of the nobles in the house already figure that the trio is the Callista family. They were expecting someone who was older, but they were shocked to see that Hans is very young. They also find it hard to believe that Hans started a business at her age. Everyone has heard about the Chernovis affair, but they keep wondering how a noble from a rural area is able to pull off such a big stunt. Their attention soon shifts to the beautiful dresses that Owen and Regina are wearing. They are intrigued by how classic and original the dresses look. This sparks questions among the girls as they start wondering which shop made the dress. One of the girls wastes no time approaching Regina. Introductions get underway, and in no time, Regina starts getting the social life she deserves. Even Hans admits that he intentionally came to the banquet because of Regina. He is trying to introduce her to society since she has always been backstage. In his past life, Regina was the backbone of the family since her brother was useless. This prevented her from making friends or having a social life. However, Hans aims to change things up. He wants Regina to enjoy herself at this current time. It turns out that Hans also got the dresses from the Dragon Lair, which is why they turned out great on the girls. Hans is in deep thought when two nobles appear behind him. This startles Hans, forcing an apology from the two. They introduce themselves as Count Milligan and Viscount Roxon. The two reveal that they are big fans of Hans' works. They are impressed by Hans's ingenuity in opening accounts for people with just 1 copper. Hans is flattered by the praises, and he thanks the nobles for their kind words. The two ask about the 7,000 gold loan to the Chernovis, and Hans confirms what they want to hear, but lets them know that he can't share the contract details. Roxon tries to dig deeper in an attempt to know Hans's financial standing, but Hans assures him that there is no fear of bankruptcy for the bank. The two then start talking about their businesses and how hard it is to secure funds because of the recession. As expected, Hans offers them a way out by letting them know that they are free to come to the bank to get loans. They are in the middle of this conversation when Hans's mother shows up to tell him that she can't find Regina. She is already worried, but Hans assures her that Regina will be fine. Owen claims she left her with the other kids so that they could talk, but she suddenly disappeared. She has asked the other girls, but no one seems to know where she is. Hans then urges her mother not to worry, assuring her that he is going to find Regina. He tells his mother to rest while he searches for Regina. Hans assumes that Regina got lost because she is not used to banquets and parties. Using his magic, Hans searches the hall, but there are no traces of Regina. He expands the search outside but still doesn't get a glimpse of Regina. His search area finally reaches the garden, and he realizes that Regina is talking to someone. Hans steps outside to find Regina, but just as he gets closer to the garden, he hears Regina scream. Using a magic spell called Haste, Hans rushes to where Regina is. He arrives just in time to see a guy drawing his sword at Regina. Hans is shocked to see this. Apparently, weapons are banned at banquets, which is why Lakia didn't even bother to escort Hans to the party. Before the guy can hurt Regina, Hans teleports between them. Regina is shocked to see her brother appear out of nowhere. Using the rejection spell, Hans disarms the suspicious fellow. Just then, something interesting happens. A mage appears out of nowhere, and after a brief chant, he places a shield between Hans and the suspicious fellow. Even Hans is shocked to see a mage come out of nowhere, and the only thing he keeps wondering is who the guy is. Realizing that he is going up against a mage, Hans decides not to hold back, especially when his family is in danger. Not ready to back down, Hans launches a wind arrow attack at the mage. This pierces the mage's shield and flies past him and the sword guy behind him. The attack hits the wall, but the fact that the attack came through shocks the mage. Out of concern for the person he is trying to protect, the mage speaks out. He asks if His Majesty is okay. And this is when reality dawns on Regina and Hans, 30 minutes before the entire thing. Regina was having fun with the girls inside the house. Regina talks to them about how Callista is totally different from the capital. They are in the middle of this conversation when Regina looks through the window and sees a beautiful flower standing in the garden. Interested in the flower, she excuses herself from the gathering and walks to the garden. Her newfound friends are disappointed that Regina left them early since they haven't asked her where she got her beautiful dress. Getting to the garden, Regina stares at the beautiful pink flower, wondering what kind of flower it is. Just then, she hears a voice behind her telling her that the flowers are lilac. This startles Regina, and she immediately turns around to see the young man talking to him. The young man mentions his love for scents. He says this is why he spoke out without thinking twice. He then asks Regina if she also likes flowers. Regina is too stunned to talk because of the presence of a handsome man standing in her presence. When she finally opens her mouth to talk, she reveals that she doesn't know much about flowers, but she likes the fragrance. Because of how nice the scent is, Regina is thinking of planting the flowers along the street of the estate where she lives. The young man is surprised to hear this because most nobles do not plant lilac since it is expensive. The young man then takes Regina's thought further. He believes that the flowers will be nice if they are planted on the public street instead of being inside a walled garden. Without realizing it, the two start to synchronize in their thoughts. When the two finally realize that they are already talking in sync, Regina apologizes while blushing. Her face is already red from excitement. Even she doesn't know why she is so free with the young man she just met. Regina realizes that she hasn't even asked for the guy's name. She opens her mouth to talk, but at the same time the guy speaks up too. The situation gets even more awkward with the two lovebirds. Regina finally reveals that she wants to know the young man's name. Just as the young man is about to speak up, he spots a snake crawling out of the grass, and it is headed toward Regina. Regina also sees this, and she screams in fear. In reaction to this, the young man unsheathes his sword in an attempt to kill the snake. And this is when Hans showed up, believing that the young man was about to hurt his sister. By instantly teleporting between Regina and the young man, Hans stepped on the snake without even realizing it. It turns out that this is how everything unfolded, and the young man was not trying to hurt Regina. Regina and Hans bow their heads, asking for forgiveness. They didn't know they were standing in front of the emperor, but the young man didn't take offense at this. He understands that the situation was a misunderstanding. It turns out that the young man is the Emperor of Rosenbaum, late Crowell Carter III. And the reason he has a weapon with him is that only royals are allowed to carry a weapon to banquets. To make things even more interesting, the mage who protected him is the Imperial Archmage, Rumbly Ivan. He is the wielder of the continent's highest magic, which is level 5 magic. The soldiers stationed in the area hear the commotion and start rushing to the scene. Crowell has no interest in the soldiers seeing him or the situation escalating. Seeing how the Emperor reacted, Hans jumped into action without thinking twice. He immediately casts a mirage wall to deceive the incoming soldiers. The soldiers reach there and see nothing, causing them to go the other way, believing that they heard the noise from the other side. Once they are gone, Hans tells Crowell that he placed the barrier so that the Emperor won't have to get caught in further commotion. Hans is talking smoothly, but behind him, his sister is freaking out. This is understandable because she has no idea that her brother can use magic. As if this is not enough, Ivan grabs Hans. Ivan is totally blown away by the level of magic that Hans used. The Mirage spell is a level 6 magic, and Hans just used it without even uttering any incantation. Ivan cannot believe what he just saw, and he starts to wonder if he is wrong, but he is damn sure that he didn't mishear Hans. Crowell then taps Ivan on the shoulder to try and get the excited man under control. Crowell thanks Hans for his help and then demands to know his name and that of his sister. On the other hand, Ivan still cannot hide his excitement. Hans and Regina finally introduce themselves, and upon hearing their names, Crowell realizes that they are the current talk of the town. As for Crowell, Hans knows that he is a puppet to Townsend and McCarthy. This is why he doesn't have any strong allies, and the more reason he has not affiliated himself with any noble family. Because of these issues, Crowell barely makes public appearances. As expected, Crowell and Ivan say their goodbyes with Crowell, hoping that he will get to talk to the two much longer another time. Hans is surprised that even with all the issues Crowell is facing, he still showed up at a banquet. Hans then turns to his sister, suggesting that they go back to the banquet. However, Regina is not about to let what she just saw slide. She demands an explanation, and as usual, Hans tries to dodge the conversation. But Regina is not having it this time. Realizing that his sister will not let go, Hans promises to tell her later and urges them to head back inside first. Upon re-entering the hall, they notice that something is totally off from the way things were before. Regina rushes over to her mother to ask her what the problem is and why people are suddenly looking at them like they are trash. Owen replies that she is also confused but knows that everything changed when a certain gentleman entered the room. Talking about a certain gentleman, it turns out to be Dominic Sullivan. He entered the hall and tried to turn everyone against the Callistas, claiming the family lacks etiquette. Apparently, it is customary to greet all the guests in the house when a family is making its debut. Dominic trashes Hans and his family, saying they have no manners because they are from the countryside. Everything Dominic is saying is eating really deep into Hans, but Regina most especially. Regina wants to react to this, but Hans stops her. Hans understands what Dominic is trying to do, and he admits that it is a clever tactic. In truth, there was a really old custom to greet everyone at a banquet, but the said tradition has been extinct for decades, so no one follows it anymore. Hans is aware that everyone is already seeing them as rude and uncultured with the way things are, and the one leading everything is none other than Dominic. Dominic has a vast knowledge of etiquette, and in addition to this, he started the banking business. This gives Dominic the edge over everybody. It is no private knowledge that almost all the nobles owe Dominic's bank. This is why only a few will dare to defy whatever he says. Hans was already expecting Dominic to come after him because of the whole Chenovis issue, but he didn't expect Dominic to use a disgraceful tactic against him. Hans is totally confused, and he doesn't know what to do at the moment. He doesn't want to do anything that will escalate the situation. He knows he can endure the embarrassment, but his mother and Regina are out of the picture. Hans starts blaming himself for not thinking things through before inviting Regina and his mother to the party. He clenches his fist in anger, but out of nowhere, he hears someone call his name. It turns out to be Duran, and he is walking toward Hans with excitement all over his face. The moment people see Duran talking to Hans, the atmosphere starts to change. Duran tells Hans that he has been looking for him since he heard that he would be attending. Duran goes as far as introducing Hans to his friends. Hans is blown away by Duran's reception and that of his friends. In turn, this rubs off on everyone present in the room. The girls from before run over to Regina and start talking to her again. The girls want to finish their conversation from before, and Regina openly welcomes them. Duran and Hans then move to a private place so they can talk better. Duran apologizes if he spoke too familiarly with Hans, but reveals that he saw how difficult the situation is, which is why he stepped in. He reveals that Dominic has caused situations like this several times. Hans is in no way angry with what Duran did, but instead, he is grateful because the guy literally saved him and his family from embarrassment. Hans then reveals his surprise to see Duran command such presence from the other nobles. Duran reveals that his presence is highly influenced by his father's reputation. In the past, his father had good conduct, and he was always welcomed in every social circle. However, things are different now that he is only known as an addicted gambler. Duran also tells Hans that he is grateful for saving his family because without his help, he wouldn't be present at the banquet. Hans then realizes that he didn't help the Chenovis out of pity because he didn't even know Duran's father was well respected. On the way back home, Hans starts to reflect on the event of the day. He realizes that he messed up really badly. His encounter with the Emperor could have gone sideways all thanks to his recklessness. Hans realizes that magic and money won't help him shape the future. What he truly needs is information. Upon getting home, Hans partially reveals his identity to his mother and Regina. He confesses that he is a mage, and his power even surpasses that of the Archmage. However, Hans couldn't reveal more than this. Not that he doesn't trust his family yet, but because he is not powerful enough. In addition, he cannot let it be known that there is a dragon lair, as this alone would cause a conflict that he wouldn't be able to control. Hans's mother is not about this revelation. She has always known that Hans is hiding something, but she couldn't believe that Hans is a mage. On the other hand, Regina is still not satisfied since she was the one who witnessed it firsthand. Hans then reminds Regina to keep his magic a secret, and Regina agrees to this. Regina asks if Asa and Lakia know about his magic, and he says yes. This only gets Regina madder, because she can't believe that Hans told his friends about his magic, but not his family. Unknown to them, Asa and Lakia are standing outside, and they are hearing everything. Owen then tells Hans that he is free to hide things from them, but urges him to be careful because his safety matters most. Hans assures his mother that he will never make her worry, and he thanks the two for also believing in him. After the meeting with his family, Hans reveals that his intention in this world is not to be the strongest or to enact revenge, but to change the world for the better. Hans then heads to the barn while thinking of his next step. He enters the barn, closes the door behind him, and teleports to the lyre to train as usual. Asa and Lakia see him entering the barn, but the two can only wonder what Hans is doing there. Lakia doesn't want to push things because he knows that Hans is not ready to tell them all his secrets yet. Asa and Lakia end up arguing with each other again, and while this goes on, Regina is reflecting on the event of the day. Her face turns red from blushing as she finds it difficult to get Crowell out of her head. Elsewhere, we see two fellows, Jeprion and Enable, in the Information Guild. Jeprion is playing with cards since there is nothing to do. Enable screams at Jeprion to find something to do, but Jeprion reminds his boss that they are the Information Guild, which means people are supposed to come to them for information. However, their guild has been abandoned by all the nobles because of a particular rumor that spread some time ago. Jeprion believes that it is time for them to close down the guild and give up. Just then, they hear a knock on the door. Jeprion runs over to open the door. Hans and Lakia are standing at the door like clueless rats. Since Hans claims that he lost his bird, Jeprion asks him what color the bird is, and Hans simply replies that it is blue. Jeprion then leads Lakia and Hans into the building. As they climb the stairs, Hans thinks to himself that the only thing he now lacks is information. He didn't put too much importance on this before, but after the situation at the banquet, Hans realizes that he needs to equip himself with the right info. All his past life memories are limited to Callista or the major events that happened in the Empire, thus reaching Callista. Aside from this, Hans is clueless. This is his reason for visiting the information guild recommended to him by Lakia. They get upstairs where they meet the guild master, Annabelle. Hans is about to introduce himself when Annabelle cuts in. It turns out that Annabelle knows who Hans is already. He tells Hans everything about him and what he did recently, leaving a shock on Hans's face. However, this is normal for her to know since she runs an information guild. However, she has no idea who Lakia is. She then spots the cat behind Hans. It turns out that Asa is also with the two, but he came in his cat form. Annabelle carries Asa, petting him and rubbing his fur. Apparently, Asa insisted that he would follow Hans and Lakia to the information guild, but promised to remain in his cat form. Now that Annabelle is rubbing his body, he has no choice but to let it slide since he already promised to behave. Hans also knows a little about Annabelle. She is the guild master and a capable leader who built the guild at a young age. Hans is grateful that Annabelle hasn't turned her attention to Lakia and Asa, which is why she has no information on them. Annabelle's guild was once one of the top guilds, but they touched someone's collection and got hurt really badly. The guild nearly went into extinction, and the other nobles stopped using the guild out of fear of that someone. That someone is Lord Angus, and he is making sure to isolate Annabelle's guild. Annabelle is impressed that Hans knows something about her and the guild. She admits that she might have underestimated the guy a bit. Annabelle finally decides to get serious. She packs her hair and walks to the table to talk to Hans. She asks him what information he wants. Hans admits that he knows nothing about the capital and what is going on inside it because he has lived in Callista all his life. Because of this, Hans is offering Annabelle and her guild an exclusive contract. Talking about an exclusive contract, Hans wants Annabelle to gather information on the major nobles and merchants in the capital. He also wants reports on incidents and trends that are worth knowing. In return for these, Hans is willing to pay per information piece and also fully fund the operations of Annabelle's guild, called the Lucen Guild. Annabelle takes the contract and reads it to understand. Since the guild is in a tight spot with bad rep, she has no choice but to accept the contract. On a regular day, information guilds avoid backing a useless or rural family, but since the Lucen Guild is struggling, they have no choice but to accept. Annabelle then decides to show them what she is capable of. She offers to tell Hans about the 3 most important families in the Empire. Hans is surprised to hear this because he only knows of 2, and these are the McCarthy and Townsend families. Annabelle concurs to this, saying the 2 families are the most famous, which is why they easily control the Emperor himself. However, there is a 3rd important family, and they are the Krauser family. They are a 400-year-old noble house, but no one knows what they do or where. The current head of the family, Marquis Chai von Krauser, has been in seclusion for over a decade. Some believe that he is in his 20s, while others say 50s. The funny aspect of the entire thing is that the other 2 important families are trying to get the Krausers on their side. However, Marquis Chai Krauser has since declared neutrality. Even Hans didn't hear about the Krausers in his past life, and with the way Hans sees it, Lakia is also clueless. Hans figures that the family remains hidden because they might not be causing major incidents in the Empire, nor tied to the power struggle in the capital. Hans is glad with the information Annabelle gave him, and he urges her to carry out more investigation into the Krauser family. Hans then pays Annabelle for the information given, leaving a bright smile on the lady's face. She is so excited that she starts screaming about the money and the fact that she and Jeprion can finally buy meat. She is so lost in excitement until Jeprion calls her back to reality, urging her to remain composed. When Hans and Lakia leave the guild, Lakia asks Hans why he wants to know more about the Krauser family. Hans then reveals that since the 2 dukes are looking out for the family, he also wants to see for himself. Lakia agrees with Hans, but he is worried about the dangers attached to the request. When the trio returns home, Alman welcomes them with a worried face. He tells Hans that there is a visitor waiting for him, and this is someone they never expected. Hans enters the house to find the Archmage, Ivan, waiting for him. Hans starts to sweat, thinking that he must be in trouble. He remembers using verbal magic in front of the Archmage, and he is worried that his identity is about to be revealed. Just then, Ivan hits Hans with a very shocking and unexpected request. Ivan begs Hans to make him his disciple, and this leaves Hans's mouth wide open. It starts to dawn on Hans that Ivan is truly asking him to be his teacher. Surprisingly, Ivan tells Hans to remove all formalities and address him with his regular name. Hans is taken aback by this, telling Ivan that he possibly cannot remove the formalities when they have not even gotten to know each other that well. Ivan maintains that he is a student, and his teacher is free to use whatever name he wants. Hans cannot believe that Ivan is already addressing him as his teacher, and he quickly tells Ivan that Ivan is older than him. In addition to that, Ivan is an archmage, so Hans doesn't see how he can possibly be a teacher to him. Hans mentions that there are manners and proper conduct in the way things are done. However, Ivan argues with Hans, telling him that his morals don't apply to magic. He claims that the world of magic is a place judged solely by skill, not the age of the mage or the rank, and even wealth. Ivan points out that it is the mage's dream to reach the top, and because of this, he wants Hans to be his teacher. Hans is completely overwhelmed by Ivan's arguments, leaving him stunned. Hans finally tells Ivan that his magic is not superior to his. Ivan doesn't believe this since he saw Hans cast a 6th circle magic mirage without incantations. Hans lies, telling Ivan that it was a 3rd circle invisibility magic. Ivan is not a fool, and he reminds Hans that he said mirage when he activated the magic. Hans maintains his lie, telling Ivan that he must have misheard him because there is no way he can cast a high-level spell. Ivan then asks Hans if he thinks the Emperor misheard him too. The moment Ivan mentions the Emperor, Lakia runs out from where he is standing. It dawns on Hans that he didn't tell Lakia that he met the Emperor. Ivan is pissed that a guard knight barged in on their conversation without permission, but Hans quickly steps in. Hans tells Ivan that Lakia is not just a simple guard knight, but a close friend of his. Hans knows that it sounds rude, but he begs Ivan to let Lakia stay and have the conversation with them. Ivan has no choice but to agree to Hans's terms. After Lakia is briefed on everything that happened, Hans is surprised to see that he was actually calm. Hans was expecting Lakia to be pissed because he attacked the Emperor even though it was just a mistake. It turns out that Lakia just wants to hear about the Emperor and how he is faring. Hans is more surprised that Ivan doesn't recognize Lakia. The magic that Hans used on Lakia was a 4th circle illusion spell, and since Ivan has reached the 5th circle, Hans expects him to see traces of magic on Lakia. However, this is not the case, even though Lakia is right there in his presence. Deep down, Ivan is actually wondering if he had met Lakia anywhere before. Hans decides to overlook it since it is his first time meeting a mage, so everything is still strange to him. Lakia then asks Ivan if he truly wants to be Hans' student, and he says yes. Lakia then decides to come in, telling Hans that it is a good proposal. Lakia tells Hans that helping Ivan basically means helping the Emperor at the same time. Lakia then says the Emperor will recognize Hans's talent one day, which will be of good fortune for them. Hans immediately figures out that Lakia is just trying to use him to get to the Emperor. Hans has no choice but to finally give in. He tells Ivan that he is ready to help, but he lets him know that it is only advisory, not an official master-disciple relationship. In addition, Hans begs Ivan not to expose his existence to other people. Ivan agrees to this and asks Hans if there are any more conditions that he wants to add. Hans then tells Ivan that he doesn't want him to use honorifics. Ivan has no choice but to accept the terms. At the same time, Hans is worried that he might not be able to permanently hide his identity from Ivan since he is also a top-level mage. However, Hans is starting to understand why Lakia told him to agree to the deal since it's going to be a good opportunity to build connections. Ivan is about to leave when he runs into Regina. Regina offers the proper greetings, and this is when it suddenly dawns on Ivan that he actually has something from the Emperor that he's supposed to give Regina. He has a letter from the Emperor, leaving Hans and his sister utterly shocked. Apparently, he came to deliver the letter, but ended up focusing on something else entirely. Regina is confused as to what to do, and she asks her brother if he will send the letter first. However, Hans refuses, reminding Regina that it is something that was specially written for her by the Emperor. He urges her to read the letter and also respond to it by herself. Regina then takes the letter and enters her room to read the contents. When Ivan returns to the castle, he tells the Emperor of his decision to start taking lessons from Hans. It was after telling the Emperor this that he finally remembered to give him the reply letter from Regina. The Emperor remembers Ivan insisting on delivering the letter to Regina even though he planned to send a servant. It finally dawns on the young ruler that Ivan had his own ulterior motive, which is why he wanted to see Hans. Apparently, in the details of the letter, the Emperor told Regina that he had to leave the banquet hall quickly the last time they met, which is why he was unable to properly say goodbye. The Emperor reveals that he intentionally came to the banquet because he had been hearing about the Callistas, and he wanted to see for himself. He wanted to know the kind of person who would open a bank for commoners. He admits that he was too focused on Hans that he didn't realize that Hans had a wise and upright sister. The Emperor confesses that he enjoyed the conversation he had with Regina when they met. Because of this, he wants them to become friends and start exchanging stories through letters. Regina was utterly flustered when she read the letter. Regina had to run to Ivan to give her some time to write a reply for the Emperor. Ivan told Regina that she is free to take her time because he would also be having a conversation with Hans. In her reply, Regina apologizes for how her brother attacked him. Regina also admits that she enjoyed the moment she had with the Emperor. She informs the Emperor that she would be willing to exchange emotions via letters, since this is what he wants. The Emperor is also blown away when he reads the reply from Regina. Regina has no issues doing this because she believes that the Emperor will eventually share his future with a noble princess from another country. At the same time, the Emperor is willing to live the life of a puppet, but he would not hesitate to exchange letters with Regina. Momentarily, the two started exchanging letters, and Hans soon noticed this. Although Hans was not the romantic type in his past life, he could clearly see that something was up between Regina and the Emperor. He wonders if he should allow the relationship to flourish or not. He tries looking through his memory to see what the Emperor was like, but there was nothing of use to him in there. He only remembers that the Emperor was married off to a suitable foreign princess who was chosen by the two ducal houses that control the empire. Hans decides not to mess with the two and allows them to live out their lives. Soon afterward, Callista Bank became the center of attention for everyone in the capital. The bank was more popular among the commoners, who started opening accounts as if it were nothing. Before they knew it, everyone already had accounts at the bank. Claude informs Hans that they have recorded significant progress, and because of this, he suggests that they end the lottery event after the next month. He mentions that when it comes to numbers, they are reaching Sullivan's bank already. Apparently, people from neighboring villages and towns come to the capital to register after hearing what Callista Bank does. Hans is surprised to learn that demand has started coming from outside the bank, too. Hans is thinking of opening new branches, but Claude says this might be difficult. Claude quickly apologizes for speaking out of turn, but Hans tells him to speak freely. Claude then explains that most of their customers are commoners. Because of this, the deposit amount is small compared to the number of customers. He reveals that as of the moment, the deposit customers and loan customers are almost in balance. Claude believes that opening new branches will only drain their reserves further. Hans grins when he hears Claude's explanation. Claude then asks him why he is laughing, and Hans lets him know that he is impressed that he knows his way around. Since they are looking for a way out, Hans tells Claude that it might be the right time for them to start the business idea that he proposed. Claude is surprised to hear this, and he tries telling Hans that the idea is still at the conceptual stage. He adds that the idea was scrapped because it had fatal flaws for actual implementation. Just then, Hans assures Claude that he has nothing to worry about because he is going to prepare supplementary measures. Not long after this, Callista Bank implemented the use of checks. At the Huffman Trading Company, the man hands his customer a check when he is about to receive payment for 30 gold coins. The merchant was shocked when he was handed a paper. The trader then explains that it is a check invented by Callista Bank. He assures him that if he goes to the bank and presents the paper to them, he will be given his 30 gold. The merchant believes that the paper is worth 30 gold coins, but the trader reveals that he actually deposited 30 gold coins in advance. Since carrying money around is heavy, he deposited it in the bank for his customer to pick up. The merchant doesn't trust the paper and insists that he will take regular money. The trader mentions that he no longer carries cash, but because the merchant is suspicious, the trader decides to take him to the bank so that they can collect the money together. The clerk attendant takes her time to check the check to confirm that it is the original. The merchant is then given his 30 gold, leaving him utterly shocked. Since it is common knowledge that gold coins are heavy and they also take up a lot of space, trading companies that handle substantial amounts of money put great effort into cash transport. To secure their money, they usually pay huge sums to mercenary guilds for escort services. Even with this, there have been reports of incidents where the transport is attacked and the cash is taken. However, the use of a check allows one to carry a huge amount of money without stress. This was Claude's idea, which is why the check was invented. He was confident that the idea would soon take over the entire kingdom. Later on, Sullivan learns from his assistant that the Huffman Trading Company has started dealing with Callista Bank. Sullivan is enraged when he hears this, since he was the one who helped Huffman Trading Company rise to one of the top 10 trading companies. The assistant mentions that people are frequenting Callista Bank since they need to physically collect their money after being issued a check. The assistant reveals that some customers end up conducting business. Not long after this, nobles, who were in doubt before, started using Callista Bank too. Sullivan cannot believe that Callista Bank, which started as a commoner's bank, is gaining influence because of a piece of paper. Sullivan takes one of the checks to assess it. He realizes that there is a serial number, signature, and amount on it. Sullivan concludes that there is nothing special about the check. He notices that the check is also made using high-quality fiber mixed with silk, which will prevent it from getting wet or torn. Sullivan sees this and immediately comes to the conclusion that his bank should be able to do the same. Sullivan then tells his assistant that they need to start making checks of their own. He doesn't care if it is identical or not. He just wants it done. He is confident that merchants would rush back to them since they were already used to the bank. It would be easy for them. The assistant is surprised to hear this, and he tries pointing out the fact that it is unethical. This makes Sullivan angrier. He reminds the dude that he was the one who started the banking business in the empire, and he doesn't see anything special about writing numbers on paper to start selling it. The assistant doesn't want his boss's fury to be passed to him, and he assures him that he will do as he commands. Sullivan also suspects that Callista Bank will try to open new branches very soon. Sullivan orders his assistant to plant a spy among the new employees who will be working at the Callista Bank branches. Sullivan wants everything reported to him, and the assistant assures him that it will be done. Sullivan cannot believe the amount of stress he is going through just to run a bank. Apparently, he has an interest in a noble, Bowen. On the other hand, Annabelle submits the report that Hans wanted from her. In the report, he picks out a specific name, which turns out to be Bowen. He asks Annabelle to explain in detail everything about Bowen. Annabelle is taken aback when she hears this. She concludes that Hans is no ordinary person. Hans told her to gather intel on all the nobles, and he basically went through all the hundreds of pages right on the spot. Hans even categorized them based on the priority levels. Annabelle doesn't want to believe the fact that Hans is just an 18-year-old kid. Annabelle then explains that Viscount Bowen has a unique hobby of collecting women's clothing. Apparently, Bowen doesn't take joy in womanizing or cross-dressing. He just enjoys collecting women's clothing. What even makes it more interesting is that Bowen travels around the empire to collect clothing. Because of this, he already has a very nice wardrobe filled with women's clothing. Annabelle then reveals that Bowen has been trying to open a salon for 3 years, but it is being delayed because Sullivan Bank repeatedly rejects his loan applications for salon establishment in the capital. Hans is surprised to hear this, and he asks Annabelle why Sullivan kept rejecting Bowen. Annabelle mentions that having a salon is lowly work for a noble. Hans then calls Poitier, and he hands him the report on Bowen. He tells him where to put the report, and this further impresses Annabelle. She realizes that Hans is putting the report in the investment priority slot. On the other hand, Hans has finally understood something since he became a full-fledged noble. Just like commoners who can't move forward because of their social status, nobles are also trapped within the framework of their status too. Later on, Hans asks Alman about the territory, and he assures him that everything is going fine. Alman mentions that Hans' knowledge has helped the territory to register more immigrants. In addition to this, the harvest for the year has reached an all-time high. Hans is happy to hear this, and he concludes that he can stop worrying about the territory in the meantime. Not long after this, Sullivan Bank also issued checks. The people started moving toward Sullivan checks rather than Callista's, since they had been dealing with the bank before Callista came into the fray. Some are not happy with the fact that they need to go all the way to the capital to visit Callista's main branch before getting their money. Poitier soon tells Damien the report about the decline in check market share, which is all thanks to Sullivan Bank. Surprisingly, Hans tells Poitier that they have nothing to worry about. He tells Poitier that it is natural for successful businesses to have latecomers. Hans is not worried since they have already achieved their original goal of expanding their customer base. In addition, he is not worried because the bank uses technology exclusive to them to make their checks distinctive. It turns out that Bowen also came to the bank to hold a meeting with Hans. His entrance was catchy as he held a flower bouquet to welcome Hans into the meeting room. Hans was taken aback when he saw the man. Initially, he thought Bowen was a pervert because of the report, but after meeting him, he realized that Bowen is just a dude who loves women's clothing and nothing more. Bowen mentions that he was surprised when he received the document from Callista Bank. He was scared that it might be a scam because he never thought he would receive an investment proposal, not a loan. Hans assures him that it is not a scam. He tells Bowen that he will operate the salon and he doesn't need to repay the investment money. However, the bank would receive a certain share of profits from the salon. Bowen started bawling when he heard this. He thanks Hans for the opportunity, revealing that everyone treated him like a crazy pervert when they saw his collection. Even when he mentioned salon, he was deemed a senseless person. Bowen never thought Hans would believe in him. Suddenly, he notices Poitier filling the flower vase with water. He tells him that there is no need for this since the flowers are all artificial. Bowen reveals that he doesn't like flowers withering away, which is why he hired an artisan who could maintain the flower's freshness as it is. Hans is blown away when he realizes that the beautiful flowers sitting in front of him are all artificial flowers. He admits that it is more impressive than the ordinary artificial flowers that he has seen in the past. Bowen then reveals that the process to make the flowers is so expensive. He mentions that a single flower costs 2 silver coins to make. When Poitier hears this, he moves over to his boss, telling him that he might want to reconsider his investment with Bowen. It is pretty obvious that he doesn't know the value of money. Poitier doesn't think there is anyone who would spend 2 silver coins on a flower when it is not a jewel. However, Hans disagrees with Poitier's suggestion since he knows what is going to happen in the future. Hans knows that in the future, high-quality artificial flowers will become very popular among the empire's noble women. They will need it as corsages to decorate hats, accessories, or 1 or 2 dresses. Even though they were very expensive, the demand couldn't keep up with the supply, which eventually made jewels secondary items to flowers. In fact, it was one of the things that destroyed Callista's finances in his previous life. Hans knows that the trend is still years in the future, but he believes that the investment will be worth it later. Hans then tells Bowen that he is definitely investing in his business. Later that day, Hans gives his sister the artificial flowers, leaving her totally blown. She is also impressed by the fragrance coming from the flower, leaving her to doubt if it is truly artificial. Asa, on the other hand, complains to Lakia, telling him that he is bored because Hans has been busy lately. Hans has been so busy that he hardly eats meals with Asa and Lakia like he did before. Suddenly, the two feel an immense magical power hit them from the shed. Asa mentions that the magical power is always overflowing from the shed every evening. The two decide to check it out. Hans steps out of the shed to run into the two, who are already waiting for him. Asa demands to know what Hans is always doing at the shed every night. Asa believes that Hans is hiding something from them. Lakia asks Hans if whatever he is doing is dangerous, but Hans finds it hard to answer the question. Lakia realizes this and decides to back down. He believes that Hans is not ready to tell them yet. Asa, on the other hand, will not take no for an answer. He reminds Hans that he was the one who insisted that they come clean with each other. Hans realizes that things are about to get complicated, so he decides to get on top before then. He tells the two that he was just about to call them. He takes them into the shed to show them the large golden magic circle inside. He tells them that he has been working on something whenever he was free, but he has finally completed it. Hans says he should have cast a stronger magical barrier to prevent the power from leaking out. Lakia and Asa are blown away by the tremendous power coming from the magic circle. Lakia and Asa are both curious, and Hans reveals that it is a warp gate. Lakia doesn't want to believe this, since warp gate is a 7th circle magic. Before magic became a thing of the past, there were rarely humans who could succeed in creating a warp gate. This makes Lakia question who Hans really is. Hans then confesses, telling them that he is the successor of Gold Dragon, Seyfried. This further leaves the two in a state of confusion. Hans knows that the two were already onto him, but they didn't decide to probe him out of respect for the fact that he saved their lives. Hans knows that he could continue hiding his identity, but he believes that telling the two is the bare minimum since they trust him with their lives. However, he can't tell them about the regression. Lakia finally realizes why Hans had to keep his identity hidden. Hans also had no choice but to come clean because he would be going to the territory more often, using the warp gate. He doesn't want them worrying anytime he disappears. Hans then suggests that they enter the magic circle so that they can all go together. Momentarily, they appear at the Callista castle, shocking Lakia and Asa. This was Hans's first time with a 7th circle magic, and it gave him a bit of a tough time stabilizing the coordinates. Lakia realizes that they are in the storage room, which Hans has prohibited people from entering. Lakia figures out that Hans has been preparing everything from the start. Hans says he was anxious about leaving the territory for too long. Lakia then asks him if he can only travel between the shed in the capital and the storage room in Callista Castle. Hans reveals that the warp gate is a magic that only allows for travel between fixed coordinates. Hans is happy to be back in the territory after months. He walks to the window only to see something disastrous happening outside the castle. Hans runs outside the castle to see that everything is totally flooded. The butler, William, is shocked to see Hans since he is supposed to be in the capital. Hans basically tells him to forget about him in the meantime, since they have a huge problem on their hands. He asks for an explanation, and William reveals that the territory is suffering from flooding. Apparently, it has been raining for over a week, and the river finally overflowed at dawn. William and the other officials have been evacuating the citizens from the lowlands. William doesn't know about the warp gate and assumes that they came to the town by road. He asks Hans if he is fine, but Hans is already lost in thought. It dawns on Hans that every year around this same time, it used to rain for several weeks in the territory. However, the river had never overflowed to cause flooding before. He starts racking his brain because he definitely would remember if something like this happened in his past life. William then mentions that the damage to the Western Plains is very severe. Hans starts putting everything together. House Callista wasn't a wealthy house, despite having one of the Empire's notable territories. This is simply because the East was mostly occupied by high, barren mountains, while the West is occupied by marshlands. It is basically a dead land where people couldn't live and crops couldn't grow. To combat this, Hans devoted himself to land reclamation projects along with territorial development for the past 3 years. They dug waterways through the marshes and mixed in sand to make the soil fertile. This, in turn, helped them grow several crops, and better than before. With the new fertile land, news soon spread across, causing people to start migrating into the land. This was why he learned from his butler that things in the territory are going well. There was also a high yield of crops in the land as a result of this. Hans had thought he didn't have to worry about Callista, but coming back to this has messed up everything he thought he knew. He then learns that the river overflowed toward the reclaimed land, and most of it is already submerged. However, it is mostly farmland rather than residential areas. Hans asks if all the residents have been rescued, and he learns that most of them escaped that very morning. However, the knights are still checking to make sure that no one is left. Just then, Hans says everything is his fault. He mentions that Callista's marshes were there to absorb rainwater during the rainy season. However, during the reclamation project, they had the marshes filled. Asa is confused as he asks Hans how a natural disaster is his fault. Lakia supports Asa, saying it's been 3 years since the reclamation project, which means it shouldn't cause a problem again. Hans, on the other hand, doesn't agree with them. He believed that because of his knowledge of the future, he could control everything. He was expecting better results by fixing shortcomings, but at this point, he is already believing that it is the opposite. He wonders if his actions to try to change the future are creating irreversible consequences. Hans is totally lost in his thoughts until Lakia screams at him, telling him to snap out of it. Lakia reminds him that he is the lord of the territory, and he needs to find a way to handle the situation, not to start blaming himself. Lakia grabbing him and shouting at him is enough to get Hans back to his senses. He asks the butler about the servants, and he reveals that he ordered them to move materials from the underground storage to the ground level. Hans tells him to change the servants' orders. Everyone is to come together to evacuate all of the citizens and make sure that they are safe. He tells Lakia to join the Night Order to help with disaster relief. Hans admits that Lakia is right, and what he needs to do first is save Callista. Momentarily, Hans learned that there is no casualty so far, and all the citizens are being evacuated. Hans orders that the citizens living near the riverside embankment should be evacuated too, because the ground might have softened. Just then, one of the knights comes riding to them in haste. He tells them that something terrible has happened. Apparently, the bridge downstream has collapsed. They all rush over there to see that the bridge has totally collapsed in the middle. Hans is worried because there are about 20 households living beyond the bridge. He asks for the details of the damage, and if there are still people trapped on the other side. The knight tells Hans that it is hard to confirm the details because by the time they discovered the bridge, it was already in its current bad state. Suddenly, they spot a woman at the other side of the bridge. She reveals that there is a critically ill patient in the village. She begs Hans to save them because they can't cross the river. Hans asks the knights if there is a detour route upstream. The knight confirms this, but lets Hans know that it is completely flooded, which makes it even more dangerous. Hans gets off his horse, picks up a stone, and casts a flying spell on it to confirm something. The stone flies off, and with this, Hans confirms that the flying spell is a levitation magic that is greatly affected by wind. He knows that with this, simple deception won't trick everyone watching him. Hans then calls Lakia, telling him to keep the knights quiet about what he is about to do. Lakia is also curious, but he assures Hans that he has his back. Hans then walks toward the broken bridge, while his subjects are telling him to be careful. However, Hans is not ready to look away because he is the successor of the golden dragon, Seyfried. Hans then casts a kinesis spell, leaving everyone shocked. The rubble starts to move into place, but Hans is not yet done. He started using multiple castings, leaving the people even more confused. With a golden aura emanating from his body, Hans stacks up the castings and finishes it off with a 6th circle hardening magic. Once he is done, the broken bridge is fixed up. Lakia cannot believe his eyes when he sees this. Hans then tells Lakia and the other knights that they can now proceed to evacuate residents because the bridge is safe to use. Lakia acknowledges the order, but Hans is pretty sure that everyone who just witnessed him use magic will have their questions. Hans considers his actions to be reckless, but Lakia takes up the mantle and he screams at the rest of the knights. He tells them to forget about what they just saw and focus on rescuing lives first. He then tells them to assemble after the situation has been resolved because he has an announcement for them. After the bridge was restored, it made the rescue of the residents easier. The residents start thanking Hans for coming to save them. Hans is surprised that there were actually more injured people than he expected. He is thankful that the rescue was swift because things would have been disastrous if there had been a delay. One of the servants walked up to Hans, asking him how he was able to get to the village quickly, even though he had heard that the bridge had collapsed. Hans is taken aback by the question as he doesn't know how to lie or answer. Thankfully, the lady who was rescued came in for the rescue. She lies that the bridge didn't collapse and all she saw was just debris. Another person supports her claim to make sure that it is convincing. The servant still insists that he saw the bridge collapse, but everyone soon turns to him, telling him that he must have been seeing things because the bridge is perfectly okay. An elderly woman walks up to Hans, thanking him for coming to save them. Because the village was home to mostly outsiders, they thought that they would be left to die. But Hans surprised them. Hans is proud of himself when he hears this. Once the flood-related activities are complete, Lakia gathers the knights who were present at the bridge. The lady who witnessed the whole thing is also with them. Lakia tells them that there is something he needs to announce before they all separate. It is no news to them that the lord of the territory is a mage. Lakia knows that they are going to have several questions running through their heads. He then asks them what they would do if they were high-ranking nobles. Lakia mentions that Hans is a young lord who obtained the count's title at just 15. In addition to this, he uses magic, which is among the strongest on the continent. However, Hans doesn't have the means to protect himself aside from the use of magic. Lakia then points out that other nobles would use the opportunity to grab Hans's power if they found out. This strikes the knights, and they finally understand where Lakia is coming from. Lakia opens their eyes to why they need to keep Hans's identity and power a secret. With a thunderous echo, the knights acknowledge the order. Lakia then apologizes to the lady for getting dragged into the whole thing. However, the lady lets him know that she has no issues with this. She reveals that she doesn't know much about magic, but what she saw from Hans is simply an amazing power. She is grateful that Hans risked his secret to save them, and she assures Lakia that it is the bare minimum to keep Hans's power a secret. Lakia heaves a sigh of relief when he realizes that everyone is on board with his plan. Lakia then heads to Hans's office, only to find him working again. Hans reveals that he is reviewing the data on the Western Reclamation Project. Lakia cannot believe that Hans is still on the fact that he is to blame for the flood. With the map sitting in front of him, Hans confirms that the entire western part of Callista is lower ground compared to the eastern area. This is why rainwater from the Compton Mountains flows into the western plains, forming marshes when it rains heavily. Hans believes that pursuing the reclamation project was an ignorant move on his part. Hans starts thinking of building a dam upstream to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. He plans to contact civil engineering experts once it's dawn. Lakia realizes that Hans is deeply troubled, and he lets him know that taking care of the territory is good, but he urges him not to make everything his responsibility. Lakia tells Hans that he should learn to use those around him. Hans thanks him for the advice, but he lets him know that he can't rely on him since he will be leaving in 2 years. This is when it dawns on Lakia that Hans actually told him that his name would be cleared in 5 years. Lakia has basically been staying in Callista because of that. Hans then says that he has been feeling sorry for him. He doesn't like the idea that he is putting so much responsibility on him, like making him the knight commander, even though he is hiding in the town until his name is cleared. As compensation, Hans has something for Lakia. He brings out a beautiful sword and presents it to Lakia. Hans reveals that he has been bothered by Lakia carrying around an old sword. He actually planned to give him the sword after he revealed his power to him, but everything just turned out the way they are. Lakia appreciates the gesture from Hans, but he reminds him that guard knights usually carry ordinary weapons. This is when Hans reveals that the blade is made from dragon bone. Lakia is utterly blown away when he hears this. Hans says the sword is an alloy called oliphant, which is made by mixing dragon bone with mithril. It is basically the only material that can withstand a swordmaster's aura. However, only dragons who own it can refine it. Hans reveals that he got the material from the dragon's lair and he deemed it worthy for Lakia to have. Lakia grabs Hans, asking him if he is truly an idiot or not. He lets him know that there are things that should be given as presents and there are things that should not. Lakia says dragon armaments are very expensive, but Hans lets him know that he is aware of everything that he is pointing out. Lakia then asks Hans if he can rely on Asa too. Hans reminds Lakia that cat people don't live in human society. Hans believes that Asa is just staying in the territory in the meantime and would eventually return to his people. When Hans says this, Lakia finally understands the kind of person Hans is. Lakia can see that Hans believes that they are going to leave his side at some point. Even with this, he is still revealing his greatest secrets and weaknesses to them. In addition to this, he is casually handing over rare materials to them. Just then, a servant enters the room, telling Hans that there is a certain person who has arrived at the castle, and the person is confronting Asa. Hans and Lakia rush to the scene to see Asa in a standoff with a strange-looking dude. It turns out that Asa knows the dude, and his name is Ryuji. Asa screams at Hans and Lakia, telling them to stay back. Suddenly, Ryuji goes down on his knees to bow to Asa, and he regards him as his lord. This leaves Hans and Lakia totally stunned and confused. Momentarily, they enter the castle, and Hans apologizes to Ryuji for his knights treating him rudely since he is Asa's guest. Apparently, Ryuji is a warrior of the cat people. Ryuji thanks Hans for providing shelter for Asa. However, he lets them know that Asa cannot stay among humans since he is a cat person. Because of this, he plans to escort Asa back to their territory. Just as he finishes saying this, Hans doesn't look surprised since he was already expecting a day like this to come. Just then, Asa refuses, telling Ryuji that he has no intentions of going back. Ryuji tries to remind Asa of what humans are capable of. Even with this, Asa maintains his stance, telling Ruji that he doesn't want to go back because the person he is running from might still be there. Hans understands Ryuji's concern, but he lets him know that Asa is his precious friend. Hans then tells Ryuji that he is ready to allow Asa to stay in the territory as long as he wants to. Asa quickly jumps behind Hans to support his claim that he is not going back. Asa lets Ryuji know that Hans is a good friend and he should not doubt him. Ryuji tells Asa that everyone back home will be worried and waiting for him. Asa lets Ryuji know that he can't fall for this because the people have not really shown interest in him. Lakia, on the other hand, starts to wonder what sort of position Asa holds among his people. Ryuji realizes that Asa won't change his mind, and he lets him know that he will be staying back in the territory too. Hans is surprised to hear this, but he has no choice but to accept since Ryuji is Asa's companion. With this, Ryuji joins the circus. By midday, the flood had already subsided, and Hans was still confused about how he was going to explain everything. He is supposed to be in the capital, but he suddenly appeared in the territory to rebuild a bridge with magic. He is in the middle of this when Lakia shows up, asking him if he is going back to the capital. Hans says yes, but he is worried that he has not been able to explain the situation. The servant in the room quickly excuses herself, and it dawns on Hans that Lakia has sorted out what he was worried about. With this, Hans and his entourage return to the capital using the warp gate. As expected, Ryuji was totally blown away since it was his first time. However, Hans's worries were not yet over as he was met with another scrutiny from his sister who had been looking for him. She was so worried that she had already reported to the guards that Hans was missing. Hans's plan was just to test the warp gate and return. But since he met something else entirely at the territory, he couldn't keep quiet about it. Hans is forced to tell his sister and mother that a flood occurred in their territory. He lets them know that he went over there to find out that there was a flood, but there were no casualties. After explaining everything, Regina presses him as usual, trying to figure out how he went to Callista and came back in less than a day. However, Hans's mother comes to the rescue again, telling Regina to leave Hans alone because he would definitely tell them his secret when he is comfortable about it. Regina leaves a sarcastic comment, telling Hans to give her regards to the servants when he goes back to their territory. On the other hand, Asa is worried about Ryuji. He asks him if he is okay with wandering around the way he is, and Ryuji assures him that he is perfectly fine since he has been searching for Asa for a long time. Just then, Lakia shows up, telling Asa that he would like to talk to him for a moment. Asa urges Lakia to go ahead with whatever he wants to say, but Lakia demands that they speak in private. Since they want some privacy, Ryuji excuses himself from the room. Instead of taking the door, Ryuji basically leaps out of the window like a typical cat. Lakia is left stunned when he sees this until Asa calls back his attention, asking him what it is that he wants. Lakia then reveals that he has been trying his best not to get involved in Asa's business. However, he wants to know if Asa has committed a crime, and he is on the run because of this. Lakia is worried since this will put Hans in danger, and he doesn't want that. Lakia demands to know if Asa's presence in the household will pose any danger to Hans. Asa then replies, telling Lakia that he has not committed a crime, but he is going through some really personal issues. Lakia remains mute for some minutes, waiting for Asa to say something about what he is going through. He remembers what Hans told him about Asa going back to his place at some point. Once Lakia realizes that Asa is not about to speak his mind, Lakia tells him that he won't interfere in his problems again. As Lakia is about to leave, Asa asks him about his new sword. Lakia reveals that it was given to him by Hans, but he has intentions of returning it because he considers it to be way above his level. The moment Lakia says this, Hans's whole head and mind are already pointed toward the sword. Asa tells Lakia that he would ask for the sword instead. Lakia argues with him, telling him that he can't. Asa is confused because he obviously likes the sword. Lakia mentions that it is dragon armament, which has not yet been revealed to the world. Asa then points out the fact that Lakia has intentions of returning it, which is why he might be entitled to have it. He reminds Lakia that the owner of the sword depends on whoever Hans picks. Lakia realizes that Asa is actually making a point, and since he knows how Hans thinks, he would probably give the sword to Asa immediately he returns it to him. Because of this, Lakia tells Asa that he is no longer returning the sword, but will be keeping it to himself. It soon turns into an argument between the two, and those outside can clearly hear them. Later on, Regina and Hans head to the Imperial Castle after getting a special invitation from the Emperor, Carter. Apparently, after the flood incident, Lakia told Hans that he would like to focus on his personal training with his new sword. Asa is also busy with Ryuji since he has so much to discuss with him. Hans considers this a good opportunity to return to the Dragon Lair and continue his magic training. He was thinking about this when Regina ran into the room to tell him about the letter she had just received from the Imperial Majesty. Panting from excitement, she tells her brother that Carter has invited them to dinner the next day. This is why the two put on their lovely outfit and headed to the Imperial Palace. Carter welcomes them warmly, admitting that their last encounter was a brief one. They all sit at the table, and Carter reveals that he has been looking forward to meeting them again. Hans is shocked to see that the only attendees of the dinner are he and his sister. In addition to this, Ivan, the closest person to Carter, is also present. Hans is surprised that the Emperor is holding a private meeting with him because in his past life, the Emperor found it hard to socialize. Hans also notices that Carter has a different look than when he first met him. Momentarily, they are served nice dishes by the chef, leaving Regina blown away. The Emperor is forced to ask if there is something wrong with the food. Regina quickly assures the Emperor that nothing is wrong. Hans gets a taste of the soup and admits that it is very delicious. The soup is salty, but it is very good. The Emperor then reveals that it is a soup with clams and shrimps. Apparently, the Emperor himself likes the dish, and he is pleased that they also do. Ivan then reveals that the dish is not served regularly, and this basically means that the Emperor holds Hans in high regard. The Emperor then asks his guests if they usually enjoy seafood. Regina replies that she doesn't get the chance to eat seafood, and Hans backs this up. He mentions that Callista is a landlocked area, which makes seafood pretty scarce for them. The Emperor then reveals that it is the same with the capital. Since the seafood easily spoils during transportation, it is usually very expensive. Even with this, there are certain times when the seafood is totally unavailable. Carter says the food is exclusive to nobles, but he would have loved it if commoners could also have a taste of it. When Hans hears this, he confirms his suspicion that Carter is not like the other nobles in the Empire. During the course of the meeting, more food is brought to them. Regina and Hans thank the Emperor for giving them the chance to taste something really out of the ordinary. Hans soon realizes that the meeting is coming to an end, but he wonders if it is truly a gathering of friendship. Just then, Carter turns to his right where Hans is sitting and he asks if he would like to chat more. Hans quickly says yes, but Carter corrects himself, telling Hans that he wasn't referring to him. It turns out that the Emperor was talking to Regina. The moment Ivan realizes what the Emperor wants to do, he uses the opportunity to also grab Hans. He drags Hans out of the room, telling him that he has a lot to discuss with him. Ivan then takes Hans to the research institute where magic is being studied. Hans is stunned to see that in an era where magic is almost gone, the status of the Imperial mages still remains important. They are free to practice and research magic all they want. Ivan then tells Hans to follow him to his laboratory. Hans is surprised to see that the dude has a personal laboratory. Ivan then reveals that he is not the only one with a private laboratory. Apparently, all mages affiliated with the Imperial Court are assigned personal laboratories. The two are having their conversation when a dude in glasses runs into Hans. Hans tries to be cool with the dude, but the dude just insults him for blocking the way. Hans is shocked, but Ivan urges him not to take offense. Ivan tells Hans that the mages believe that their research is the most important thing in the world. After saying this, Ivan asks Hans what he thinks about the institute. There is no rank, wealth, or power in the institute. Ivan tells him that there is also no need to worry about nobles' petty struggles or annoying political situations. Ivan continues to sweet-talk the institute, telling Hans that it is a place where everyone loves magic and they devote their entire lives to researching it. Ivan lets Hans know that the institute is the best place a mage can be. Hans finally understands what Ivan is doing. He asks him if he wants him to study magic at the institute, and Ivan says yes. Ivan assures Hans that he can confidently hide his identity. Hans finally confirms that Ivan intentionally brought him to the institute to try to recruit him. However, Hans declines the offer. Hans admits that the offer is quite tempting because he gets to meet other mages, which would make things more interesting. However, there is a big problem attached to this. The source of their magic is different. Draconic magic is entirely different from human magic. Draconic magic originates from the heart, and it activates with a single command, unlike human magic, which needs incantation. Hans is fully aware that he knows nothing about human magic because he started with draconic magic. Because of this, he concludes that he would be basically useless at the academy. Just then, Hans notices a magic circle on the board, and Ivan reveals that it is a fire burst magic that he is currently researching. Ivan says it is basically an improved version that enhances the first circle fireball into fifth circle attack magic. However, it is not completed yet. Ivan reminds Hans that he is fully focused on defensive magic because of the Emperor, which makes him weak when it comes to offensive magic. After staring at the magic circle, Hans asks Ivan if he is permitted to try to fix it. Apparently, mages take pride in creating new magic because it is a big feat. It is basically a once-in-a-lifetime achievement and proof that they have reached the highest point of their field. Because of this, they make sure not to leak the development of a new magic to other mages. Since this is the norm, Hans is surprised that Ivan is allowing him to make changes to the magic circle that he is currently developing. After some minutes of looking at the formula, Hans tells Ivan where the problem is, and he fixes it. Ivan is totally blown away, and he is forced to hug Hans, declaring that he is a genius. Ivan confesses that he has been trying to fix the formula for months without progress, but Hans did it in just minutes. Hans tries to be modest, telling Ivan that he only tweaked an existing formula. Ivan lets Hans know that he is a genius because he has mastered the ancient runic language. Hans is shocked at the mention of runic language. Ivan reveals that the formulas used in the magic design are symbolized in ancient runic language, and being able to grasp the operating principles just by looking at the formula makes Hans a runic genius. It finally dawns on Hans why he was able to understand human magic formulas, even though it was his first time seeing them. Basically, ancient runic language is draconic magic expressed in linguistic form. Human magic is then reconstructed into said formulas. To put it simply, draconic magic is the foundation for human magic. Hans finally realizes that he can research both sides since they operate on the same principle. Hans is blown away by this realization. However, he calls himself back to the real situation of things, apologizing to Ivan for touching his magic formula. On the other hand, Ivan is not angry because he already sees Hans as his master, even though he declined the offer. Ivan lets Hans know that he doesn't need to worry about formalities because learning from him is the greatest honor he can get. Hans is impressed that Ivan has no pride like the other mages. All he wants is to research magic and nothing more. Just then, Ivan's disciples enter the room, and they are blown away when they realize that he has completed the magic circle on the board. Ivan is not entirely thrilled since he wasn't the one who completed the magic formula. Ivan then introduces his disciples to Hans. Ivan lets his disciples know that Hans came to visit the Emperor, and he is only giving him a tour of the institute. It turns out that the dude who ran into Hans earlier is also a disciple, and he questions his master's decision to bring a nobody into his personal laboratory. One of the other disciples was trying to tell the dude to forget about that and celebrate the fact that their master completed the magic circle. This only fires up the dude, who suggests that they chase out the outsider. He is pissed that a non-magic user is being exposed to their precious formula. With everything he is saying, he is getting on Ivan's nerves, but he can't say anything since he is trying to protect Hans's identity. Ivan tries to remind his disciples that he was the one who brought Hans to the room, which means they are supposed to show some level of courtesy. He adds that Hans is also the Emperor's guest, and this alone deserves some respect. Ivan cannot basically tell them that the person standing in front of them is a high-level mage. The rude disciple then reminds Ivan that he is the one who usually tells them not to mind ranks or etiquette. Before the whole situation escalates, Hans tells Ivan that they should leave. After leaving the laboratory, Ivan apologizes for what went down in the room. He says he has spoiled his disciples so much, which is why they acted the way they did. Hans assures Ivan that he is not angry. He knows that Ivan was just doing his best to keep his identity hidden. Hans also mentions that he likes the fact that Ivan is close to his disciples. Ivan reveals that their skills are very solid, but they lack manners. He is pretty sure that they would have fainted from shock if they got to see Hans in action. With what Hans saw in the laboratory, he can easily figure out that the three disciples are talented. Given the fact that Ivan is an archmage, he is going to be picky with whoever he chooses as his disciple. Hans is confident that the three disciples will end up becoming the Empire's archmages in the future. Hans thinks to himself that it would have been nice if he could ask for their help concerning the plan he has. The two return to the waiting room to find Carter and Regina having a very lovely time with each other. The two are very comfortable talking to each other as they both smile. Hans is shocked to see this, and he starts to wonder when Regina and the Emperor got so close. Hans knew that they were exchanging letters, but he never knew that they had gotten very close. Ivan stares at Hans, laughing at him. He never knew that Hans was pretty dense when it came to romance. After they have all had a good time together, Hans and Regina jump into their carriage and start going back to their place. Suddenly, Regina asks Hans if men like quiet and graceful people. The moment Hans hears this, he automatically realizes that he is about to give relationship advice. Since he has no experience with this, he starts to stutter. He finally asks Regina if she thinks the Emperor will dislike her. Regina finds it hard to answer the question, and this is when Hans figures out that Regina is basically in love with the Emperor. Regina admits that she is in love, but she certainly has no interest in becoming the Empress. She just likes meeting Carter and having discussions with him. Hans knows where this is going, and he assures Regina that he will always be on her side, no matter what she chooses. He tells her that she is free to do whatever she wants without thinking about what others think. Apparently, Ivan had advised Hans to let Regina be, and not try to control her because this would only create a burning sensation inside her. Soon afterward, cases of check counterfeiting start to arise in Sullivan Bank. The head of the Huffman Trading Company is shocked when he tries to cash his check. but they told him that they have already paid out the money on the check. He initially thought the cashier was messing with him since the check was worth at least 50 gold coins. It soon turns into a heated argument that catches the attention of the other customers in the bank. Apparently, the dude was the first to switch from Callista Bank to Sullivan Bank when he heard that they had started issuing checks. Dominic Sullivan also hears about the rising cases of check counterfeiting, leaving him totally worried. His assistant tells him that the issue is happening all across their branches. His assistant tells him that the checks look so real that they resemble the real thing. It is so bad that even the bank employees cannot tell the difference between the original and the counterfeit. Because of this, they can't put a number to the amount of counterfeits in the market. Sullivan then tells his assistant to recall all the checks within the space of 2 weeks. He says he wants only the person who issued the check to be the one to be able to withdraw it at the issuing branch. Then after 2 weeks, all check withdrawals should be stopped. The assistant is shocked to hear this as he tries to tell Sullivan that 2 weeks is too small because there will be customers who can't exchange their checks in time. The assistant predicts that it might even take months, but Sullivan tells him that he should contact only major customers because he doesn't care about the commoners. Just then, another assistant enters the room to tell Sullivan that check withdrawal customers are flooding the main branch. Apparently, the customers no longer trust the integrity of the bank, and they are all trying to get their money. Sullivan initially thinks it's a good idea since he was planning on recalling the checks, but it soon dawns on him that the problem is that they don't trust his bank again. The nobles and major trading companies are withdrawing their deposits in large amounts, and at the rate at which things are going, it will end in a bank run. A bank run is basically a phenomenon where deposit withdrawals flood a bank in a short period of time. Sullivan is utterly defeated when he realizes this, and he asks his assistant how Callista Bank is handling the whole issue about counterfeiting. His assistant lets him know that Callista Bank is handling it pretty well because they were able to catch counterfeiters the moment they entered the bank. It turns out that the bank has a special device that they use to confirm the authenticity of the checks. Hans shows Annabelle the device and lets her know that the moment they introduce checks at the bank, they place the device at every window. They also trained their staff to only pay the money after the check passes inspection. Thanks to the device, they are able to discover counterfeits no matter how well forged they are. Annabelle realizes that Hans was already expecting counterfeiting from the very beginning. Hans confirms this, saying no matter how complex they make a piece of paper look, bad people who are determined will find a loophole around it. This was why he made sure to prepare a solution just in case. Annabelle then tells him that the most expensive item in the information market is data about the counterfeit detector. From the official information guilds to the back alley guilds, everyone is trying to get their hands on the data. The most desperate of them is the Sullivan Bank. They are offering to buy even the tiniest bit of information about the device, but no one has a clue how it works. Hans understands why they can't get the hang of it because the device looks like an ordinary lamp. However, the device is a magical tool that has magic stones inside it. Hans carved magic that responds only to specific wavelengths into each piece of check paper. After this, he designed the detection device with magic stones so that even non-mages can use it. When he was initially preparing it, he thought he was being paranoid, but looking back at it, he's glad that he actually did. Hans lets Annabelle know that the device was made with the bank's special technology, so even if she sells the information about it, there is no one who would be able to replicate it. Annabelle is hurt by Hans's words, even though it is a joke. Annabelle assures Hans that she would never sell information about Hans or his institutions, even if she were offered billions. This is because she sees Hans as her benefactor. He was the one who saved her guild from bankruptcy. Thanks to this, the guild keeps getting tons of requests. Hans is also happy to be doing business with the guild because when he wanted to open new branches, it was Annabelle's guild that warned him that spies would be planted among the new employees. Hans cannot believe that Sullivan is such a disgusting soul who would do anything and everything to bring down someone. Annabelle reveals that Sullivan is able to do as he likes because he has the backing of House McCarthy. House McCarthy is one of the two powerhouses that run the empire alongside House Townsend. Hans then asks Annabelle if she has any information on Marquis Krauser, but Annabelle says she has nothing. Annabelle says the information practically doesn't exist, which is why she can't get it. Hans knows that McCarthy will soon get wind of Callista's progress, and they are definitely going to interfere in his business. To prepare for this, Hans wants to make an alliance with the Marquis's house. However, Hans decides to put aside what he can't control in the meantime. Hans then asks Annabelle if she knows any trading companies in Somerville. Annabelle says yes, because Jeprian's hometown is Somerville. Hans then asks her if there are any trading companies that specialize in seafood distribution. Annabelle doesn't have an answer to this, and she tells Hans that she would have to look into it. Nonetheless, she is confident that there will be a few. Somerville is basically the Empire's largest coastal region, and it is famous for seafood cuisine. Hans is happy to hear this, and he informs Annabelle of his plan to open a seafood restaurant. which he would operate directly from the capital. Annabelle is taken aback when she hears this, and she tries to let Hans know that seafood is quite expensive. She tries to point out the transportation issue, but Hans assures her that he will find a solution to the transportation issue. He then gives Annabelle's guild 2 tasks: the distribution of reliable food, and to find out what recipes suit the people of the capital. Annabelle is totally stunned, but she recognizes the honor, and she smiles. Hans is surprised that Annabelle is willing to start the project without even hearing the details. Annabelle then tells Hans that she has learned one thing while working with him. This is the fact that questioning him is baseless because whatever Hans puts his mind to, he always makes sure that he succeeds in it. Hans takes the compliment and he smiles, while telling Annabelle that he will be waiting for her contract. Because of the issue with Sullivan Bank, Callista Bank is able to garner more customers to its side. When Hans told his subordinates about his plan to open the seafood restaurant, they all took it well, with Lakia offering to go to Somerville so that he could study recipes there. Hans is glad that everything is working out well, and he believes that it is time he returns to his territory. Hans soon informs his sister and mother about his plan to return to their territory. Regina is shocked to hear this, and Hans explains that the business is already stable. In addition, he doesn't think it's a good idea to leave the territory for too long. His mother agrees with him and says she will have to say farewell to her new friends. Regina, on the other hand, thinks of going shopping before they leave the capital. This is when Hans reveals his plan to leave the two in the capital. His mother is surprised to hear this. Hans mentions that his mother has not been able to socialize because she has been ill for the past couple of years. She recently came to the capital, and she has been making friends. His mother agrees to this as she blushes really hard. Regina adds to this, saying their mother is always getting invites to attend social events. Everyone is always looking forward to seeing her at their events nowadays. Hans then turns to Regina, telling her that it would be easier for her to stay in the capital since she plans to study more. In addition to this, it would make communicating with her certain pen partner much easier. Their mother immediately figures out that something is up, and she asks Regina if her pen pal is a man. Owen is proud of Regina, and she lets her know that she is already at the age where she needs to start looking for marriage prospects. Hans obviously cannot tell his mother that the man in question is the Emperor. Regina then asks Hans if he will be fine to stay all on his own in their territory. Hans assures Regina that he is going to be comfortable since he will be at home. Owen, on the other hand, is not worried because she knows that Hans has Lakia and Asa with him. Shortly afterward, Hans and his friends prepare to return to Callista. Asa reveals his joy that they are finally going back because he enjoys staying in Callista rather than the capital. Hans knows that Lakia will also be relieved because he was not free to leave the house for fear that there might be someone who might recognize him in the capital. Surprisingly, Ruji is riding with them, but he is sitting with the driver. Apparently, he doesn't like cramped spaces, which is why he preferred to stay outside. Inside the carriage, Asa and Lakia are already disturbing each other. Asa complains about the carriage, asking if they can't use the warp gate. Hans urges him to manage the carriage because they can't return using the warp since it is an official trip. Soon afterward, they arrive at Callista's residence, and Lakia wakes Hans. He tells him that something is wrong, and when Hans looks outside, he is surprised to find a bunch of people. Just then, William shows up, telling Hans that he personally came to welcome him back to the territory. William advises Hans to get off the carriage because it would be faster if he walked. Hans then asks William why there are so many people at the entrance of the territory. William reveals that they are all immigrants, trying to settle in the territory. There is a long queue because of identity verification. Hans is surprised to hear this since he thought there would be fewer people coming into town after the flooding incident. William lets him know that it is the direct opposite. After the flood incident, word spread around that Hans compensated the flood victims. This made news about Callista's travel far and wide, with reports of it being a good place to stay. Because of this, people start moving in with their entire family. Hans is blown away by this, and he has no choice but to walk into Callista on foot. Surprisingly, the citizens are all waiting to welcome him back. Hans is forced to ask William if he is the one who called everyone to welcome him, but he says no. It turns out that people were already waiting for his return, and the news of his return soon spread through the entire region. William also tells Hans that he has formulated a story for the people about how he came during the flood, so he has nothing to worry about. Hans takes a flower from a kid, and after taking a sniff, he realizes that he is truly back home. Hans gets to the castle to see that everyone is lined up to welcome him. The servants ask him if they should prepare food for him, or if he will rest first. Instead of these two things, Hans tells them that he would prefer to check out the administrative logs. He is already back to work, and the servants are not surprised by this since they already know the type of person he is. William then gathers all the reports. The first thing he shows him is the report on the Compton Mountain situation. He tells Hans that mining preparations have entered the final stage and work can begin the following month. Hans is glad to hear this. Hans intentionally made silent preparations to mine the iron ore because he knew that the two ducal houses would want to interfere, even though the ore legally belonged to Callista. William then adds that he was able to find the blacksmith that he told him to find. The blacksmith is a dude named Grunberg, but William is worried because Grunberg is not displaying the type of talent Hans claimed he would. William adds that the dude was quite confused and puzzled by the role that Hans planned to give him. Hans is not worried when he hears this, since he knows that Grunberg is not going to realize his full potential until later. In his past life, Grunberg became a renowned blacksmith whom everybody wanted, and he eventually left Callista. Hans understands why William is doubting his talent, but he tells him to put him in charge of managing the mine and the new smithy. After this, William shows Hans the blueprint of the magic academy that he wanted. It is so enormous that William starts to wonder if Hans wants to truly move ahead with the plan. Hans lets William know that the entire project is a promise to his teacher and benefactor. After hours of checking through everything, Hans finally finishes up. Lakia questions Hans's decision to stress himself on the first day of returning to the territory, but this is just who he is. Hans is surprised that Asa and Lakia were both waiting for him to finish instead of leaving to rest. The two assure him that they are feeling very good since they rode in a carriage. Asa wastes no time clinging to Hans while reiterating the fact that Callista is better than the capital. Hans then suggests that they all go on a territory inspection the next day since it's been a while. Asa wastes no time agreeing to this suggestion. In no time, 2 years pass by as the house continues to expand its business. Meanwhile, at the capital, there is a district that is considered the most bustling area, and before they knew it, they started calling it Callista Street. This is basically because the Callista Bank headquarters is located on this street, ultimately revealing how much growth has hit the area since the establishment of the bank 2 years ago. However, there is also another place on the street that actually pulls people in, and this is a restaurant where seafood is being served, the Sea Breeze. Everyone who comes to the restaurant enjoys their meals at the restaurant, and to make it even nicer, it is open to commoners. Even though it is a bit expensive, commoners don't mind patronizing the restaurant because it is manageable when it comes to hosting special events. It is also nice because in the past, commoners wouldn't even think of buying seafood in the capital. The reason seafood is now easily accessible is all thanks to Sea Breeze. In the past, all the fish would have rotted before they got to the capital from the sea. And from the rumors flying around, there is a mage dedicated to casting preservation magic on the cargo wagons departing the seaport, which means no matter how many days it takes to reach the capital, the seafood stays fresh. While the noble class customers are discussing this, they are left questioning the possibility of this, since preservation magic requires at least third circle high-level magic. Because of this, they assume that the Imperial mages are involved. What makes it fun is the fact that Imperial mages are not allowed to use magic other than in their Imperial duties. With this, one of them concludes that the restaurant is linked to the Imperial court. However, the question of who owns the restaurant still remains largely unknown. One of the nobles is pissed that the restaurant is accommodating both nobles and commoners. In fact, the restaurant has intentionally lowered its prices so that the commoners can also eat at the restaurant. However, the nobles use the second floor, while the commoners use the first floor. Apparently, there is still an upper floor, which is reserved only for the big shots. Meanwhile, Jeprian is begging Hans to reveal that he is the real owner of the restaurant because there is no way anyone will believe that a commoner like him owns the restaurant. Hans smiles while saying he only provided funding and planning, while Jeprian was the one who researched and developed recipes to suit everyone's taste in the capital. Because of this, Hans believes that Jeprian should be treated as the owner of the restaurant. Jeprian has no choice but to accept what Hans is pushing to him, and he lets Hans know that he appreciates the gesture. Hans then commends the day's food, and Jeprian confesses that he made the meal even better because it is a memorable day. Apparently, Hans is resuming full capital activities because up until that moment, he had been focused on territory management, but he is now planning to pursue various other businesses. Just then, Hans hears that his guest has arrived, which is a bit early. However, he refuses to ask them to wait since he is done eating. Hans then asks them to be ushered in, and the guest turns out to be Bowen. Bowen presents a bouquet of flowers to Hans while kneeling to him to thank him for reserving the upper floor of the restaurant for them as their meeting place. Once they are seated, Bowen talks about how good business has been and his plan to open another branch in Bensi. Hans is surprised to hear this because it would make it the 5th branch. Bowen's clothing business basically began with high-quality artificial flowers, and this hit the empire with a big wave, which eventually expanded beyond accessories, materials, and women's clothing. Bowen has been hitting the jackpot with everything he touches, which earned him the nickname Golden Hands. Hans also compliments him on his success in the men's salon, because even though there was a bit of resistance in the beginning, everything turned out so well. Bowen then replies that he owes everything to his eyes. Hans is confused when he hears this, and Bowen decides to explain further. Bowen explains how he is able to figure out that Hans has an outfit for each season of the year. Bowen talks about how he would style Hans if he were to be put in charge. At the end of his explanation, he tells Hans that he would design the sleeves tight and thick to hide the gold bracelet that Hans is wearing on his wrist. Bowen figures out that the bracelet is a secret that shouldn't be seen by others, and since he saw how Hans always wears it, he could tell that it is something of personal significance. With this, he urges Hans to be more careful. Hans nervously thanks Bowen for the advice, and he is right about the significance of the bracelet since it is the dragon's bracelet. Bowen then urges Hans to visit his salon whenever he is free, promising to bring the best out of him. Bowen boasts about how he brings the best out of people except for one person, and this is Marquis Krauser. This comes as a shock to Hans because the last time he spoke to Annabelle, she told him that there was still no information on Krauser. Curious about this, Hans asks Bowen if he has ever seen or met Krauser. Bowen excitedly replies that those who are young might not have met Krauser. Bowen then reveals that he once caught a glimpse of Krauser at a banquet 10 years ago. When Bowen saw him, he was wearing dark clothes as if he was going to a funeral. Krauser only stared outside throughout the banquet from start to finish, and he never opened his mouth once during the entire event, not to mention talking to anyone. Bowen is surprised, leaving to wonder why Krauser came to the banquet if he was going to act the way he did. Hans then asks Bowen what he thinks of Krauser, and Bowen confesses that it is hard for him to get a read on Krauser because he never got the chance to speak to him. However, he noticed something when he got a good look at Krauser's eyes. Apparently, one was purple while the other was black. When Hans hears this, he realizes that Krauser has a condition called heterochromia. Later on, Hans asks Lakia and Asa if they have ever seen Krauser in person, but the two tell him that they haven't. Hans then reveals that the only information Annabelle has been able to acquire is the rumor that Krauser isn't even living in the Krauser castle. At this point, Hans is frustrated already, and he starts thinking of giving up on his pursuit of Krauser. Just then, Lakia mentions the fact that Hans is preparing for a territorial war, and Hans confirms this. Basically, the other territories surrounding Callista have started getting suspicious that the region is building up for other purposes, thanks to the immigrants coming into the region every minute. In addition, Hans mentions his plan to properly use the night order that Lakia would soon leave behind. Even though Hans has gotten used to the fact that Lakia is always by his side, he has been wise enough not to include him in his future plans because the 5-year deadline promise they made is about to run out. With this, the two are slowly saying their farewell to each other. Soon afterward, Grunberg is informed that he has been summoned to the castle. It turns out that the castle's servants and staff are already aware of Hans's status as a mage, but no one cares about digging further or even spreading rumors about it. This is because they are all working together to protect the region and their young lord. Moments later, Grunberg arrives at the castle to meet Hans. Even though Grunberg is aware of the fact that Hans is a mage, he is still very much impressed with just how Hans is able to cross between the capital and Callista as if they are next door to each other. After Hans is done checking William's report, he turns to Grunberg to attend to him. Apparently, Grunberg is done with the sword he was making and he has brought it to Hans. Hans takes the sword from Grunberg and he is impressed at just how light it is. Grunberg explains that he was able to reduce the weight by half and increase the strength more than double. He assures Hans that by the following week, they will be able to supply the swords to the entire Night Order. William is impressed because of just how talented Grunberg is, and he attributes this to Hans's impressive intuition. After Hans is done with the sword's inspection, he shows Grunberg what he will be working on next, which is the armor for the Night Order. William is curious as ever, and he asks Hans if he was the one who made the design. Hans confirms this, saying he used the Imperial Night Order as a reference. Grunberg then points to the hollow point in the center of the chest, asking Hans if this will serve as the power source for the circuit. Hans is shocked and impressed when he hears this because Grunberg is so talented that he already figured out the reason for the hole just by looking at the design. Grunberg then tells Hans that he might not know how it works, but he is pretty sure that it will turn out great. After receiving the design, Grunberg takes his leave, and Hans talks to Williams about how he completely trusts Grunberg. William confirms this, saying Grunberg is a really trustworthy person. William then tells Hans that there is one more thing he has to report, even though he has mentioned it before. William then tells Hans about the drought, and this is because it has only rained once that year. Thanks to Hans's foresight, they were able to build a large reservoir, and they have been managing because of the reservoir. However, William is worried because if it doesn't rain by the rainy season, everything is going to dry up, which is why they are all worried. Hans then tells William that even though they can't do anything about the weather, he has made sure he prepared enough countermeasures, so no one in Callista will go hungry. Hans then tells William that he can give the people this assurance so they have nothing to worry about. After the meeting with William is over, Hans thinks over everything again. He suspects that the drought is just beginning because the grass outside is already dried out. However, Hans is not ready to just mess with everything because he knows the future.
He is extremely careful not to make choices that would determine many people's fates because he has learned his lesson the hard way. Hans decides that he just needs to chill out and think things over carefully. Later on, Lakia sees the sword that Grunberg made, and he compliments it, but he still boasts about how his sword is superior to it. Just then, Lakia turns to Asa, asking him where his bodyguard has been lately. Unknown to them, Ruji is always following Asa around, but they don't know this because he is very elusive in the way he does his thing. Hans also joins Lakia in asking Asa about Ruji. Asa then replies that cat people are known to wander around, and he assures them that Ryuji will always come around, even if he disappears. Lakia then asks Hans if he has any major plans coming up, and he says no. Basically, he is stuck with managing the bank and the restaurant branches. Hans is relieved that in his past life, nothing really important happened at this time, which means he can focus on work. Meanwhile, the Emperor and Regina meet at the usual spot, which is located in a local area. They both make sure to wear commoners' clothes when coming so as not to raise suspicions. The two are happy to see each other as they exchange warm greetings. The Emperor assures Regina that he is fine because Ivan makes it easy for him to occasionally go out to meet Regina. However, Regina can see that the Emperor is acting all weird, and she asks him if there is anything wrong. The Emperor mentions that he has received another marriage proposal from McCarthy, and his mother has been advising him to meet them since it would not be nice if he continues turning all of them down. It finally dawns on Regina that she has been going out with the Emperor of the Empire, and there is no guarantee that they are going to continue the way they are. Just then, the Emperor asks Regina if she is fine with the type of relationship they currently have. Regina is confused by what the Emperor means, and he asks her if she is fine with the way they hide their statuses by wearing commoner clothes. He asks Regina if she is fine with the way they have been hiding their relationship, as if it were some kind of crime. Regina then nervously replies that she doesn't mind because she believes that the Emperor is being considerate so that House Callista doesn't get involved in power struggles. Regina then tells the Emperor that she has thought a lot about their relationship and she has come to the conclusion that she would be fine as long as they remain friends after the Emperor gets married. Just then, the Emperor cuts in, telling Regina that he is not satisfied with this. Regina is shocked to hear this, and she watches as the Emperor stands up from where he is sitting. He reveals his plan to announce his plan of a state marriage at the next Imperial Grand Council. Before Regina knows what is happening, the Emperor has gone on his knees, asking Regina if she would marry him. Regina is so shocked that she turns red like a tomato while covering her mouth in total disbelief. Later on, Alman presents Hans with the banking reports, and Hans is impressed by everything that he even tells Alman that he is more suited to business management than butler work. Alman humbly tells Hans that it is all thanks to his ingenuity when it comes to personnel organization. Alman then asks Hans if his successor, William, is doing well, and Hans assures him that he is doing pretty well, saying William is even more knowledgeable about Callista's internal affairs than him. Hans then asks Alman about the drought situation in other places because it seems that Callista is the only region managing the situation. Alman confirms this, saying the report he is getting is not quite good. According to Claude, who is stationed in Bensi, the majority of farmers are stockpiling food without consuming it. In fact, some have completely given up on the year's crops because they are already anticipating a major famine. Alman then asks Hans if there won't be a problem if famine actually hits, making it hard for the commoners to repay their loans. Hans then tells Alman not to review the bank policy yet and just continue with the existing one. He lets Alman know that he is going to tell him when it is time to take additional measures. After the meeting with Alman, Annabelle rushes into the office to tell Hans that they should attend the ball hosted by House Viscount Roxon the following week. Hans doesn't take the invitation seriously, and Annabelle can see it all over his face. Hans reminds Annabelle that he doesn't wish to attend any social event. Annabelle then tells him that this is much different from the usual ones. Apparently, she was able to obtain information that Lady Swergen will be present. Hans is shocked when he hears this because he knows who Annabelle is talking about. Basically, Rebecca von Swergen is the queen of high society who always appears on the first page when listing the Empire's key celebrities. Even though she spends most of her time outside the Empire, she is still on the path of becoming the Empire's most famous woman because she has Duke Townsend as her maternal grandfather. In addition to this, she is extremely beautiful, ultimately earning her the nickname Goddess of Beauty. Annabelle then reminds Hans about how much Townsend cherishes his granddaughter, and there is the chance that Hans might not meet her again once she leaves the Imperial capital. Annabelle urges Hans to use the opportunity to build a connection with Rebecca. Hans thinks about it for a minute and tells Annabelle that he appreciates the thought, but he has to decline. Hans admits that he is aware of the fact that Rebecca is an important figure, but Rebecca appears to be one who focuses on business rather than socializing. Annabelle then reminds Hans that he is already of marriageable age, and his mother is already expressing concern about this. Apparently, Hans is 20 years old already, but he lets Annabelle know that he has no need for marriage as things stand.
This turns out to be the opposite when Hans meets the Emperor later that day. The Emperor tells him his decision that he wants to marry Regina. This news hit Hans so badly that he lost his footing, causing the Emperor to lean over to ask him if he was fine. An hour ago, Ivan had suggested that Hans come to the castle, and Hans thought it would be something about the research institute, not knowing it was something so important. The Emperor then suggests that they take a walk. He lets Hans know that he proposed to Regina that very day, and Hans asks the Emperor what his sister's answer was. Hans reveals that Regina initially refused because she believed that she was not competent to handle the position of Empress, thus becoming a burden to the Empire and the imperial family. However, deep down, she wishes to be by the Emperor's side if she can. Because of this, she reveals that she was going to follow anything Hans says because her brother always makes the right decisions. Deep down, Hans has always known about the relationship between the two, and since he is the ruler of Callista, he is supposed to be the one to decide Regina's marriage. However, Hans believes that a marriage proposal from the imperial family is another weight on its own. It is pretty sure that their marriage won't end as just a high society controversy, and because Hans knows what happened to Lakia, he is scared that all the Empire nobles might turn to his enemies. This leaves him wondering if he currently has the power to handle such a difficult situation. Just then, Hans realizes that they have reached the Empress's court, where there is an abundance of lilacs. The Emperor reveals that the space is the most beautiful and peaceful place within the imperial castle, and he often walks there whenever he seeks solace from loneliness. Because of how beautiful the place is, the Emperor reveals his plan to give Regina the garden because it is the most precious thing that he owns. In fact, the Emperor is looking to give Regina all the special things he can to make her the happiest woman in the world. Hans remembers that after the dinner he and Regina had with the Emperor at the palace 2 years ago, the Emperor never invited the two of them to the palace again. Coupled with Callista Bank's growth at the time, all the nobles' attention would have been on them. Because of this, the Emperor would have been forced to try to protect Callista from the interest and pressure of high-ranking nobles. Hans believes that the Emperor and Regina meeting in secret must have been to avoid the nobles' eyes. However, the Emperor made the decision to bring Hans into the Empress's space out of nowhere. With this, Hans believes that the Emperor might finally be ready to confront the nobles in control. Just then, Hans asks the Emperor if he can ask him one extremely rude and presumptuous question. The Emperor assures Hans that he is free to ask whatever he wants to. Hans then asks the Emperor what kind of world he dreams of building. Basically, Hans wants to know what direction the Empire should change toward. The Emperor thinks about this for a minute, confessing that it is a slightly different question than what he was prepared for. The Emperor then replies that it might sound like a fantasy, but he wishes for a world where everyone has an opportunity. He basically wants a world where people can live as they wish without being bound by status, class, gender, or even origin. It then dawns on Hans that he shouldn't be afraid because he has gained a bit of power in this life. Hans doesn't mind if his people extend beyond his territory, even into the imperial palace, because he now has the power to protect what is his. With this in mind, Hans goes down on his knees, offering his respect to the Emperor and urging him to take care of Regina. Shortly afterward, they hold the Imperial Grand Council meeting, and the Emperor makes it known to everyone in attendance that he has decided to marry Regina. This shocks everyone, leaving them all frozen in their seats. One of them believes that the Emperor is not serious about this because the Callista family is a remote family with no connection to central politics, not to mention legitimacy. In addition, they think the whole thing is too sudden, and the Emperor reminds them that they are the ones who have been urging him to marry. Just then, Duke John Townsend tells the Emperor that he might have grown affection with Regina, but state marriage is something serious and cannot be decided simply. Duke Alan McCarthy also agrees with Townsend, saying these are matters that might shake the Empire's traditions if handled poorly. The Emperor then reminds them that House Callista is also a distinguished noble family of the Empire. The Emperor demands to know with what standard they are measuring the dignity they are talking about. Townsend then mentions that they already provided the Emperor with a list. On their list, they believe that a foreign princess would benefit the Empire. In addition, daughters from befitting houses would complement royalty, and this is why they selected those who wouldn't damage imperial legitimacy. McCarthy agrees with Townsend, telling the Emperor that he must not arrange a marriage because of his feelings, just like commoners do. McCarthy then tells the Emperor that they cannot approve the request. Since the Emperor ascended the royal seat from a young age, he has been voiceless like a puppet, but everything is about to change. Just then, the Emperor asks them where in the imperial regulations what they are insisting was written. He reminds them that his own mother was not from an influential house, and because of this, he asks them if they think the current empress sullied the empire's legitimacy. In anger, the Emperor tells them that it is wrong of them to covet imperial authority while invoking traditions without history. With a stern voice and face, the emperor tells them that he is the master of the empire, and he is going to be the one to choose the empress himself. He then adds a condition to it. He lets them know that if they continue to refuse his decision, he will never take an empress for his entire life. This basically means the imperial line will end with him and the throne will pass to his paternal cousin, Duke McCarthy. Seeing how angry the emperor is, the council members try to calm him down, but he stands up and walks out of the room. Later that day, Townsend is seen having a discussion with his son, Glenide, about the events that happened at the council meeting. Glenide is confused about the whole thing, and he believes that House McCarthy should be happy, since the throne is going to fall to them if the emperor doesn't have an heir. However, House McCarthy also didn't welcome the idea, leaving Glenide totally confused. Townsend berates his son, telling him that he lacks foresight. Townsend explains that the empire boasts about its supreme history, and no matter how greedy the McCarthy house, they will never try to take on a power game. In addition, if it happens, a war will simply break out, which obviously ends in the total annihilation of one side. Townsend reveals that the emperor sounded totally different from before, and it appears that he has broken off his leash, which means they have no choice but to follow his will. Townsend reveals that he is going to vote for the marriage just to see how far the emperor's newly gained momentum would go. Townsend is left wondering if Regina or Hans was the one who made the emperor change. Later on, Hans and Regina tell their mother about the marriage arrangement. Their mother is surprised to hear this, and she berates them for telling her so late. Hans apologizes for this, but little does their mother know that everything happened in just one day. Their mother then mentions that she is not one to interfere in her children's marriages, but at the same time, she lets Regina know that the position of an empress is not something that she can just take on, because she and the emperor like each other. Hans then tells his mother that he shares her concern, but he assures her that Regina and the emperor are prepared to face the future and walk together. In addition, Hans assures his mother that he is going to do everything in his power to protect the family. With this, he urges his mother to trust him and Regina on the matter. His mother smiles when she hears this, as she compliments her son because he talks like someone who has been alive for a really long time. Their mother then tells Regina that she has no reason to object because their happiness is all that matters. Regina thanks her mother for the support, and their mother finally reveals that she had known for a long time because she always saw Regina sneak out wearing a commoner's clothes. She then tells Regina to tell her how she met the emperor. Just then, Hans tells their mother that the emperor has actually asked to see her. Not long after this, the emperor meets Owen and her family on the upper floor of the Seabreeze restaurant. Their mother is surprised that they are meeting in a restaurant, but the emperor assures her that he was the one who requested they meet at the restaurant. Hans then urges everyone to eat their meal, assuring them that the best ingredients were used in making the dish. The entire course of the meeting turns out to be really good, and Hans is pleased to see that his mother is relieved. Ivan is also pleased because he never thought he would see a day when the emperor would marry someone he loves. Ivan tells Hans that he is grateful because everything turned around when they met him and his sister. Just then, Hans uses the opportunity to tell Ivan that he has a difficult favor to ask him. Ivan is surprised to hear that Hans is interested in hiring his disciples as professors at his academy. It turns out that the emperor is also aware of the academy being built in Callista. Hans mentions that there has been a decline in magical education, and to cultivate outstanding mages in the magic department, he believes that experienced and capable imperial mages are a necessity. However, he lets the emperor and Ivan know that their permission is needed, since he is planning to move the disciples from the capital. On the other hand, Hans's mother doesn't appreciate the fact that her son is talking about work in such a place. However, Regina lets her mother know that it is fine, because she is also interested in the growth of the academy. Both the emperor and Ivan let Hans know that they are both willing to give a positive answer to his request, but at the same time, there is no guarantee that the disciples themselves would agree. Ivan reveals that the mages at the Imperial Research Institute are those who refuse to be employed by nobles, even though they are aware that they could amass wealth by becoming nobles' servants. They basically decided to work under the emperor for value and honor. Ivan mentions that asking this set of guys to become professors at a private academy might be insulting to them. Hans assures Ivan that he understands his worries, and he reveals his plan to personally teach those who will become academy professors, being a sixth circle mage that he is. The emperor is shocked to hear this because this is basically the first time Hans has acknowledged that he is a mage. Not only this, but he also reveals his circle. Even Regina is stunned to hear that her brother is a sixth circle mage, but unknown to them, Hans is actually higher than that. Ivan, on the other hand, reacts over the top, grabbing Hans's shirt as he asks him if he can apply to teach at the academy. Later on, the Imperial Grand Council approves the state marriage between Regina and the emperor. Fortunately, Ivan's 3 disciples were also appointed as magic department professors. However,
The trio is not really pleased with the whole appointment thing, since they don't know about Hans yet. Ivan assures Hans that they are going to come around once they know about him, and they are going to thank him for life. At the same time, Hans is worried that things are going way too well, leaving a bit of fear in him. It turns out that his fear would soon come to pass in the most violent way. Sometime later, Hans, Asa, and Lakia are walking through the street when a supposed pickpocket tries to get to Lakia, but he swiftly takes him down. Asa is surprised that the guy is stupid enough to target a guard knight in plain sight. While the dude is restricted, he starts complaining about how the nobles are fine, while the commoners are hungry. Hans immediately tells Lakia to let the dude go, surprising Lakia. Lakia assumes Hans wants him to release the dude, but Hans tells him not to beat him and hand him over to the authorities instead. Hans is well aware that everything is going south because of the famine, since the farmers' year's harvest is tied to their livelihood. Just then, they return home to see carriages in front of the house, shocking Hans, and he starts to question why there are people at the house. Alman then rushes over to tell Hans that people have been pouring in, requesting to see Hans or Regina. Alman mentions that these people are of high nobility, so he couldn't turn them away. Hans then tells Alman to refuse all audience requests for the time being. In the past, nobles who approached Hans were those in need of emergency funds or facing financial crises, but since the announcement of Regina as the future empress, there will be those who will want to form connections for the future. Hans was already expecting the famine and the sudden interest in other nobles thanks to Regina being announced as the empress, but the combination of these gave a result that Hans totally didn't expect. In no time, rumors start flying around that the famine is because of the new empress. People start talking about how heaven is angered that the emperor picked an unsuitable person as his bride. Hans enters his sister's room to find her crying, while their mother comforts her. Hans is shocked since Regina was supposed to step out that very day to look at the wedding reception dresses. Their mother then reveals that something humiliating happened. Their mother reveals that a stranger tried to throw filth while shouting terrible things like Regina defiling the imperial family with dirty blood. Even though the guard knight was able to stop them and arrest them in time, it shows something horrendous. Hans is left in dismay when he hears this, but Regina pulls herself together and assures Hans that she is fine. She tells Hans that she was only startled, but she is going to get herself ready to face something like this henceforth. Hans then kneels in front of his sister, telling her not to get used to such words because she didn't do anything wrong. Regina burst into tears again, saying, "The people are not wrong because famine has actually struck the land." Regina believes that this kind of thing cannot be helped, but Hans tells her that she is wrong because he can solve the issue. Later on, an announcement is made for everyone to hear. The people are informed that Regina has commanded that relief grain be distributed to all imperial citizens. The people are shocked when they hear that they are going to get free wheat. In the year 858, a terrible famine struck the land, but this is also the same time that relief activities under Regina's name began. When the lord in charge of the slums hears this, he is pissed that Regina is carrying out such an act without his permission. However, his attendant lets him know that Regina is doing this based on her status as the future empress, not as a count. Apparently, it is the duty of lords to take care of their territory and care for their citizens, but these lords basically provide a tiny bit of support during famine. They do this to prevent death while also using it as a way to get the people to be loyal to them. Because Regina is not doing this the usual way that they have been doing it, the lord is pissed off. He believes that Regina is naive, and since the famine is still early, the commoners won't appreciate her effort. Just then, the attendant calls his attention to the fact that the wheat relief program might cause the wheat prices to plummet. The attendant tells him that as of that morning, one bundle of wheat was 8 copper coins. This shocks the lord because as of the day before, one bundle was 60 copper coins. The attendant mentions that House Callista is directly supplying wheat to retailers with a contract stipulating the selling price won't exceed 8 copper coins. The lord almost crashes out in anger when he hears this. He talks about how he hasn't met Hans, but he is already interfering in his territory. His attendant then tells him that the relief program is being implemented simultaneously across all regions in the empire, not just their own territory. The moment the lord hears this, he is left wondering how House Callista is able to get their hands on such large quantities of wheat. Thanks to House Callista supplying wheat across the empire, they were able to stabilize the price hike in wheat. It turns out that this famine relief strategy came to life in a meeting from 2 years ago when Duran von Chenoweth visited the bank for a loan. This was when Duran learned the conditions surrounding the 7,000 gold loan that he wanted to take. Basically, for 5 years, there will be an exclusive supply of 50% of the wheat harvested in his territory to Callista. He was also to pay loan interest this same way. Hans had told him to check the contract and point out whatever he felt was bad for him. When Hans sees that Duran was taking too long, he asks him if 50% was too much, but Duran nervously says no. In fact, he was surprised that the conditions were lighter than expected. Since Hans was lending him 7,000 gold, he could have just asked for 100% monopoly rights. He then asks Hans if he was planning to start a grain distribution business because he knows that Callista currently doesn't have issues with food. In ancient times, it was normal that the rich became richer and the poor became poorer whenever there was a crisis in the land. In Hans's previous life, countless lives were lost thanks to the greed of the nobles. Wheat that usually traded at 5 copper coins rose to 100 copper coins at some point. These caused even farmers to borrow money that they would never be able to finish paying in their lifetime. Since Hans knows this, he has sold wheat that he got from Chenowis only in an amount that would not affect the market while storing the rest. Thanks to this, Callista now has wheat reserves that are sufficient enough to distribute among all imperial citizens with plenty left over. In no time, they completed relief in the capital while other regions kept sending in their requests. Before Hans knows it, he realizes that he has gotten so busy that he doesn't even have time for himself again. Lakia can see how stressed he is, and he asks him why he is directly handling distribution when he could sell wholesale to trading companies. Hans replies that major trading companies cannot be trusted with this because if they secure large quantities from him and they raise the price, it would be hard to control. Asa then mentions that Hans is doing everything differently this time around because the wheat is being distributed in Regina's name. Lakia and Hans are shocked to hear this coming from Asa because he doesn't look like one to think that far ahead. Basically, Asa is right because Hans never planned to use the disaster for political gain. However, he has always tried to avoid conflict with nobles. He even made sure he kept his distance from social events to avoid creating friendships or conflicts. However, given the fact that Regina has become the empress, he can no longer maintain neutrality. It is clear as day that House Callista is the imperial family's in-laws. Hans lets his subordinate know that House Callista can now transfer its power to the emperor, and for the sake of the emperor, he is looking to take a stronger stance. Lakia smiles when he hears everything that Hans just said. Hans then asks him if Regina is fine because he put him in charge of taking care of Regina in the meantime. Lakia assures Hans that there has been no problem so far. Hans apologizes to Lakia for giving him such an important task, but Lakia lets him know that things have changed. Apparently, all Regina gets whenever she goes to the city is gratitude and cheers. Hans is happy to hear this because it means the relief strategy is working miracles. Just then, Alman informs Hans that the Joel Trading Company has requested an audience. Hans is surprised because he already rejected all audience requests, but when he hears that Ivan is escorting them, he becomes curious. Apparently, Annabelle had previously warned Hans that Joel had some connections with Ivan, and he might one day use that to try to get close to him. Hans finally receives Ivan and Joel in his chambers, and even apologizes for his unruly behavior. Even though Lakia is completely displeased, Hans still tells him that it is nothing to worry about. The dude finally introduces himself as Kirk Joel, and he apologizes for his rudeness. Joel then tells Hans that the reason he came is to obtain the distribution rights for the wheat that Callista has. Hans asks Joel if he knows why he doesn't deal directly with merchants, and Joel confirms this. He mentions that he is also aware of Hans's conviction about putting public interest and the weak first. Joel then assures Hans that what his company seeks is not retail margins, but securing a nationwide distribution network through wheat supply. Because of this, his company is willing to trade at whatever price he sets without adding to it. Joel then continues by saying that Hans would probably be thinking of how he can trust him. Joel then reveals that to build trust, his company is going to transfer its deposits to Callista Bank. This basically means that Joel Trading Company would switch its primary bank to Callista Bank. Even though Callista Bank seized the opportunity to secure deposits and customer numbers during the Sullivan Bank forgery incident, only 2 small-scale trading companies have started using Callista Bank as their primary institution. Basically, larger trading companies with more history prioritize long-standing credit over temporary trends. Hans knows that it would be extremely beneficial if Joel's company, which is among the top 10 major companies, becomes Callista Bank's primary customer. However, the major problem with all of these is that Joel's company's current primary bank is Sullivan Bank. Trying to switch primary institutions as a transaction condition might possibly present itself to Sullivan as trying to steal their customers before their very eyes. To make it worse, the house backing Sullivan Bank is the House McCarthy, leaving Hans the question of what he should do in such a situation. He wonders if it is time for him to finally clash with House McCarthy, who is considered to be the Empire's pillar. After thinking about it for a minute, Hans tells Joel that he will be accepting the deal. Joel is glad to hear this, assuring Hans that it is an excellent choice. Without wasting time, they move down to drafting the contract, and Hans actually made the decision after realizing that he already offended a bunch of nobles by implementing the relief policies. In addition, it is most likely that Sullivan Bank has a beef with Callista already since they suffered massive losses from the check business. After drafting out the contract, Joel is shocked to see that Hans actually set the supply price more generously than expected, which reduces the profit margin for House Callista. Hans then mentions that he is aware that trading companies generally pursue profit, so it is fair of him to give Joel a share to help maintain smooth relations. Joel greatly understands what Hans did with this because it is a simple method of giving to avoid betrayal. Joel is impressed at just how perceptive Hans is, but he assures him that he has nothing to worry about because he cares more about his reputation above all else. Joel then reveals that this is the same reason he has secured a deal with cat people. It finally dawns on Hans that this is the reason Joel was nicknamed the negotiation genius. He is the first person in the Empire, and even remains the only person to have successfully conducted a trade with the cat people. Hans also notices that Joel has been looking in Asa's direction since he entered the room, which means he recognized Asa's identity. Hans is surprised that Joel could recognize Asa in his cat form, and he asks him how he did it because Asa's magical power was not leaking out. Joel then replies that it was a simple method. He mentions that only cat people have such beautiful, magnificent, and luxurious fur. Ivan is shocked when he realizes that the cat he has always been seeing around is a cat person, and he never knew. Joel then walks up to Asa to bow and offer his greetings to him, while addressing him as the son of Shaha. Asa immediately returns to his human form, asking Joel how he knows him. Joel then tells Asa that he might not remember, but he is someone who never forgets anyone he has met before. Surprisingly, Asa doesn't take this very well as he runs out of the room. Later on, Hans walks to the room where Asa is hiding and asks to come in. Hans has always suspected that Asa is from an important tribe among the cat people, but the term Shaha that Joel used points to the fact that Asa is the son of the king of the cat people. Hans enters the room, and he sits beside Asa to try to comfort him. Asa then reveals that the person who inflicted the wounds on him the first time Hans saw him was his own brother. Apparently, his brother tried to kill him, which was why he ran away. He is scared that they are going to come looking for him if they find out where he is. Hans is surprised to hear all of these, and he asks Asa if there was some sort of succession rivalry between him and his brother, but Asa says no. Asa reveals that the position of Shaha only goes to the legitimate son, and since he is illegitimate, he had no succession rights to begin with. This leaves Hans questioning why his brother would want to kill him. Asa lets him know that he also doesn't know why his brother did what he did. Just from the way Asa is talking about it, Hans can see that he is traumatized from the whole experience. Hans then assures Asa that he already spoke to Joel about keeping Asa's identity a secret. Hans also told Ivan, and he promised not to mention it anywhere. In fact, they both swore that even if the world is falling apart, the secret would never slip out of their mouths. With this out of the way, Hans assures Asa that he is safe with him. Basically, Hans now sees Asa as family, and he protects his family. Hans also reminds Asa that he already told him that he can stay as long as he wants. On the morning of the imperial wedding, Hans is the first to show up at Regina's room to check on her. He asks her how she is feeling, and she confesses that everything feels unreal to her. Regina talks about how exhausting everything has been from planning to even picking of jewelries. Hans understands fully well that Regina might be exhausted, but at the same time, she is feeling this way because she is excited. Hans then tells Regina to give him her hand because he has a wedding gift for her. Hans reaches to his neck to remove his necklace, which he places on Regina's hands, ultimately shocking her. Hours later, Regina and the Emperor are joined together at the palace. Originally, state marriages were always very big, but thanks to the ongoing famine, it was held simply within the imperial palace. Deep down, it was done this way in concern for public sentiment. At the venue, Ivan made sure to set up defensive magic around the banquet hall. The weapon inspection at the entrance was also thorough, so Hans believes that he can at least relax a bit. However, he had prepared beforehand because the necklace he gave to Regina was an artifact. This is why Regina was shocked when Hans gave it to her. Hans urged her never to take it off her body and also not to tell anyone about the necklace's effects. Regina then asks Hans if the Imperial Palace is a dangerous place, and Hans confirms this, telling Regina that she can't trust anyone inside. Now at the banquet hall, Hans hopes Regina will never have to use the necklace. Once they are done with the official wedding, they move to the reception, which is also the beginning of the real social warfare. This is simply a gathering to build connections with influential nobles as the Emperor's brother-in-law. In no time, Hans meets with Duke Townsend, and Hans offers his respect to the man. The two shake hands, and by the time Townsend is done, Hans can feel immense pressure from their encounter, which is far greater than when he met Sullivan. With this, Hans can clearly see that Townsend doesn't have good intentions toward him. He wonders if what Townsend did was a silent warning or just an intimidation. Just then, Hans is informed that Prince Carlisle of Garcia requests to greet him. Just as usual, Hans walks over to offer his greetings to the prince who came from a long distance. Carlisle is shocked when Hans greeted him in his native language, forcing him to ask if he speaks Garcia too. Hans then lies that he learned basic conversation, even though this is thanks to the knowledge he received from the dragon. Carlyle immediately grabs Hans's hands, complimenting the fact that he is the first person in the Empire to speak in such perfect conversation. Carlyle talks about how no one in the room understands Garcia. In fact, his interpreter is pretty useless, leaving Carlyle totally frustrated. It soon spreads across the room that Hans can speak Garcia, which has made it easy for Carlyle to talk the way he wants. This leaves the people wondering if Hans is interested in trade, which is why he knows the language of Garcia. Just then, Hans hears a sweet voice behind him, and when he turns around, he gazes upon an extremely beautiful lady. She commends Hans for his fluency in a foreign language. She wants to know if Hans travels around, and she also wants to know the farthest place he has traveled to. Hans then replies that he has never left the Empire and that everything he learned was from books. Curious about who he is speaking to, Hans asks the lady for her name. The lady apologizes for not introducing herself, blaming it all on excitement. She then introduces herself as Rebecca Swergen, and this is when it dawns on Hans that he is standing in front of the most popular woman in high society. This was the lady Annabelle wanted him to meet earlier. In no time, people start to notice that Rebecca is speaking to Hans, and this is the first time that they are going to see Rebecca speak to a man first. Rebecca soon notices that they have become the center of attention, and she apologizes to Hans for making him uncomfortable, suggesting that she leave. However, Hans assures her that he is fine, so she doesn't have to worry about him. Hans reminds Rebecca that the party is just getting started, but Rebecca insists that she is leaving. As she walks away, she tells Hans that they are going to meet again if fate wills it. The moment some men notice that she is leaving, they waste no time offering to escort her, and Hans can finally see why she is very popular. Since he has greeted most of the key figures, Hans starts thinking of resting a bit. Just then, Claude shows up behind Hans, and Hans asks him if he is fine. Claude says yes, but in reality, it is not the real Claude. Apparently, the person under the mask is Lakia, who was eager to attend the wedding, which is why Hans used illusion magic to make him look like Claude. Before coming to the wedding, Hans had asked Lakia if he would be fine facing most of the high-ranking nobles who ruined his family. Lakia lets Hans know that this might be a worry, but at the same time it would be a big regret for him if he didn't witness the Emperor's wedding with his own eyes. Hans and Lakia then stand together to peacefully watch Regina and the Emperor hold hands, ushering in a new dawn. Sometime later, Regina spends the entirety of the morning discussing with the Emperor's mother, Dowager. Dowager expresses her regret that she couldn't attend the wedding, but Regina lets her know that her recovery comes first. Regina reveals that her mother was also sick throughout her childhood, and she was the one who took care of her throughout this time, so she knows how hard it is for the patient. Regina assures Dowager that she would like to become a companion for her. Dowager is extremely impressed by how Regina carries herself, and she concludes that she doesn't deserve a good daughter-in-law like Regina. Dowager soon catches a glimpse of her son at the door, and she suggests that Regina leave because her husband is already expecting her. However, the Emperor comes in, telling the two that he is not there to rush them, but to make sure that they are getting along well. Nonetheless, Dowager insists that Regina leave to meet her husband. The two then offer their respect to Dowager before finally leaving. Dowager is happy to see that her son is finally smiling. As they walk through the palace halls, the Emperor thanks Regina for being kind to his mother because she has gained strength since Regina entered the imperial palace. Regina lets the Emperor know that this is not a big deal because Dowager reminds her of her own mother, too. Just then, an attendant tells her that she has gotten a letter from House Callista. Regina reads the letter, and she expresses her shock to see that her brother's academy has been completed. When Hans took a tour of the academy, he was completely blown away by how big the entire area is. Alman assures Hans that it is going to become the continent's finest academy just as he wanted. Asa, on the other hand, is tired already because of how big the academy is. In fact, he has forgotten everything that he saw during the tour, and Hans offers to explain using the map. Hans mentions that the academy has 3 departments. There are the administrative studies, night training, and magic studies. The main building, which is in the center of the academy, is reserved for all students because this is where they will be taking the required general courses. Hans also talks about the dormitory and dining area. Lakia then cuts in, asking Hans if he thinks many would accept the idea of the dormitory. Hans understands that it is hard for someone like Lakia to understand the fact that both nobles and commoners would share the same dormitories. In fact, there is already great resistance among the nobles, as most have decided that they can't send their kids to the school. However, Hans has a solution in his mind already. Apparently, there are 2 criteria to be admitted into the academy. The first is the enormous tuition fee and the noble status. Hans then reveals that the academy will be tempting to those who can't meet one of these criteria. Hans then plans to select the students based on merit, because even Lakia has seen that commoners can sometimes be superior to nobles. Hans then points to the magic department, revealing that there are 4 academies in the Empire, but only 2 teach magic.
Even these said academies just have the faculty of magic for show because they can't offer proper education. This is not the case for Hans's academy because their professors will be imperial mages, and they are Ivan's disciples. Regardless of status or wealth, once one is interested in becoming a mage, they have no choice but to come to the academy. Meanwhile, Ivan's students are on their way to the academy, but they are confused about why Ivan suddenly sent them to an unknown academy. One of them believes that Ivan had no choice because House Callista is now the Emperor's in-laws, but another disagrees, reminding her colleagues that Ivan would never mix public and private matters together. When Townsend heard about Hans's academy, he started coming up with several assumptions. He believes that Hans had Regina seduce the Emperor so he could get to him. In addition, he believes that Ivan is the one making the Seabreeze restaurant run with his magic, which points to the fact that Callista owns the restaurant. Townsend then concludes that the same thing must have happened in the banking sector. Townsend assumes that Hans employed Ivan's help to make the counterfeit checker, but his attendant tries to call his attention to the fact that the timelines don't match. Annoyed, Townsend reveals that what he is worried about is the way Hans does his thing. It has come to his knowledge that Hans is always trying to mix commoners and nobles together in the same place. Townsend wonders if Hans is trying to lower the noble's status or if he has other political intentions. Since he doesn't know what Hans is thinking, Townsend comes to the conclusion that they need to eliminate Hans. His attendant is shocked to hear this, telling Townsend that the situation has gotten more difficult than before. He mentions that Hans has carried out a relief project, not to mention that he is also the Emperor's brother-in-law. With all of these, the attendant believes that it is hard to ruin Hans's reputation. However, Townsend gets really serious, telling his attendant that the elimination he is talking about is far more extreme than what he is thinking. He then tells his attendant to prepare something, which is still unknown because it is time to finally send Hans on his way. Not long after this, news of the new academy shook the capital, ultimately generating rumors everywhere. Nonetheless, the morning of the entrance ceremony finally arrived. Two students, Jane and Anthony of the Magic Studies Department, are seen in the dining area. Apparently, all meals are provided free at the main building cafeteria, but students are allowed to separately use the campus dining district. The dining district sells snacks, desserts, and other special foods. In fact, all the foods have been subsidized to reduce students' burden. Hans named the academy Seyfried Academy just as promised. Anthony expresses his joy that a commoner like himself could become a student at the academy. Jane then tells Anthony that the dormitories are single rooms, which means they are allowed to have private rooms. Just then, a noble walks by, and he trash talks the two, saying that they are noisemakers because they are commoners. Surprisingly, there are lots of nobles present at the academy because they are all interested in taking lessons from Ivan's students. In fact, there are some who withdrew from their academies just to attend the new academy. Jane and Anthony are excited when they realize that they actually got admitted on merit. Suddenly, Rebecca walks up to the two, asking them how they have seen the academy so far. Anthony is shocked to see a noble speaking to them. And not just any noble, but a beautiful one at that. Totally carried away, Jane assures Rebecca that she's going to tell her whatever it is that she wants to know. However, she lets Rebecca know that they are just freshmen, so they really don't know much. Rebecca then tells them that she would like to know what the name Seyfried means. This is because Hans has always used the Callista name in whatever he has done in the past, which makes this an exception. Jane then replies that she has never thought about the Academy's name's origin. Anthony adds that there is nothing about the origin in the entrance guidebook either. It then dawns on Rebecca that even the students have no idea. Nonetheless, she thanks the two for answering her questions. As she is about to leave, Anthony asks about her department, but she reveals that she is only there to tour the academy. Anthony is not entirely surprised because the academy is open to everyone that day, since it is the first day. In fact, there is a reporter on the academy grounds. The moment the reporter catches a glimpse of Rebecca, the Wanderer, he raises his camera to take pictures of her. He already suspected that she would not miss such an important event thanks to her wanderlust. Basically, Rebecca is addicted to exploring and visiting new places that she knows nothing about. Rebecca figures out that most of the nobles still can't believe that they have to share a place with commoners, while the commoners, on the other hand, are exhilarated. With this, Rebecca confirms her hypothesis that Hans is a very interesting person. Suddenly, Rebecca spots a man in the distance, and she realizes that there is something off about him. Just then, she locks eyes with the man, and his different eyeball colors immediately give away the fact that he is Marquis Krauser. However, Krauser turns around and starts to leave. Apparently, Krauser was able to figure out who Rebecca is, and since she is Townsend's granddaughter, he assumes that he has to be careful. Krauser soon walks past another seemingly interesting individual, leaving him to wonder exactly what Hans has brought to the academy. Moments later, the students are required to report to the main hall. Some of the nobles can't believe that they have to share the same hall as commoners. Not long after this, the chairman of the academy,
Hans, steps out to address everyone. He thanks everyone for coming far and wide, and he declares the ceremony open. In his speech, Hans tells the students and their parents that the core principle of the academy is equality. He talks about how he wants to give everyone the chance to study and to create a positive cycle where the knowledge is given back to society. The parents are blown away when they see just how young Hans is. This leaves them wondering just how he is able to know so much about education. Some even believe that Hans was able to build the academy through the money he got from the bank. Meanwhile, Ivan's students can hear the parents talking, and they easily figure out that the parents don't trust Hans. The lady among them, Tara, mentions that she doesn't really care about anything else because she is only following Ivan's orders. Tara believes that Hans is treating the academy as a money-making scheme, but her colleague, Byron, disagrees, saying he already inspected the main building, and everything was built with the best materials. Byron believes that there is no way Hans would have spent so much money on everything if he didn't genuinely love magic. On the other hand, the third guy, Porto, is not impressed because he believes Hans just has money to build the academy, but doesn't know anything about magic. While giving his speech, Hans can sense some foreign mana in the air, and since he doesn't know if it is because of Ivan's students, he decides to focus on the entrance ceremony in the meantime. On the other hand, Lakia and Asa are standing in the distance, watching Hans deliver his speech. Asa talks about how smooth Hans is with the speech, as if he has lived twice. Lakia then tells him that Hans is able to do this because he took his time to prepare the speech. Lakia then teases Asa, talking about the fact that he has not wandered off, which is so unusual for him. Asa replies that the day is different from every other, and in addition to this, he believes that something is off. Suddenly, Asa's senses react to something sinister, causing him to leap off from where he is. Lakia grabs him to calm him down, but before they know it, the roof starts coming down. Panic immediately erupts in the hall, as one of the nobles blames the collapse on the inferior material that was used. However, his wife screams at him, telling him to get their daughters to safety first. Everything continues getting worse, and Lakia urges Hans to get out of the building while they help evacuate the building. Hans tells everyone to calm down, and just as he is about to cast his magic, he realizes that he is being held back by something unusual. He immediately realizes that he is being restricted by the same energy that is shaking the building. Without a doubt, he realizes that he is under a hold spell, which means a mage is behind the whole thing. As the chaos unfolds, Porto wants to try and do something with his magic, but Tara grabs him, suggesting that they get out of the building first. Hans almost loses his mind when it dawns on him that there is a mage in the building who is trying to kill everyone. Just as expected, the suspicious dude from earlier is behind the whole thing, and just as he is about to start celebrating, Hans shatters the hold spell restraining him. The bad mage sees this, and fear grips him, but it is already too late because Hans is now pissed and his eyes have turned yellow. The evil mage is so scared that he loses his footing and crashes to the ground. Just then, those who are still in the hall see Hans floating in the air. Even Asa is surprised that Hans is exposing himself as a mage. However, Hans knows that he is in a delicate situation, which is much different from the flood. He knows he has to protect everyone from the debris because if the building collapses, it is going to be a much greater disaster. He figures out that he needs a spell that is overwhelmingly strong and delicate at the same time. Hans then casts an 8-circle wide area spell, Sanctuary, to unleash support circles to keep the building from falling apart. This is when it finally dawns on Ivan's students and those in the hall that what they are witnessing is magic. Porto cannot believe his eyes when he realizes that Hans is actually a mage. Seeing that people are distracted, Lakia screams at the top of his voice, urging the mages to evacuate the people first. Just as the people are exiting the building, Hans moves over to the scared, evil mage to confront him. Once they are outside, the exceptionally rude noble starts talking about how he is leaving for his territory immediately. But his daughter Ayla refuses, telling her father that she wants to remain at the academy so she can study there. The noble argues with his daughter, telling him that the buildings were poorly constructed and the same thing might happen to the other buildings later. However, Ayla disagrees, reminding her father that he just saw the magic that he used. She lets her father know that the other academies are useless when it comes to teaching magic, and her father knows it. Ayla talks about how Hans appears to be an incredible mage. In addition, she believes that the incident might have been caused by an attack. Her father asks her what she means by this, and she reminds her parents that Hans was moving close to a strange man as they exit the building. She believes that the man was guilty about something, which was why he couldn't move from where he was. Since everything doesn't appear to be an accident, the noble decides that he's going to wait around to hear the outcome of the investigation. Just then, one of the nobles rushes over to grab Porto, demanding to know why he is not attending to her wounded son. Porto calms the woman down, telling her that her son's injuries are minor, and it is common sense to attend to those who have critical injuries first. Her son agrees with Porto, telling his mother that he is not badly hurt, so others should be attended to first.
Because healing magic is extremely difficult to wield, Porto believes that it is right that they attend to those who really need the care. Just then, Tara shows up to tell Porto that she and Byron have attended to all those who have minor injuries, but they have used up their mana in the process. Porto then replies that he is going to finish up the rest. However, one of the mothers hears the trio talk about their mana exhaustion, leaving them questioning what can be done, since some of the kids are dying. Porto then apologizes to the woman, telling her that mages are not all powerful beings who can just heal critical wounds. However, Hans steps out at the right, and he demands that they show him the kids who need attention. While Hans is being led to where the kids are, Tara is shocked to see that Hans's eyes are back to normal, because she clearly saw that they were yellow before. The butler then shows Hans the 2 critical patients who have severe conditions, which have stopped them from attempting healing magic. Apparently, they have already requested emergency carriages from the nearest clinic. Hans ignores what the dude is saying, and he kneels close to the 2 to place his hands on them. When Porto sees this, he believes that Hans is fooling around because magic is not some omnipotent power that can just heal injuries like that. Basically, 3rd-level basic healing spells are even dangerous enough, not to mention attempting to heal critical injuries. Surprisingly, Hans pours an extremely large amount of mana into the 2 to instantly heal them. This leaves the witnesses in total disbelief because Hans healed the 2 completely, leaving no scar on their bodies. This is when it dawns on some that Hans might actually be on the same level as Ivan. However, Porto is not a fool, and he can clearly see that Hans is way above a 5th circle mage. Hans manages to walk a few steps before losing his footing, thanks to exhausting himself. Fortunately, Lakia is able to catch him. He asks him if he is hurt, but Hans lets him know that he is fine, but only ran out of mana. Hans then asks Lakia if he was able to catch the evil mage, and Lakia says no. He reveals that Asa is currently watching over him, and it is important to note that the evil mage didn't resist. Lakia then urges Hans to leave the rest to them, since all the injured have been taken care of. Just then, Lakia felt the overwhelming presence from before again. He can see Krauser standing in front of him, but he has no idea that he is the one. Even though there is no killing intent from Krauser, Lakia could clearly see that he is dangerous. Krauser stares at Hans and Lakia for a few seconds before suddenly walking away, leaving Lakia totally confused. Hans notices that Lakia is worried, but Lakia urges him not to worry because it is nothing serious. He then suggests that they head back to the castle as quickly as possible. Shortly afterward, Regina and her husband arrive at the Callista castle. Hans steps out to welcome, and Regina rushes over to check on him. The Emperor reveals his surprise at the incident because he was initially worried about coming late for the ceremony, not knowing that something even more anguished was going to happen. He asks Hans if he is hurt, but Hans assures them that he is going to be fine because he only lost some strength thanks to his man depletion, but he will surely be fine after some rest. The Emperor then asks if it was an accident, but Hans lets them know that it is more serious than they think. He suggests that they discuss the details in his reception room. As they leave, the Emperor tells the knights to make sure the castle is properly protected. Just as Ivan is about to follow them, his students grab him and drag him back. They look absolutely pissed as they drag him away to where they can talk. They scream at him for not telling them that Hans is an archmage. Ivan then reveals that the only people who know are him and the Emperor. Even lets them know that Hans was very particular about keeping his identity a secret, and the Emperor was also ready to help him do this. However, things are different now because everyone knows, and Ivan knows that the 2 dukes are going to go crazy about it. The trio starts freaking out because they have been rude to Hans from the very beginning. Tara starts thinking about how she can recover her favorability rating. She even thinks of getting on her knees to beg Hans, but Porto tells her that she is already taking it too far. Ivan then tells the trio that Hans has promised to give them personal lessons later in exchange for becoming professors in the academy. This is when the trio finally loses it, and they start saying crazy things like offering their bodies to Hans as test subjects. Ivan worsens the situation when he reveals that he would have loved to take teachings from Hans, since he is a 6th circle archmage after all. Porto doesn't totally believe that Hans is a 6th circle mage, and Ivan urges them to recount the situation, since they were present on the scene. Porto then replies that the type of magic that Hans used is strange to them because they didn't even hear him chant. Tara then reveals that she was more impressed by the healing magic that Hans used. Ivan is left in total disbelief when he hears that Hans actually used healing magic. Tara explains that she is completely lost at how Hans structured his mana to have been able to heal 2 critically injured people. Just then, Byron mentions something peculiar, which is the Academy's name. He mentions that Seyfried is the name of a legendary gold dragon, and he suddenly brings up the theory that Hans might be a dragon. However, Ivan throws this assumption into the water, telling Byron to stop reading fantasy novels. Porto agrees with Ivan, reminding Byron that dragons already went extinct 100 years ago, so there is no way Hans is a dragon. Ivan then mentions that Hans might have named the academy after the dragon as a sign of respect, since all magic originated from dragons. Ivan then urges his disciple to stop trying to investigate Hans because mages don't like it when others pry into their business. After the discussion, Ivan leaves his students to talk about Hans. The trio spent minutes talking about Hans and how he can revive the declining magic age. Ivan soon joins Hans and the Emperor and his wife at the reception hall. Hans is happy to see Ivan because he was just about to call him. Hans informs him that he captured the culprit and he turns out to be a mage. Ivan is left in shock when he hears this because he doesn't want to believe that someone just committed terrorism with magic. Ivan is worried that the Imperial mages were involved, but Hans refutes this, saying he can actually see others' magical wavelengths in mana circles. He then reveals that the man he caught was a fourth circle mage, and in addition to this, he is a dark mage. Since there are no fourth circle mages among the Imperial mages, Ivan doubts their involvement. The Emperor is surprised to hear this, and he is forced to ask Hans if he is actually sure that the culprit is a dark mage. Hans confirms this, and while they are still bickering among each other, Ivan speaks out, revealing that the culprit is Keenan. This name sounds totally strange to the others, and the way Ivan is shaking also adds to their concern. Meanwhile, outside the castle, the first knight commander, Petros, and the Imperial Knights Royal Guard captain, Crispin, are both mobilizing the knights in the proper order to make sure they maintain the best defensive position. Petros talks about how he never imagined himself coming back to the castle again after what happened when he and his squad were chasing after Lakia back then. This was the same knight who disrespected Regina back then. But now, he is working for the Empress. Crispin immediately becomes interested in the Lakia case, and he asks Petros if he confirmed Lakia's body himself. Petros replies that the body was already rotten, but Crispin wants to know if there is anything to identify that it was Lakia. Petros starts wondering why Crispin is interested in Lakia's case, and Crispin quickly moves past it, telling Petros to forget about it. Unknown to them, Lakia is watching them from his office window, and it appears that he has some sort of connection with Crispin. Back in the reception hall, Ivan explains to the trio that Keenan was his longtime best friend. He was considered to be an outstanding genius among the Imperial mages, and when he became the first in their generation to successfully use fourth circle magic, the entire research institute was left buzzing with admiration. However, there are some who are not pleased with the fact that a commoner like Keenan rose to success. Shortly after, Keenan was approached by two mages who showed him a supposed fourth circle magic formula. They urge him to amplify the formula and demonstrate it for them. When Keenan checks out the formula, he realizes that something was off, but the two kept egging him on. Since Keenan was desperate to get the two to like him, he considered it an opportunity to get them on his side. Keenan activates the formula, and it turns out to be dark magic, which ultimately takes over him. Basically, dark magic is unlike normal magic that uses the caster's own mana. In the case of dark magic, it offers one soul to demons, and in return, one gains unlimited mana. Because of the evil that those who use dark magic have committed, the Empire defined dark magic as a crime, which is equivalent to treason. The Empire then sealed it as a taboo for hundreds of years, which is why no one can even tell if it was dark magic just by looking at the formula. Keenan tries explaining to the judges that he was tricked, but they dismiss his claim, telling him that he already used dark magic, so there is nothing to be done about it. The judge then dismissed him from the research institute and also ordered that he be executed for using dark magic. Ivan reveals that this was the last he heard of Keenan, and this was over 10 years ago. Ivan assumed that Keenan had been killed, but with the emergence of this new dark mage, Ivan believes that it is none other than Keenan. Hans then suggests that Ivan see Keenan personally so he can confirm if his hunch is right. Hans then leads them to the basement, and the Emperor is surprised that there are no guards present there. Hans lets the Emperor know that there is no need for guards, and suddenly, the Emperor realizes that Ivan is covering his face. He asks him if there is anything wrong, and this is when Hans remembers what he did. He apologized because he forgot to mention that he had already set up a barrier in the prison so that he is the only one who can use magic. Since Ivan's magic has worn off, Hans tells him that he will gladly look away if he is not comfortable about showing his real face. Deep down, Ivan is only wondering at just how powerful Hans seems to be because he is able to cast a mana-blocking barrier that allows only specific people to use magic. Ivan is blown away because he hasn't even heard of such magic before, and this tells him that Hans is way ahead when it comes to magic. Just then, they arrive at the cell, and Keenan dashes away from the door when he spots Ivan. Ivan confirms Keenan's identity, telling Hans that he is the one. Hans is surprised to hear this, but then he lets Ivan know that there is a slight problem. He tells Ivan that Keenan doesn't appear to be in the right state of mind because he can't even have a civil conversation with him. Ivan then asks how Keenan ended this way, and Hans replies that he has no idea. Hans mentions that from the moment they arrested Keenan, he has been acting weird. Hans tells Ivan that he can confirm that Keenan used dark magic, but since he is in bad shape, they can't charge him yet. The Emperor suggests that they turn the investigation over to the Imperial Palace because they need to know why a death row inmate appeared in the Callista territory. Ivan, on the other hand, is still trying to understand the situation because Keenan is someone who couldn't even hurt a fly. Suddenly, Keenan comes to his senses, and he recognizes that Ivan is the one standing behind the locked gate. Meanwhile, Lakia and Asa have made their way to the top of a tower to get a good look over the house. Lakia mentions that they are doing this because of the suspicious dude that he saw at the academy. Lakia confirms that this dude is strong, but he can't say if he has bad intentions or not. Since Lakia is exhausted and the Emperor and his wife are at the castle, Lakia believes that they must stay on their guard to avoid any major casualties. Asa mentions his surprise that Lakia called him along for the watch, since he is always complaining about his presence. Lakia has no choice but to swallow his pride and reveal that he can't take on Krauser alone with what he has seen. Asa is surprised to hear Lakia say this, and he assures him that they have nothing to worry about since cat people are best at detection. Asa is still running his mouth when he suddenly spots Krauser in the distance, and he calls Lakia's attention to this. Lakia confirms that it is the same person he saw, and before they know it, he vanishes right in front of them. Seeing this, Asa is forced to admit that Lakia is right about their capacity to be able to handle Krauser. After they are done with their scouting mission, Asa and Lakia visit Hans in his chamber to tell him about what they saw. Lakia mentions that he has seen him at the academy earlier and at the house too, which means Hans is his target. Lakia reveals that he and Asa tried to handle the situation, but it appears that they are no match for Krauser. Lakia then tells Hans that he needs to be really careful. Hans is surprised to hear this because he had earlier placed a light surveillance magic around the castle, which should have detected outsiders entering or moving around. Since he couldn't sense the intruder, Hans figures out that the person is a mage. Meanwhile, Ivan, the Emperor, and Regina had no choice but to stay back at the castle thanks to the whole issue. Ivan had asked Hans if he could speak privately with Keenan. Hans initially refuses because Keenan committed a grave offense, but Ivan assures Hans that he is not trying to get Keenan out of the mess he made. In addition, the Emperor lets Hans know that he can trust Ivan because he is not one to mix personal business with state issues. Thanks to everything going on, Hans assumes that Krauser is working with Keenan, and he might even commit another crime soon. Hans then concludes that he has to raise the defense level of the castle to the highest. A few days later, Hans's mother also rushed down from the capital after hearing the news. She mentions that the entire empire is already in an uproar, as they talk about a new archmage being born. Owen knows her son is a mage, but she is curious to know if he is different from the other mages. Realizing that his family members are curious, Hans decides to come clean, and he tells his mother and sister that he is not an ordinary mage. He mentions that he is a dragon's successor, leaving the two totally shocked. Owen asks him how this is possible since dragons have gone extinct a long time. Hans then decides to explain everything to them, and after hearing his explanation, Owen expresses her surprise that there is a dragon lair in the Compton Mountains. Regina adds that she remembers that Hans started acting strangely around that time. Owen also understands why her son had to keep quiet about everything because the Compton Mountains border the Townsend and McCarthy territories. If they had discovered the lair, it would have led to a war to try to secure it. However, Hans's wisdom is able to prevent them from falling into war. Owen then asks Hans if the recent incident is related to the dragon lair. Hans replies that he is not sure, but he is convinced that someone wanted to eliminate him under the guise of destroying the building. Owen then asks Hans if he is scared because no matter how strong he is still her son. She urges him not to try to shoulder everything by himself, telling him that he can share with the family anytime he is feeling overwhelmed. Regina supports her mother, reminding Hans that she is now an empress, which makes her pretty reliable. Owen realizes this, and she expresses her relief that her children are at the top of their games. Deep down, Hans is not scared for his own life, but he is afraid that his family might get hurt and he won't be able to protect them. Later that night, Krauser returns to the castle and he notices that there is a strong barrier this time around. However, this is still not enough to stop him, as he is able to break through the barrier to get access to the compound. Hans is in his room when he senses the subtle twist in mana in the barrier, but he is confused, since there is no reaction from the barrier. Before he knows it, Krauser enters his room via the window. Fear grips Hans when he realizes that his six-circle barrier magic was breached. Surprisingly, he doesn't sense the same energy as Keenan from the intruder. Just then, he gets a closer look at the intruder, and the moment he sees that he has different eye colors, it dawns on him that the person standing in front of him is Krauser. Hans mentions his name, and Krauser is surprised that Hans knows him. Deep down, several questions are running through Hans's head as he tries to figure out if Krauser has been the one behind everything so far. Out of nowhere, Krauser hits Hans with a surprising question. He asks him why there is dragon energy oozing out of his body because he could see that his body is human, but his magic is that of a dragon. With a stern and dangerous voice, Krauser asks Hans what he is, and this question leaves Hans peeing his pants. Hans remembers what Lakia and Asa told him about Krauser, and putting all of these together, Hans concludes that Krauser is extremely dangerous. With fear in his voice, Hans tells Krauser not to come any closer to him. Just then, it dawns on Hans that everyone in his family is currently in the castle, and if he goes down, his family is in danger. Desperate to protect his family, he fires an airburst spell, but to his surprise, Krauser remains still with no attempt to dodge the attack. Shockingly, the attack hits, but it gets annihilated, ultimately posing zero danger to Krauser. Sweat ran down Hans's face because he had thought he had reached the peak of magic, where there is no one who can beat him. However, what just happened is telling him that he is wrong. Just then, Krauser expresses his shock about what just happened. He talks about how Hans was able to cast his magic without chanting. Curious about this, he urges Hans to tell him what he is. Realizing that Krauser is just curious, Hans tells him that it is dragon magic, just as he suspected. Hans mentions that he is a human who inherited a dragon's power and can use dragon word magic. Krauser is curious about this, but Hans replies that he doesn't really need to tell Krauser anything. Krauser then asks Hans if the person who passed down the power to him was the gold dragon, Seyfried. Hans is shocked when he hears this, as he asks Krauser if he can tell just by looking at him. He asks Krauser if he is affiliated with Seyfried, but Krauser says no, revealing that he only got the idea because of the academy's name. Krauser then reveals that he was also born after the dragons had gone extinct. In a surprising turn of events, Krauser reveals that he is a guardian. Apparently, he is the guardian of the black dragon, Lycanthos. Hans is stunned when he hears this because he wasn't expecting a human to be a guardian. Krauser then formally introduces himself, saying his name is Chai von Krauser. He revealed that his grandfather was the first to inherit the dragon's mark until it was passed down to him. Hans is shocked to hear this because dragons have been extinct for over 500 years. Krauser then reveals that those who received the mark have extended lifespans. However, the dragon bloodline is getting diluted because his grandfather lived to 500 years, but his father only got to live 400 years old. Apparently, his father wanted to stay among humans and establish a noble house, but in the end, he still failed to fit in. Hans then asks Krauser how his identity has stayed hidden all this time, since they only changed masters once in 100 years. Hans wants to know if the imperial family and the two ducal houses have just decided to leave him alone all this time. Krauser then replies that the ducal houses must be aware to some extent, which is why they are also trying to hide his identity, because the power scale might shift if people are aware of what power the Marquis holds. Hans finally understands that Krauser intentionally sought him out because he was lonely. They are still in the middle of the conversation when Asa and Lakia barge into the room. They immediately jump between Hans and Krauser, believing that he is there to hurt him. However, Hans urges them to calm down because he doesn't think Krauser came to harm him. Lakia argues, talking about how he has been tracking Krauser for a while. Suddenly, Krauser calls Lakia by his real name, shocking everyone in the room. They start asking him how he is able to figure out Lakia's real identity. Krauser then reveals that the eye bestowed upon him by the dragon is the eye of truth. This basically means he can discern all falsehoods, no matter how carefully they are placed. Hans then finally explains to Asa and Lakia who Krauser is, and it dawns on Lakia that Krauser is the one Hans has been searching for. Hans suggests that they address Krauser formally, but Krauser rejects this, telling them to call him by his name. Hans is shocked to hear this, and Krauser tells them that it makes him more comfortable if they address him plainly. Hans tries to remind Krauser that there is a hierarchy, but Krauser refuses. He tells Hans that titles are just a rule humans made. Since guardians are made to serve dragons, Krauser makes the shocking declaration that he is going to serve Hans too. This leaves the entire room in shock, but without thinking twice, Hans rejects the request. Hans believes that he's had enough family members to be responsible for already, and he is not prepared to add another. Well guys, that's the end of the video. If you like this video, comment next part in the comment section. Also subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and like the video. Thank you for watching, and see you next time again.